The Best Laid Plans. Chapter 9, The Best Laid Plans. Arkenstone listened grimly as Princess Cadence laid out the events that had occurred only just earlier that day. Part of him regretted rushing off to Canterlot first thing in the morning, since it had left him out of the loop while something so dire was happening. Granted, there was nothing he could have done, one way or another, but that didn't mean that he liked being blindsided by such news. And what dire news it was: guards dead and injured, the palace stormed by an armed force, the elements of harmony stolen, Princess Luna subdued by some unidentified attack. If Princess Cadence wasn't the one delivering the news, Arkenstone would have had a hard time believing it. What about Princess Celestia? He asked. She's returning, said Cadence. She expects to be here by tomorrow morning with all the ponies of her personal guard that can accompany her. However, the bulk of the royal guard will take longer, possibly up to a week, due to the complications of securing all the prisoners seized by the operation. Arkenstone pursed his lips thoughtfully. He'd had no intention of relying on the royal guard in any case. A knight of the Celestial Order handled his own affairs, but the extended period until the royal guard returned to the city meant that there was a great chance of something else happening in the meantime. Ponies had unquestionably noticed the disturbance at the palace today. There was no telling what might happen when they realized the scope of what had occurred, particularly if they learned that the elements of harmony, the tools used to save Equestria from Nightmare Moon and Discord, had been stolen. Mass panic was a possible outcome. Worse still, assuming that one of the nobles, if not the same one who'd abducted Twilight, was behind this affair, then she was likely to actively stoke the flames. But what is their ultimate aim? Wondered Arkenstone. Sowing discord in Canterlot was all well and good, but it hardly counted as an end in and of itself. Such a situation was merely a means for accomplishing something even more significant. But what? His train of thought was interrupted by the click of hooves as Shining Armor strode through the door of his office, where Cadence had been briefing Arkenstone, Scootaloo, and Rumble about the situation. Hey, said Shining, Spike told me you were on the way. But what are the kids doing here? To their credit, neither Scootaloo nor Rumble protested the designation, though Scootaloo's wings twitched irritably. They asked to accompany me, said Arkenstone simply. Having reached a certain understanding with them, I have allowed it. They have not yet given me reason to regret my decision. Okay, said Shining, giving the foals a dubious look as he stepped around the desk to join his wife. He was aware that Scootaloo had been Dawn's student for the past few months and that Rumble had been studying under one of the mercenaries that Shining had sent to Ponyville back around the time Dawn had first arrived. However, he was more than a little concerned about the fact that neither of them had much in the way of combat experience. He would have been more at ease if Dawn had come along instead, given that he already had a good idea of what the Ebony Colt could do. However, he was also aware that Dawn was still recovering from his exertions against Terra Hart. Even so. Do you have any leads as to Twilight's location? Asked Arkenstone, drawing Shining's attention back to him. Shining sighed. Not yet, he admitted reluctantly, thanks to a suggestion from Luna. I have some pony on the case. But she hasn't reported anything back yet. Right now, with the resources I have at my disposal, there's nothing to do but wait and hope that she uncovers something soon. Thank you for agreeing to join me for dinner, said Elderflower, giving Twilight a polite smile across the dining room table. Twilight returned his polite smile with a sardonic one as she carefully curled her fetlock around a fork and lifted a dainty bite of salad to her lips. After chewing and swallowing, she said, I don't believe I had much of a choice in the matter. After finishing her inspection of her chambers, Twilight had spent the night in the lavish prison cell and enjoyed a light breakfast delivered by Coco, a quiet lunch also delivered by Coco, before receiving an invitation to dinner with the Baron. It was the first time he'd communicated with her since leaving her room for the previous day. Even if she hadn't been trying to work out what Elderflower was planning, Twilight would have probably accepted his invitation to simply alleviate her boredom. Coco was wonderful company, but could never stay for too long, having apparently been given a list of tasks by the Baron to keep her busy. On top of that, no pony would bring her so much as a book to read. Twilight figured that was probably a deliberate move by Elderflower as well, sealing Twilight in a very dull, uninteresting environment and then presenting himself as the only source of mental stimulation available. Please, protested Elderflower, you don't honestly think that I would be so uncivilized as to allow you to starve simply because you snubbed my invitation? Given your circumstances, that would have been a perfectly understandable response. What went unsaid was that her acceptance of Elderflower's invitation was a slightly more suspicious one. Under the circumstances, I felt that it was the least I could do, said Twilight, pausing to take a sip of wine from her glass. Before she joined the Baron at his table, she had taken the opportunity to cast a powerful detoxification spell on herself through her Arcanasteel ring. The spell would last for at least 6 hours and nullified numerous poisons, drugs, and even alcohol. Even if there was nothing in the food or wine, Twilight could drink like a fish all night long and wake up without so much as a hangover. Granted, it also meant she couldn't get buzzed, which arguably defeated the point of drinking anything alcoholic in most situations. Also, because the spell neutralized toxins and other substances as they passed her lips, it had the side effect of making the wine taste flat and unappetizing due to the absence of the alcohol's sharper notes, like it had been simmered for several hours before it had been served. Even if Elderflower had no intention of using the myriad number of drugs that a pony of his means could acquire to soften her will and make her more pliable, Twilight knew she needed her wits about her and didn't want to risk taking an even a moderate amount of alcohol when the stakes were as high as this. Her abrupt willingness to oblige her captor's request had been met with suspicion, but Twilight couldn't afford to wait and take her time winning his trust. Shining Armor, Arkenstone, the princesses, and every pony else she knew were probably already looking for her. In all likelihood, it was only a matter of time until they found her and came to her rescue, even if Twilight hadn't already arranged her own escape by then. However, rescue came with the risk that Elderflower might still make some attempt to carry out his plans, whatever they were. Having her stolen back from him and having him outed as a full-napper might put a stop to what the stallion was trying to do, but Twilight wanted to be sure. She didn't want Elderflower's schemes to come back to haunt her a few months or years down the road. She wanted to bring this matter to an end and wanted it to stay ended. The least you could do, echoed Elderflower, raising an eyebrow as he sipped at his own glass. Twilight nodded. I'm still more than sore at you for full-napping me, but you have my curiosity. This was an extremely audacious move on your part and I can't help but want to find out what it is that you're really up to. Elderflower's eyes drifted shut and he let out a small chuckle. Every bit as clever and inquisitive as I could hope. Very well, I would need to tell you at some point in any case. Now is as good a time as any. Twilight's eyes narrowed at that. It implied that the Baron didn't expect her to be compliant to his wishes regardless of what he said, but also that he didn't think there was anything she could say or do that would truly disrupt his work. Granted, he had no idea that she was not as helpless as she first appeared. But Twilight didn't even fantasize that she'd won his trust for even a minute. Earlier yesterday, before you had woken up, my employees, who were responsible for transporting you from Ponyville by the way, conducted an operation on my behalf. Thanks to Princess Celestia's efforts to police that cult that has been causing you and yours so much trouble, security at the palace was rather light, something that I used to my advantage. The glass, which Twilight had been lifting to her lips for another sip, fell from her grip. It hit the table and toppled over, spreading a dark purple stain across the pristine white of the tablecloth, which Twilight completely ignored as she stared, aghast, at the Baron, who looked genuinely pleased with the reaction his words had elicited. You attacked the royal palace, gasped Twilight, gaping unashamedly at Elderflower. Are you insane? What could you possibly hope to accomplish? Princess Celestia would never. She was cut off as Elderflower idly raised a hoof. Please do not make too many assumptions, he said with an amused smirk. It's not as though we are planning to overthrow the princesses through force of arms or any such thing. As formidable as the assets I managed to acquire are, I'm not so foolish as to think that they could manage such a thing, much less with Princess Luna still in residence. No, rather, sending my forces to the palace was for a goal not too dissimilar from having them take you from Ponyville earlier. You attacked the palace to steal something, said Twilight, putting the pieces together inside her head. The question of what lingered. There were plenty of items that would be of interest to a pony with Elderflower's ambitions. The vaults beneath the palace held numerous artifacts, both mundane and magical, the latter of which ran the gamut from pitifully weak to powerful enough to cause a major incident. A certain particularly troublesome amulet came to mind. The archives were a veritable treasure trove of knowledge, particularly old spells, some of which were so especially dangerous that even Twilight, with her authorization to learn high-level battle magic, wasn't permitted to study. The palace was also practically the nerve center of the equestrian government, with all manner of documents and official correspondence that a pony of Elderflower's intelligence might be able to use to some obscure purpose. Even if he was simply looking for additional material wealth to bankroll his ambitions, Elderflower had his pick of countless art objects and vaults of gems to choose from. However, none of those things seemed really appropriate to the situation. Ancient magical artifacts were all well and good, but they were also finicky and unreliable at the worst possible times. It took a great deal of research and careful understanding to use them properly. The same was true of many of the most dangerous spells secreted in the archives. It took exceptionally skilled unicorns to learn and apply them. Elderflower, from Twilight's knowledge, was not a particularly adept spellcaster. He was also not the kind of pony to trust others with immense power if said power had the risk of corrupting them and turning them into a liability to his cause. Ultimately, through the process of elimination, Twilight arrived at what she believed was the only possible target of the raid Elderflower had orchestrated. The elements of harmony, she said. You stole the elements. Correct, said Elderflower, taking another sip of his own wine, seemingly ignoring Twilight's accident on the other side of the table. But why? Asked Twilight. I thought no pony in the noble court believed. No pony in the court was foolish enough to believe that tripe about what the elements are supposed to stand for, said Elderflower, cutting her off. We have always accepted that the elements are tremendously powerful artifacts. The results speak for themselves after all. However, it's fairly obvious to every pony with even half a brain that the so-called qualities of harmony that were assigned to the elements were an invention of Princess Celestia's. Most likely she intended them to serve as a deterrent to keep any pony from doing what we just did. However, it would be foolish for any pony to believe such platitudes. Twilight nodded the inside of her lip as she fought to keep from braining the stallion in front of her with her salad plate. How could Elderflower be so clever and insightful one moment, then so utterly moronic the next? It truly boggled the mind. However, she managed to rein in her temper by the barest of margins, consoling herself that Elderflower's denial over how the elements worked would only serve as another impediment to keep him from actually being able to use them in whatever scheme he had cooked up. Instead, she decided to continue to press for more information. What are you planning to do with them? A butler arrived and used his magic to carry the salad plates away. Another followed up to deliver the main course, ravioli stuffed with wild mushrooms in a creamy sauce. It was delicious, but Twilight's consternation with what she had just learned kept her from really enjoying the meal. Elderflower took a break from the conversation to enjoy a few mouthfuls before washing them down with another gulp of wine and turning his attention back to Twilight. I do not believe I have stolen the elements so much as I took custody of them. Believe it or not, Dame Sparkle, my plans for the past few days, from abducting you to taking the elements, were not originally my primary plans. They were more in line with a plan B, or C, or even D. The point is that securing both you and the elements were something of a last resort for me and my associates. I forced you to your last resort already? Asked Twilight. Elderflower chuckled. Oh, not even close. In reality, everything was going quite well for me. However, we decided to arrange to take you and the elements as a contingency, in case everything else failed. To that end, we began to quietly muster our strength, gather allies, hire hooves, that sort of thing. We were anticipating a rather bloody conflict, you see. In our plans we figured we would be raiding the royal palace, going up against a full complement of the royal guard and no fewer than 2, if not 3, powerful alicorns. Such an action promised a great deal of trouble and bloodshed and would signal the death of subtlety, as far as our plans went anyway, which was why it was a last resort. We had to work slowly and carefully to avoid drawing suspicion as we built up our forces. We weren't even a quarter of the way to meeting our projected needs for this plan. What made you decide to make that your main plan? Asked Twilight. I think you already know quite well what made us decide to do that, said Elderflower. A lump formed in Twilight's throat. Yes, she had a pretty good idea of what had prompted Elderflower to decide to attack the royal palace. Princess Celestia's sweep of Equestria with the royal guard, the sting to take down the cult Solar, had almost completely depleted the palace's mare power. With the bare minimum of ponies around for security, even a small force would have encountered relatively little resistance. It was truly a stroke of good fortune, said Elderflower. Even with that there were some difficulties. I'm told that Princess Luna nearly put a stop to things. I can't even begin to imagine how they got past her, thought Twilight. She was fairly certain that Elderflower wouldn't tell her, even if she asked. Instead, she focused on the real problem now. What do you intend to do with the elements? Elderflower took another bite of his pasta before answering. The plan is relatively simple. By taking the elements, we have accomplished two things. Firstly, we executed an abrupt and violent attack on the royal palace without being caught. Secondly, we've secured the most powerful magical artifacts in the nation, if not the world. What do you think the average commoner will think when she finds out those things occurred and the princesses were powerless to stop them? Twilight shivered at the thought. There would be serious unrest, if not outright panic. Ponies would have their faith in the security and effectiveness of Equestria's government completely undermined. To make matters worse, with the bulk of the royal guard still out on Celestia's sting operation, there would be practically no pony to enforce order in Canterlot, which would only fan the flames even further. Naturally, the princesses will be occupied with securing Canterlot for quite a while, said Elderflower casually, not seeming to care one whit about the suffering such a state of affairs would cause. In the meantime, we shall take the elements and put them to good use. Good use? Asked Twilight. Yes, said Elderflower, pausing to take another sip of his wine. Think about it. Even though, including yourself, there were only 2 unicorns amongst your number, you managed to defeat Nightmare Moon and seal away Discord. Imagine what the elements will be capable of when they are assigned to ponies who can make the fullest use of their capabilities. You have ponies in mind? Asked Twilight, raising a critical eyebrow. She already had a pretty good idea of what Elderflower was getting at. Yes, replied Elderflower, my associates and I are in the process of identifying the finest spellcasters to come out of prominent magic schools, including the school for gifted unicorns here in Canterlot. Naturally, you are at the top of that list. Once we have our candidates, we shall bestow the elements upon them. Then, we shall move to quell the unrest within the city and move forward to confront the princesses with our new element bearers. With that power on our side, even if the princesses ultimately refuse to recognize our rights as the true rulers of Equestria, we will have the leverage to force the issue if such a thing truly becomes necessary. Twilight couldn't quite conceal her disgust with the stallion sitting in front of her. It was just as well that she was feeling so disgusted with him as it was keeping her from slamming her hoof into her face at the stupidity of his plan. While it was fairly solid, she could easily see why Elderflower had originally left it as a last resort. Even if he and his cronies had the elements on their side, even if they managed to use them to defeat the princesses or seal them away or whatever, they were still looking at years, if not decades, of civil unrest as ponies across Equestria resisted the forced transition of power taking place in Canterlot. Of course, more importantly, all of that hinged on the elements of harmony working the way Elderflower thought they worked. That single, gaping hole in his plan would bring his entire scheme crumbling down whether she did anything or not. Twilight was actually seriously tempted to let him actually try so he could see just how ridiculous a farce his ideas were. But that wouldn't help her or Coco Pommel, nor would it help with the unrest sown by Elderflower's actions the past few days. It also wouldn't bring any justice for the victims of Elderflower's or the other nobles' schemes these past few years. Besides, Twilight wanted the satisfaction of bringing down this creep herself. So, what do you think? Asked Elderflower. I can understand that you probably have your reservations about this. You are still possessed of that commoner sentimentality after all. Despite that, I do believe that you are the best choice for leading the new element bearers when we bring true harmony to Equestria. I need to think about it, Twilight demurred. This is a lot to take in at once. By all means, take your time, said Elderflower. This is a decision not to be made lightly. Admittedly, we are on a bit of a tight schedule, as I wish to strike while the iron is hot. But I understand that there will be some delays in the Royal Guard's return to Canterlot. That should afford us some time to stir the pot as it were. I'm sure it will, said Twilight, her eyes narrowing. Her plans for escaping and thwarting Elderflower had just gotten much more complicated. Draining the remainder of his glass, Elderflower used his magic to levitate it up, signaling a servant to come refill it. But enough about that, let us enjoy the remainder of our dinner. Twilight suppressed a sigh as she settled in for the remainder of the meal, not looking forward to the Baron's notions of what would pass for polite conversation in the slightest. A low whirring noise filled the air as a steel gray blur whizzed about the room. The room was one of many just like it found throughout the palace. At some times, it served as an auxiliary ballroom, at others a banquet hall, or even a convention center of sorts. The important thing was that it was very large and open, with plenty of space to work with, which was exactly what Rumble needed as he put the meteor hammer through its paces. Training was about all that Rumble had to do right now. Princess Celestia had arrived that morning, before he'd even woken up. She had immediately sequestered herself, Arkenstone, and Shining Armor away in a conference room, apparently discussing the current situation and what to do about it. Rumble and Scootaloo had been left to their own devices. Rumble thought Scootaloo might be training as well, but wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had to do his best to be ready when Arkenstone finally decided to act. Rumble's training weapon was a knotted rope. While an appropriate facsimile of the real thing, the live weapon felt considerably different to the Colt. It had its own slight differences to weight and balance that made using it a different experience for him. Rumble really wished he'd gotten a few chances to swing the real thing around before he'd borrowed it from an incapacitated Stormfront's room. He certainly appreciated the difference between the two. A knotted rope, if mishandled, would leave behind stinging pain and bruises, but the metal weight of the live weapon would probably break his bones if he slipped up with it. Princess Cadance had been all too happy to grant Rumble the space to practice with his weapon. He needed to get used to it before he ended up in a real fight. Rumble was fully aware just how far behind Scootaloo, to say nothing of Arkenstone, he was. He'd been reluctant to go along with Scootaloo's plan to accompany the stallion to Canterlot in the first place. There was no way he was ready for real combat yet, but Rumble was determined not to be an impediment to Scootaloo and Arkenstone. At the very least, with Dawn out of commission, Rumble saw it as a responsibility on his part to keep an eye on Scootaloo, even if she was stronger than him, if only to try and curb her more reckless tendencies. As he finished with his latest form, Rumble caught the weight deftly, finally feeling a bit more comfortable with the dangerous weapon. He wished he was even half as skilled as Stormfront was with it. The dark gray stallion had occasionally shown Rumble how the weapon could be merged with the user's natural Pegasus magic, manipulating the air around it. Stormfront could use his magic to produce powerful shockwaves that could deal blows to a target's inner organs past most ordinary defenses or disrupt an opponent's sense of balance by transmitting vibrations into their inner ear. But Rumble was a long ways away from being that capable. As he panted softly, getting his breath back for another practice run, he heard a faint clopping of hooves over by the door. Looking over, Rumble was shocked to see the willowy form of Princess Cadence as she made her way towards him. Rumble was at a bit of a loss about what to do, but settled for bowing deeply to the approaching member of royalty, only to get his forelegs tangled up in his weapon's cord and go sprawling across the floor. "Oh my," said Cadence, bringing a hoof to her mouth when she saw Rumble's accident. She was barely able to stifle the giggle that threatened to emerge at the colt's expense. Instead, she gently lifted Rumble up off the floor with her magic, allowing him to untangle the meteor hammer from around his legs. Thank you, Princess. Just Cadence, please," said Cadence with a smile as she set Rumble back down. "I can understand that you're a bit nervous. But please don't worry about being formal with me. Before long, I will have to move to the Crystal Empire and officially rule there. I suspect that I will deal with all the formalities I can stand when that happens." "Okay, Cadence," said Rumble, blushing slightly at the fact that he was referring to an actual princess in such familiar terms. This time, Cadence was unable to keep from giggling. She ran a hoof through Rumble's mane. "Thank you," she said. "I can see why Sweetie Belle likes you so much." Rumble's blush intensified. "You, know about that." "Of course I do," said Cadence. "She looked so happy with you at the Winter Gala. Besides," she tapped her horn, "Quote. Love Princess, remember?" "Oh, right," said Rumble. "I saw you practicing," she said. "You were amazing." Thanks," said Rumble, looking away. I'm still just a beginner really. I'm not used to using the real thing yet and I haven't actually been in a real fight with it before." It would have been an outright lie to say that Rumble had never fought before. But the schoolyard scuffles that foals inevitably found themselves in couldn't even begin to compare to real combat, something Rumble was painfully aware of. "Yes, I can tell," said Cadence with a wink. "I can understand your feelings. You don't feel ready for this at all. You understand you don't have any experience with real fights. You're fully aware of your limitations. But that's a good thing." "It is?" asked Rumble, looking up in surprise. Cadence smiled down at him before using a wing to draw Rumble to her side. She began to gently lead him towards the doors of the room. "It is," she said. "It's important that you know what you can and can't do when you might be out of your depth. It helps you to maintain a proper perspective and then use what you can do to fulfill your goals. In that respect, I think that you might be further along than even Scootaloo is." I hadn't thought of it like that," said Rumble. "Let me ask you something," said Cadence. "Even though you know that you're not ready for a real fight, even though you're fully aware of just how inexperienced you are, how little practice you have with that weapon, why did you come here?" Rumble mulled it over. Scootaloo had been the one to approach him about going to Canterlot with Arkenstone. Rumble had seen for himself just how much pain the blind stallion was in at times. Arkenstone hit it well, but the battle with Terra had taken its toll and Arkenstone still needed time to recover fully. Also, there was Scootaloo to consider. She was stronger and more experienced than him. She'd taken on a deranged cultist and even exchanged blows with Pearl and Bluestreak, who had fought evenly with Dawn on multiple occasions. But even with that gap between them, Rumble thought it was a bad idea to leave the orange filly to her own devices. Right now, he was the only pony who had any hope of watching Scootaloo's back as they embarked on whatever ridiculously dangerous endeavor this turned out to be. "I came because I felt I had a responsibility," he said finally. "What responsibility?" asked Cadence as she continued to guide the gray colt down the hall. "To do something, anything. Scootaloo's right that we're the only ones who can help Arkenstone right now. He's worse off than he lets on. Both Stormfront and Red River are too hurt to fight. Dawn's still waiting for his magic to come back. Those two griffins have to stay near Fluttershy." Rumble shook his head. "I'm not ready for this. But what?" asked Cadence, watching Rumble closely. "But when will I be ready? That's the question I keep asking." Rumble lowered his gaze to the marble floor passing under his hooves as they walked. "I'm not ready now, but will I be ready a couple months from now, or a couple years, when? I'm afraid that, if I say that and use it as a reason to not do something when I really should do something, then I'll keep using it no matter how far down the road it is. Even if I'm not ready right now, I still need to do something, because I'm one of the few ponies who can." A tear trickled down Cadence's cheek. These little ones all grow up so fast. I'm sure his teacher would be proud to hear him now. "I see," she said. Their walk brought them to the door of the guest room that Rumble was using while he and the others were staying at the palace. These weren't the larger suites Twilight and her friends had been given when they had visited for hearts warming, but were quite comfortable all the same, individual rooms of the sort one might find in a fairly decent hotel. Scootaloo had the room next door and Arkenstone's room was just across the hall. The rooms also had the advantage of being situated fairly close to the staff sections of the palace used by the royal guard, including Shining Armor's office. They were often used to house various officers and officials from other branches of the guard when they came to the palace on official business. Rumble looked at the door, having been too absorbed by his thoughts and the conversation itself to realize where Cadence had been leading him. He only just now realized that Cadence had brought him back to his room. "Rest is an important part of training too," said Cadence with a giggle. "It's getting late and a growing boy like you should be in bed if you want to really realize the fruits of your training." "Oh, okay." In reality, Rumble was feeling quite tired, but his anxiety about what he was doing had driven him to keep practicing, even when he should have given up for the evening. Leaning down, Cadence gently nuzzled the top of Rumble's head, a gesture of affection not dissimilar to what Flitter would do when Rumble was at home. Rumble felt faintly cold as he realized just how much he missed Flitter and the rest of his family now. "Before you go to bed," said Cadence, pulling away, "I'd like to do something for you." "What?" asked Rumble, looking up at her with wide eyes. "I'd like to offer you a blessing, of sorts, a love blessing, if you will," said Cadence, her smile widening slightly. But is this really the time?" asked Rumble, his cheeks turning a very bright shade of red as he looked away bashfully. To his surprise, Cadence broke out into a fit of laughter. It took her a minute to rein in her mirth before she finally went back to smiling at Rumble. "Oh, not with Sweetie Belle. You're on your own with her for the time being. I don't think you're quite ready for that kind of love anyway." I'm talking about a different sort. Rumble blinked. There's a different sort. Of course, replied Cadence with a wink, there are all different sorts of love. The love between two ponies is important, of course. It's one of the most beautiful and my favorite kind of love. But there are plenty of other kinds. There's the love ponies have for the precious objects they have in their lives, particularly if those objects have some sort of special meaning. There's the love ponies have for what they do when they are following their passions. In a sense, you could even say that love is the root of a pony's cutie mark. And those are only two examples. I may not be a warrior or a soldier, but I've spent plenty of time around those sorts of ponies. It comes with the territory when your husband is captain of the royal guard. I found that warriors, especially those who've truly mastered their weapons, share a special bond with their chosen weapon, often like the love they might have for another pony. It isn't romantic, maybe closer to familial, but it's still a kind of love, a bond of trust and understanding between two parties. To a true warrior, a weapon is not merely an inanimate object to be wielded, it is a dear companion, to be trusted, respected, and understood. For some warriors, the weapon in question isn't even an actual object, but a polished skill, like Arkenstone and his magic or Scootaloo and the Gale King. Sometimes it's a concept or idea, but, all the same, it's something that ponies put their faith and love in. Believe it or not, that kind of love falls under the purview of my magic as well. Cadence pressed a hoof to the coil of the meteor hammer that was wrapped around Rumble's right foreleg. You were practicing today because this is a weapon you aren't totally familiar with yet. It isn't just that its weight and heft are different from the training version. It doesn't feel quite right because it's not your weapon, yet. That kind of bond is forged through constant training and relying on it during those dark times when you can rely on nothing else. My magic is powerful when used in the right ways, but it can't make up all that time and experience for you. What it can do is open your heart and help you learn to accept this weapon as a companion and a part of you. It's not much, but I think it'll help you a little when the time finally comes for you to fight. Does this sound all right to you? Rumble was silent for a few minutes as he stared pensively at the door to his room. Finally, he looked up at Cadence and nodded. Yeah, he said, I think I'd like that. Good, said Cadence, gently pushing open the door. I'll cast the magic on you now, so that it'll take effect during the night. When you wake up in the morning, go through your training like usual. I think you'll start to notice the difference fairly quickly. It'll also help if you take that meteor hammer with you when you sleep. She gave the weapon a cautionary look. Make sure it's nice and secure so that you don't accidentally strangle yourself if you end up tossing and turning. Okay, said Rumble, looking down at his weapon. Ready? Asked Cadence. Rumble stepped in front of her before turning to face her. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, clearing his thoughts as he looked Cadence right in the eye. Yeah. The shimmer of magic began to dance along the length of Cadence's horn. Here we go then, she said. Her magic gathered at the tip of her horn before changing shape and color into the form of a glowing blue heart that then drifted down towards Rumble. As it touched against his forehead, it burst with a small pop. Rumble felt a feeling of warmth wash through him. Then he felt the cord of the meteor hammer wrapped around his foreleg. It felt as though the weapon was glowing hot. Strangely, it wasn't a painful, burning sensation, but a comforting one. Rumble swore he could feel every thread woven into the cord pressed against his fur and skin. He could feel the heft of the steel weight as it rested near his hoof, now feeling somewhat familiar and welcome, rather than foreign. The feeling began to fade and Rumble felt his eyelids begin to droop. Sleep well, said Cadence. Leaning down, she gently kissed Rumble's forehead before backing out the door and shutting it slowly. Good night, said Rumble as he watched it click shut. Turning around, he went through his evening routine, brushing his teeth, using the bathroom, and so on, before climbing into bed and pulling the covers up to his chin. Not even thinking about uncoiling the meteor hammer from around his hoof. As Rumble's eyes closed and he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed by remembering the first time he had seen that graceful weapon in action, remembering Stormfront swinging it through the clouds. In her own room, Scootaloo opened the saddlebags she'd brought with her. It took a few seconds of rummaging, but she ultimately found what she was looking for. It was a strip of fabric dyed the same grayish purple as her eyes. It was smooth to the touch and shimmered faintly under the light hanging on the ceiling above. It was thin and supple, resembling little more than a ribbon. However, the ends of the strip terminated in bundles of a lighter, more feathery weave of the fabric, giving it the impression of something akin to a very thin scarf. It was a gift from Rarity. A couple months ago, Perlin Bluestreak had forced Coco Pommel to let him into the Carousel boutique in order to steal a sample of Rarity's new shimmer silk. The plan had ultimately failed and Perlin made his escape amidst the sounds of screaming and breaking glass. Scootaloo had noticed and had gone to confront him, leading to a brief yet intense battle in the skies over Ponyville. During the battle, she had knocked Perlin's prize, the strip of shimmer silk he'd stolen, away from him and recovered it. That hadn't exactly been her intention at the time, considering Scootaloo hadn't even known about the theft when she had confronted Perlin. However, it had been a relief to Rarity and Coco when she had returned the stolen good to them. In hindsight, Scootaloo had come to accept that her actions that night had been incredibly reckless and she had deserved Dawn's scolding afterwards, despite the brief falling out that had resulted between them. However, when she'd brought the strip of fabric back to Rarity, Scootaloo had realized something else upon seeing the looks of relief on Rarity's and Coco's faces. She'd realized what should have been truly important about the fights she picked, why Dawn got in the fights that he did. She'd realized that, if she was going to pick fights with other ponies, she needed to do it for the right reasons, not simply because they were there and she vaguely thought of that particular pony as an enemy. In a gesture of thanks, Rarity had made a few modifications to the strip of fabric, turning it into the ribbon Scootaloo was looking at now. As she looked at it, Scootaloo allowed her mind to go back to the memory of the look on Coco Pommel's face when she saw that the stolen fabric had been returned. If I'm gonna put myself at risk, it needs to be for things like that, thought Scootaloo. Coco and Twilight had been taken by some pony and Scootaloo wanted to help get them back. If he weren't still waiting for his magic to recover, undoubtedly, Dawn would be here now in her place. But he wasn't recovered yet, so Scootaloo had decided that she needed to come instead. She was probably being reckless and inconsiderate of the risks. But, as she looked at the ribbon draped across her hooves, she truly felt that she was doing the right thing. Wherever Coco and Twilight were, they probably weren't smiling now. Scootaloo intended to do whatever she could to put smiles back in their faces. And if the process of doing so involved pounding flat the face of whoever was responsible for taking them, so much the better. With a sigh, Scootaloo put the ribbon back away and crawled into bed. However much she wanted to get out and just do something, there was nothing for her to do until Arkenstone figured out just who had taken Twilight and Coco and where they were hiding her. She hoped that the pony that Shining Armor had put on the job came back with some answers soon. As the night grew darker and the shadows lengthened, the ponies tending to Elderflower's estate began to go through the process of wrapping up their work for the day. Lamps were lit, illuminating the estate's gardens and flower beds, but also providing light for the patrols by Elderflower's mares-at-arms. His guards moved like clockwork about the grounds in pairs, treading between rows of colorful flowers one moment and walking carefully around the outer wall the next. It was rather dull, monotonous work. Night after night, the same routine played out again and again. Such was the routine of providing security during the nights that the distraction posed by an attempted infiltration, whether by thieves or by spies, would be welcomed by the guards. However, despite their boredom, they did not allow their thoughts to wander and remained focused on their work. The Baron was notorious for his dislike of ponies who were subpar at their jobs. A breach in security was likely to be met by the dismissal of every pony on that particular shift, whether they shared the responsibility or not. Said ex-guards would find themselves blacklisted and unable to find work in Canterlot or any other major city again. Luckily, such occurrences were rare and Elderflower moderated his decisions according to the circumstances, if the intruder was caught. The guards had other reasons to be on edge this night. Elderflower was no fool. He knew full well that keeping his direct employees out of the loop would be counterproductive, particularly if any of them wondered why a large number of deadly-looking ponies had taken up temporary residence in the manor. They knew full well that they were hosting the mercenaries who had brazenly launched an attack on the royal palace and made off with the most important artifacts in equestrian history. They also knew that the slightest thought of reporting this to any pony in authority would likely be met with a swift death before they were able to carry such an action. Elderflower's mercenaries were also functioning as extra eyes and ears amongst his staff as they moved through the manor, making sure that no pony harbored any thoughts of betraying the Baron at this important juncture. Elderflower's guards were wary and alert, but that alertness was primarily focused on looking for intruders coming from without. Unfortunately for them, they were poorly prepared for some pony who was already within their perimeter. As the night deepened, Shadesteel silently went to work. Author's notes. This is yet another example of that one character I created to be a one-time antagonist forcing her way back into the story and essentially taking on a life of her own. Next chapter, Perlin has a very interesting experience. Sneaking and slinking. Chapter 10, Sneaking and Slinking. Off to one corner of the grounds belonging to the Baron was a garage. Normally it only housed Elderflower's personal carriage, which he used to travel to destinations around the city in comfort and style. However, right now it held two other carriages, heavier, armored carriages that could be used to transport prisoners or soldiers. They belonged to the Banehammer mercenaries currently employed by the Baron. The garage was convenient for keeping the two carriages that had been visibly used in the attack on the royal palace out of sight. From beneath one of the carriages slipped a silent shadow. The dark gray Pegasus mare carefully crept along the floor of the garage until she could look out and see the grounds that were visible from her position. She hadn't dared to attempt her infiltration the previous night and had instead spent her time observing the positions of the guards and marking their patrol paths. The fact that the guards moved like clockwork might have appealed to the orderly sensibilities of Baron Elderflower, but it also served to make the patrol patterns predictable. Shadesteel had only just peeped her head out and she could already see that the guards were walking exactly the same patrols they had the previous night. She could tell where these ponies were with her eyes closed. Not that it made the infiltration all that much easier. The grounds were a collection of broad, flat lawns and low flower beds, nothing that could serve as effective cover when she made her approach to the manor. Elderflower was distinctly more pragmatic in comparison to many of his peers, considering that many of them decorated their own grounds with tall hedges, large statues, and even small stands of trees that would have worked perfectly for hiding and skulking. Sadly, none of that was to be found here. Shade would have to be extremely careful on her approach. The lamps added difficulty as well. They were shorter than average so that their light washed out at a shallow angle. Thus, in addition to providing light for the guards to see by, the lamps also threw ponies into stark relief as they walked along the grounds. The long shadows cast were easily visible from all the way across the yard and it would be easy to spot a single shadow moving against the clockwork pattern used by the guards. Shade moved her eyes around, examining the situation as carefully as she could. She felt distinctly unprepared for this action. She was completely unarmed. The combat knife and the long, thin throwing blades she normally concealed in her feathers were absent. If she'd had a little longer after receiving the assignment from Shining Armor to prepare, she was fairly certain the captain would have allowed her to re-equip herself in preparation for the mission. But the Banehammer's attack on the palace had proven to be too urgent an opportunity to pass up. Shade had barely managed to slip by the strangely alert unicorn guarding the carriages and conceal herself beneath one before the raiding party made it back. On the other hoof, a corpse or a guard going mysteriously missing would blow her cover as surely as being spotted would, if a little less suddenly. So perhaps it was for the best if the option of violence was closed to her for the time being. Technically, Shade didn't need to do anything more. She had determined exactly who the Banehammers worked for. She could have run back to Shining Armor at any time since the previous day to make her report and finish up. Shining Armor would likely take care of the rest. However, Shade wasn't satisfied simply playing pointer for the Royal Guard. If she was going to do this job, she would do it to the best of her abilities. First, she needed to determine if Twilight Sparkle and the other mare Full-napped from Ponyville were being held here. Once she did that, she needed to assess the situation so that she could help Shining Armor determine what sort of intervention was required. If they went about it the wrong way, Elderflower could probably slip away with the elements, his hostages, or both. That was unacceptable. Taking a few extra minutes, Shade continued her observations of the guard patrols to ensure that they weren't going to suddenly change up the pattern on her. It was something she'd dealt with on previous missions for the SES. Competent guards changed their routines and altered their schedules slightly to avoid being predictable. However, Elderflower's mares-at-arms were not that competent. Shade waited for the right time, the largest window she had to act with the greatest period of time that no pony would be watching the ground between the garage and the mansion. There was no cover to slip behind, so she would have to cross all that distance in one go, without casting a shadow that would catch some pony's eye. I haven't used this move in a while, thought Shade as she slowly lowered herself down to the ground, time to see if I can still pull it off. Her legs bent and she sank down into a crouch, then sank down lower still, until her belly was less than an inch away from the garage's floor. In addition to using her legs, she braced her wingtips and feathers against the ground. Then, she waited just a little bit longer, until a pair of armored ponies strolled past her position. This was her chance. Shade set off. Had any pony been looking on from above, she would have looked like a giant lizard or, worse, a giant cockroach as she skittered across the estate's lawn, using her legs and wings in tandem, all 6 limbs splayed out to hold her body as low as equinely possible to carry herself forward as the grass below tickled her belly. Down this low, Shade wasn't casting much of a shadow, even as she passed near one of the lamps. Up ahead, her goal, a side entrance for servants, loomed closer and closer with each passing second. Before she was even halfway across, Shade was already regretting that she hadn't worked more to keep in shape while she'd been acting as Princess Luna's maid. Her legs and wings were burning from the exertion. This was not a natural position or method of locomotion for a pony. It had taken several months of training back when she'd first been initiated into the SES for Shade to actually get the technique down. There'd been a time when she could have done it as naturally as walking, but that had been back before she had resigned from the guard. Nonetheless, she pressed onward. She was committed now for more reasons that one. If she was spotted, then Elderflower would be alerted to the fact that some pony was onto him and would probably take actions to cover his tracks. Whatever they might be, they promised to be unpleasant for the ponies in his custody. Now that she was committed, she had to get in, do her job and get out with no pony the wiser. For this to work, Elderflower and his cronies had to be left completely unaware that they'd been marked. The burning sensation in Shade's muscles intensified and she felt as though she either needed to lay down or stand up, anything to put an end to the strain. But she grit her teeth and pushed past through the sensation, urging herself onward. There was the door. Pausing, Shade allowed herself a second to look around and make absolutely sure that no pony had seen her yet. The guards were still moving as they were before, with no changes in their posture or actions that indicated that they'd seen something. However, it would only be another few seconds before another pair rounded the corner of the mansion, which would result in them looking right at her. A tremor of fear ran through Shade's limbs. If she was off by the slightest bit, if those guards were only a couple of steps ahead of her estimation, then it would be over for her. But there was no time for hesitation on her part. Shade quickly reached for the doorknob. She'd already observed servants entering and leaving, noting that the door was left unlocked for their convenience. Perhaps it was a mistake born of laziness. Perhaps Elderflower just had that much faith in the alertness of his guards. In either case, this was Shade's way in. Her fetlock curled around the brass knob and turned it, another tremor of fear running through her. What if she was wrong? Shade forced it down and twisted the knob. It turned and the door opened. Shade ducked inside and turned to pull the door shut behind her, careful to slow it down at the last second, turning the knob so that it swung shut without so much as a click before letting the knob return to its original position. Once inside, Shade looked around to make sure she was alone. This was the entrance primarily used by the groundskeepers. It was also occasionally used as a convenient side entrance by servants making runs to a different part of the estate, which was apparently why it was kept unlocked, even at this time of night. Looking around, Shade could see racks of tools, shears, hose, rakes, and bags of fertilizer. No pony would be spending any time in this room at this time of night save to pass through it going in or out. Knowing that it might only be a matter of time before some pony had to enter or leave, Shade crossed through the room to the door on the other side. Slowly, Shade opened it a crack so that she could look through. As she did, she strained her ears for the sound of hoofsteps, thanking Celestia and Luna that the hallway floor outside was polished wood. If it had been carpet, hearing some pony coming would have been much more difficult. Moving across hard surfaces without making a sound with one's hooves was a skill that Shade had spent several years mastering. She doubted any pony among Elderflower's servants would need such a skill. She could only hope that he didn't have some pony less savory and similarly skilled to her walking about at night. Once she was certain she didn't hear any pony coming, Shade opened the door wider and leaned her head out, looking up and down the hall to make sure that no pony was coming. As late as it was, most of the servants had probably retired to bed, now that their master was unlikely to need them until the next day. Shade resolved to move with caution anyway. In a larger household, she might be able to steal a uniform and masquerade as a maid while she moved. Heavens knew, she'd certainly gotten a lot of practice in acting like a maid lately. But the Baron, a relatively low rank in the noble court, would have a smaller staff where ponies likely recognized each other on sight. A new face would be noticed instantly. She'd just have to stay out of sight then. Her hooves not making the slightest sound against the hardwood floor, Shade set off down the hallway, her eyes examining the door to every room she came across as she cross-checked it against the mental map of the mansion she was building as she went. Nobles used a fairly predictable layout for their abodes, depending on the style of architecture. The main entryway and the ballroom were usually on the first floor, bisecting the center of the building, with the grand dining room usually adjacent. The hallways off to the sides on the first floor usually led to the parts of the mansion not meant to be seen by outsiders, places like kitchens, cleaning closets, and supply rooms. The basement levels were generally used as barracks by the nobles on duty, mares at arms. The second story was generally occupied by rooms that were still used by visitors and outsiders but provided a more intimate setting, rooms like offices, maybe a conservatory, or a smaller dining room of some sort. Above them on the third floor were usually the bedrooms used by the home's owner and any visitors or prisoners, Shade thought to herself darkly. To the manor. Above that, on the fourth floor, would be the servants' quarters. If there was any substantial evidence of the Baron's crimes to be found, it would probably be on the second floor. However, Twilight Sparkle and the other mare abducted from Ponyville would likely be on the third floor. Nobles like Elderflower were notoriously fond of the honored guest routine for simultaneously confining and mocking their prisoners. Shade decided to start with the second floor, then work her way up to the third, if she had a chance. Still moving like a silent wraith down the halls, Shade made her way deeper into enemy territory. Twilight Sparkle let out a breath she hadn't even been aware she'd been holding as she slumped down onto the bed. It felt as though she'd been holding it in all evening. Surprisingly, making polite conversation with Baron Elderflower had been strangely normal compared to the discussion they'd had right before that. He had chatted about a variety of topics, from fine wines to asking Twilight for some stories about her adventures and even showing a modicum of curiosity about the magical research she conducted. The fact that the conversation was so normal only made it seem more eerily disturbing when juxtaposed with the overall context of her situation. As she tried to relax, Twilight thought about how the situation had gotten much more complicated. Now, not only did she have Coco to worry about but the elements of harmony as well. At the very least, Twilight had to work out a means of securing the elements or barring that making absolutely sure that they couldn't be used by Elderflower or his cronies. She was a bit more confident on the latter point, thinking she might not actually need to do anything at all. Pursing her lips, Twilight worked on coming up with her plan of action. She knew what Elderflower was up to now, so there was no need to delay much longer. Her time spent planning was interrupted by a polite, timid knock on the door. Looking up, Twilight smiled. "Come in," she called. The door swung open and Coco Pommel came in. I came to see if you needed anything before bed tonight," she said. Fighting hard to stop a triumphant grin from spreading across her face, Twilight nodded. "This is perfect. Actually," she said, "I could use your help. I'd like to take a bath and brush my mane before bed," but she sighed. "I'm having a really hard time managing the brush without my magic. Maybe you could help me." Coco brightened up a bit at the prospect of being able to do something. Aside from bringing Twilight her meals, Coco's role largely seemed to revolve around being comforted by the older mare while she sniffled and snibbled like a helpless foal. Even if it was only brushing a mane, Coco was glad to be able to contribute something. "Come on then," said Twilight, heading into the bathroom with Coco a short distance behind her. After Coco was through the door, Twilight shut it, cutting off any chance the observers most likely watching from behind the bedroom mirror had of seeing what she was about to do. She'd already double-checked to make sure no such secret observation chambers were in the bathroom. The only surveillance was a bevy of listening spells, once again anchored in the bathroom's corners. Having assessed their sensitivity, Twilight now knew what she could do to thwart them. First, she went to the bath and turned the faucet, sending a stream of water cascading into the large tub with a loud gushing noise. It was actually loud enough that Twilight and Coco would have to raise their voices to be heard over the water. However, that was only if they were holding a normal conversation. Turning to Coco, Twilight gave the younger mare an encouraging smile and held a hoof to her lips. Coco's eyes widened, and then widened even further as the golden band of Twilight's arcanastial ring appeared on her horn. The silvery aura caused by Twilight's magic as it was channeled through the ring wove through the air around them, forming a dome that warped their view of everything outside, as though they were looking out through a bubble. The sound of water from the tub's faucet became muted. Ms. Twilight, what? Coco gaped unashamedly as she looked at the magical construct. She might not have been a unicorn, but even she could recognize the inhibitor ring on Twilight's horn, resting just above the arcanastial band. "We don't have a lot of time. I need to make this quick," said Twilight, looking around the room. Her privacy spell would keep the sound of their voices from being picked up by the listening spells in the bathroom. But the ponies on the other end of those spells would grow suspicious if they heard absolutely nothing from Twilight or Coco for an extended period of time. Maybe, if she'd put more work into studying illusion and glamour magic, Twilight could have constructed an illusory conversation between herself and Coco for the listening spells to pick up instead of the conversation they were actually having. But Twilight was no tricksy Lulamoon. Even with her almost universal affinity to nearly every form of magic under the sun and moon, Twilight couldn't simply cast a set of spells she'd never studied before. That was assuming such a spell could even be cast under these circumstances. The arcanastial ring was a powerful tool and its capabilities had given Twilight the ability to turn her captives' beliefs and expectations on their heads. But it was far from a perfect substitute for her horn. Working magic through the ring always felt one step removed to Twilight, like she was slightly disconnected from the spells she was weaving. It had taken her 3 tries to be absolutely sure that the detoxification spell she'd cast for dinner earlier had been cast correctly. A more complex spell, like a full auditory illusion, would have taken an impractically long time to cast under these circumstances. "Listen carefully," said Twilight, resting her hooves on Coco's shoulders. "I meant it when I said that I was getting us out of here. But there's something else that I need to do." "What?" asked Coco, deciding not to waste time with pointless questions. At this point, all she could really do was believe in Twilight. "Elderflower sent his goons to attack the royal palace yesterday," said Twilight, her statement eliciting a shocked gasp from Coco. "They've stolen the elements of harmony." Coco shivered slightly. She'd never expected Baron Elderflower to do something so drastic. "Before we break out of here, I need to know where the elements are," said Twilight. "Do you think you could help me find them?" Shivering, Coco hesitantly nodded. Then she paused, remembering something she'd seen the previous day. I think I may know where they are." "Where?" asked Twilight, unconsciously tightening her hold on Coco's shoulders. A while ago, G. Greenblight and his ponies came in through the front door," said Coco. They were carrying some sort of large chest. I think they took it down to the basement." The basement, Twilight thought about it for the moment. In most manors like this, the basement housed the barracks but also the armory and supply rooms for the owner's guards and security forces. She supposed it was as good a place as any to hide extremely important stolen artifacts, if Elderflower didn't have any place lower down. Such a concern wouldn't have been so troubling a year or two ago. But, in the wake of the changeling invasion and the discovery of the crystal caverns beneath Canterlot, Twilight would not have been surprised that some of the noble court, like Elderflower, had suddenly developed a passion for spelunking and mining. The caverns were a veritable maze beneath the city and through the mountain. If Elderflower had hidden the elements down there, finding them while still looking after Coco's well-being would be a much more difficult job. Still, it was better than nothing. Looking back at the tub, Twilight saw that it was nearly full. Their conversation time was up. "All right," she said, turning back to Coco and speaking quickly. "When I drop the spell, I need you to act as though nothing's happened. There are listening spells all over both rooms. We'll talk about regular things and act as though this never happened. Can you do that?" Shakily, Coco nodded. About the elements, maybe Perlin could help us." Taken aback by the suggestion, Twilight blinked in surprise. "Perlin?" Coco nodded. "Yes, he could get down into the basement easier than I could. Maybe if I asked." Twilight thought it over, noting that time was quickly running out. If she didn't shut off the water soon, the tub would overflow. "Not yet," said Twilight, "but we'll keep him in mind." She could understand Coco's hopeful attitude. Perhaps Coco really was helping Perlin grow into a better pony. However, if Perlin's words the previous day were any indicator, then he was clearly still working for the Baron's interests. She remembered, all too well, Dawn and Rainbow's descriptions of Perlin, of a young mercenary who took on jobs primarily for amusement more than anything else. Coco might have been getting through to him, but that didn't necessarily mean that Perlin was on their side just yet. Oh okay, said Coco. I'm dropping the spell now, said Twilight. Remember, we have to talk like nothing happened. All right. With a grunt, Twilight released the spell and her ring once again vanished from sight. The sounds of the bathroom came rushing back in and Twilight rushed to turn off the tub. Oh, that was close. I got so carried away looking for the right shampoo I didn't even notice how full the tub was getting. It's okay, said Coco, the hitch in her voice prompting a wince from Twilight. Fortunately, given Coco's typically timid mannerisms, particularly in the context of their larger situation, it was hardly noticeable. As Twilight bathed, Coco went through the preparations to work on her mane. The two of them chatted amicably about a variety of topics, from the work Coco had done for Rarity and Suri, in the process nearly bringing Coco to tears once again, to what ideas Coco had for future designs. Twilight was impressed by the younger mare's acting skills. Coco kept the conversation going quite naturally. She supposed that spending several months pretending not to be an unwilling agent of Baron Elderflower who'd been scared out of her mind half the time had probably contributed to those skills. They wrapped up for the evening and Twilight watched Coco head out the door before settling onto the covers of her bed, wanting to sleep but having difficulties thanks to her worries about whether or not any of Elderflower's ponies suspected anything. Still, Twilight managed to eventually drift off. Shade moved swiftly and silently down the halls. She'd found a servant's staircase to ascend to the second levels. At one point, her travels brought her to a balcony that overlooked the Baron's ballroom, which stretched up into the second and third stories of the mansion. The balcony ran around the ballroom's upper perimeter, with a staircase on either side dropping down, allowing easy movement from one level to the other. Shade didn't dare follow the balcony around. The ballroom was one gigantic open space and any pony on one side could easily spot her on the other. There was a distinct lack of cover, save for the railings that ran around the balcony and the fact that the benches and seats on the second level were pressed up against the wall. The chandelier hanging from the ceiling would cast her shadow down to the floor if she tried to fly across. If any pony else came onto the balcony while Shade was making her way around or happened to glance up from the ground floor, the jig would be up. Instead, she doubled back and took a hallway around. Fortunately, this one worked its way around the space taken up by the ballroom and made its way over to the other side of the mansion. As she moved, Shade carefully inspected each room she came across. Most of them were small sitting rooms, offices, and other such spaces, nothing important. As she came down the hallway on the other side of the ballroom, Shade noted a few doors that looked more ornate than the others. These were probably ones that the Baron reserved for his personal use, particularly when he wanted to impress others in a more intimate setting than some grand gala. The first one she came to opened up into a sunroom with an impressive view looking out off the side of the mountain. She got the impression that the Baron liked this room very much given the sparkling shine of the moon and stars glinting off the freshly cleaned table. It was clear he used this room often and had it cleaned often because of that. Moving on a little further down the hall, Shade paused as she twitched, her ears perking up and forward. She picked up the faint drone of voices. They were not moving, which meant that no pony was about to come down the hall towards her. Instead, they were issuing from another door. Shade carefully stole up to the threshold and lowered herself down, tilting her head so that she could press her ear flush against the crack at the bottom of the door. Even as she did so, her other ear stuck almost straight up in the air, swiveling back and forth as she also listened up and down the hall for signs of any pony coming. Dividing her attention in such a way was a skill she'd worked hard to master. Think Dame Sparkle will come around eventually, a smooth yet masculine voice was saying. Shade surmised this was Elderflower. Eventually isn't good enough, declared the gruff voice of an unmistakably large pony. Your little operation with the elements has a limited window of opportunity. Once the Royal Guard get back from their field trip, the unrest in the city will be quelled and all you'll be is an audacious thief. Shade frowned. She figured that this voice belonged to Greenblight, the large, scarred Pegasus who led the Banehammers. The SES files on him indicated that he was a dangerous individual. But their overall assessment was that he depended largely on the backup of his subordinates to be effective. If anything, the Banehammer's second in command was considered to be the more dangerous pony on an individual level, even if Greenblight was the one making all of the decisions. Dame Sparkle's cooperation is not essential, said Elderflower. If, ultimately, we are truly pressed for time, then I can simply select her replacement from one of the available candidates and we can continue on from there. Even if she will not use the elements to further my goals, then I can still ultimately use her position as a close confidant of Princess Celestia later on. If you say so, said Greenblight dubiously. And what if none of your candidates can actually put the elements to use? Inquired a younger voice. Shade's ear twitched as she heard it. She'd heard this voice before, in the hall at the Royal Palace, right before she'd slipped away to start her mission. This was the young stallion who'd attacked Shining Armor, Perlin Bluestreak, if she remembered correctly. I am certain that will not be the case, said Elderflower, a note of irritation tinging his voice. Our candidates were culled from the brightest minds produced by magical institutions around Equestria. If any pony can unlock the secrets of the elements and plumb their depths, it will be them. Still, it couldn't hurt to have some additional contingencies, suggested Perlin. Elderflower's voice was an angry growl. That's not. For once, I agree with the boy. The outcome of your plan hinges on these artifacts you had us go to such lengths to acquire performing as expected. Greenblight was sounding surprisingly conciliatory for a stallion known to have such a fierce temper. I can understand that ponies like you probably have little appreciation for the depths of magic. However, I can assure you that you have nothing to be concerned about. Elderflower's frustration with his employees' skepticism was getting more and more pronounced. Surely, if the elements of harmony were so easy to use, Twilight Sparkle and her friends would have used them more than twice, Perlin pointed out. While my knowledge of their history is rather spotty at best, I think there would have been plenty of cause for them to turn to the elements in other situations, something about some dark unicorn up in the Crystal Empire, I think. Elderflower's sigh of frustration was audible out in the hallway. That is because there is no way that Dame Sparkle and her friends could have used the elements properly with only 2 unicorns amongst their number. A superior understanding of the magical arts is required to properly mold the forces unleashed by such powerful artifacts. If you say so, Shade could practically hear Perlin shrug. Now then, do any of you have any other concerns you wish to bring up? Asked Elderflower. When silence greeted his inquiry, he spoke again. Good. Perlin, you are dismissed for the evening. Master Greenblight, I wish to inspect our prize once again. Whatever you say, boss, said Greenblight. May I join you? Asked Perlin, I would like to see for myself just what we've made so much of an effort to acquire. If that is what you wish, said Elderflower. Shade heard the shuffling sound of hooves moving across carpet and she realized that they were heading for the door. She had only seconds before it opened and she was exposed. However, the hallway had nothing to hide behind, all the other doors were too far away for her to reach in time. Casting her eyes about, Shade fixated on the only possible direction she could go. Up. The door opened and Elderflower strode out into the hall, Greenblight following along behind him, accompanied by the usually silent Inkwell. Behind them followed Perlin Bluestreak, his black cloak billowing slightly as he turned to follow the others down the hall. None of them bothered to look up, which was just as well, as they would have spotted Shade Steel, who'd wedged herself up against the arched ceiling, bracing her legs and wings. In the brief seconds prior to the emergence of the Baron and his mercenary employees, Shade had darted up to the ceiling and lodged herself there. Then she'd slowed both her breathing and her heartbeat, relaxing and erasing her presence completely. She counted herself lucky that she'd managed to finish in time. She was a bit out of practice after spending so many months working as a maid. As she'd expected, Greenblight was indeed a menacing presence, his body seeming to overflow with power, only barely kept in check. But Inkwell was the truly frightening one of the pair, her soulless black gaze being something that Shade had first noted when she'd snuck under the carriages. However, Perlin Bluestreak practically made Shade's senses buzz as he passed beneath her. The young stallion couldn't have had as much experience as the two mercenaries in front of him, but something about Perlin struck Shade as genuinely threatening, causing her to mark him as the most dangerous of the three. Even though he was in the heart of what should have been safe territory for him, the young stallion maintained an active awareness of his surroundings. Shade counted herself lucky that he apparently couldn't sense the wind like Dawn could, or he would have noticed her immediately. As it was, she would have to exercise great caution following the group while he was around. Shade waited until the group reached a corner and turned around it before dropping to the floor. Moving swiftly and silently, she tailed behind them, always making sure to keep to something she could conceal herself behind should one of them happen to look back. Even as she did, she made sure to keep aware of her surroundings. It wouldn't do to hide herself from Elderflower and his allies if she was stumbled on by some random servant running an errand. The group made their way down the hallways to one of the mansion's auxiliary stairways, not unlike the one Shade had originally followed up to the second floor. She was careful to remain at least one full flight behind and above the group. They descended down past the first floor and into the basement. Once there, Elderflower opened the door and stepped inside. Stepping down onto the basement level behind the group, Shade barely managed to get a glimpse of the basement through the door as it swung shut. She'd been rewarded by the sight of yet another hallway, this one lined by a large number of doors on both sides. She'd also seen the shapes of other ponies moving up and down the passage. This was the barracks where Elderflower's guards and, apparently, his hired mercenaries currently resided. Going any further would be extremely dangerous. This level of the house was occupied by trained soldiers and experienced fighters. If she made the slightest mistake, she'd be discovered and then everything she'd done would have been for naught. By all rights, she should have turned back and gone to make her report to Shining. She'd confirmed via her eavesdropping on Elderflower's previous conversation that both Twilight Sparkle and the Elements or Harmony were here in Elderflower's mansion. Even now, she had a good idea of where both Twilight and the Elements were. If she went any further, she risked throwing all that away. Shade lifted a hoof and rested it against the door, taking a deep breath. Now was the time to make the decision. Her pride as a pony who'd once been an elite operative of the Royal Guard SES demanded that she follow through, that she discover every tidbit she could that might help Shining and preserve Pony's lives once he and the Royal Guard went into action. However, a more rational part at her urged her to withdraw, that she had done enough, that she shouldn't jeopardize the mission simply to satisfy her pride. She wasn't part of the SES anymore. She was a criminal, performing a task in exchange for her freedom. In the end, it all came down to who she was doing this for. Shade closed her eyes and thought about Shining, his eyes full of barely concealed worry for his sister. She thought about Dawn and how he'd forgiven her for her crimes, even going so far as to invite her to join him and those close to him for breakfast on Hearts Warming. She thought about Princess Luna, against whom she'd harbored a grudge for fabricated evils. Also, her mind turned to the figure of a little unicorn back in Ponyville, a filly who Shade needed to speak to once everything was said and done. Shade considered all this and more, taking one last deep breath before looking silently at the door, and backing slowly away. Something caught your eye? Asked Greenblight, noticing that Perlin had been glancing back at the door to the stairwell. Perlin blinked at the stallion's words before turning back. No, nothing really. I'm just a little distracted. Greenblight chuckled darkly. You shouldn't let yourself get so easily distracted, lad, or some pony might take that flighty head off your shoulders. Perhaps, said Perlin, pushing off the implied threat with his usual lack of concern. Greenblight snorted irritably at the failure of his barbs to sink in. Instead, he continued following in the wake of Elderflower as the group walked to one of the armories that shared space with the guards' quarters in the basement. Opening the door, Elderflower went inside and turned on the light. The room normally housed spare weapons and pieces of armor. Right now, it was completely bare, everything having been cleared out to make room for the single, large chest that rested in the center of it. Using his magic, Elderflower flipped back the lid, allowing the light from above to illuminate the precious contents within. There they were, the fabled 6 elements of harmony. 5 golden necklaces and 1 golden tiara. Each one was inset with a gem of a particular shape and hue. They were works of art, exquisitely crafted. Just looking at them filled Elderflower with pride and satisfaction. They were his and, soon, they would be carried by the unicorns that had sworn themselves to his cause. With the elements on his side, wielded by ponies who could tap the full depths of their power, Elderflower knew that it was impossible to lose. And yet there was something off. As Elderflower examined the elements in their chest, he was conscious of the fact that he couldn't sense any magic in them at all. He'd dealt with magical artifacts in the past, though nothing very powerful, and even small pieces of enchanted jewelry. Such items always had a faint buzz of residual magic around them, whether they were being used or not. However, the elements of harmony had none of that. They were completely inert to his senses, as though they were 6 pieces of completely ordinary jewelry. Very sparkly, to be sure, said Greenblight, eyeing them dubiously, to think we had to fight so hard to get them. Without a word, Perlin slowly stepped toward the chest for a closer look. For some reason, his heartbeat quickened as he looked at the elements. They were physically beautiful, that much was indisputable, yet there was something more. Perlin lifted a hoof and held it out over each of the elements in turn. His hoof passed over the red lightning bolt without so much as a twitch, the same with the blue balloon and even the magenta starburst on the tiara. The orange apple did nothing either. However, as his hoof passed over the purple gem shaped like a diamond, Perlin felt a faint snap like a discharge of static electricity. The sensation wasn't painful or stinging, but almost tickling. His hoof paused, but nothing else happened. Perlin wondered if he'd imagined it. Then his hoof moved to hover over the little pink butterfly. It wasn't so much as a snap but a faint tingling sensation now. Perlin moved his hoof in closer. Unbidden, his mind was flooded with images of Coco, of her smiling, of her crying, of her hoof against his cheek and brushing against his wing. Little by little, the gem began feeling warmer and warmer beneath Perlin's hoof, threatening to become uncomfortably hot even though he wasn't even touching it at the moment. Looking at the gem, Perlin fancied that it might have begun to glow faintly. Please put your hoof down, instructed Elderflower, nothing in his tone of voice suggesting that he had noticed anything from the elements themselves. I would rather not risk you damaging such precious objects. Even if I build you for the remainder of your entire life, you wouldn't be able to properly compensate for damaging even one of them. Perlin put his hoof back down. The feeling was gone and he wondered if he had actually felt anything at all. Maybe I imagined it, he thought, taking one last look at the butterfly-shaped gem sitting innocuously in the chest. If your curiosity is sated, then perhaps you should leave, said Elderflower, a note of irritation in his voice. Beneath his calm visage, he was dealing with a simmering anger at the thought that a lowly Pegasus like Perlin would dare to touch something so precious and powerful. It had been bad enough that these elements had been worn by earth ponies and Pegasi. Elderflower didn't dare allow any pony from the other tribes to touch them, lest the elements were tarnished in some way. Yes, I think I've seen enough, said Perlin distractedly, stepping out of the room, leaving Elderflower to silently gloat over his spoils. Shade was doubly careful as she made her way up through the manor, passing the ground floor, then the second floor. At the third floor, she paused, wondering if she should take the chance to confirm Twilight Sparkle's location. However, she figured it was probably best not to take any more risks. The time had come to report in and let Shining Armor handle the rest. Cautiously, she made her way up to the fourth floor, where the stairs came to an end. These were the servants' quarters. Shade cautiously looked around for any sign of any maids or butlers moving about. But the doors to their rooms were all closed. Hopefully there was a way to the roof or an upper-level window that she could fly out of. The Baron would have been a fool not to have some pony watching the sky for intruders attempting to fly in, but she wondered if his spotters would be in a position to notice a pony leaving if she was already inside the perimeter. Making her way down the hall, Shade kept an ear out for the signs of any pony approaching. Soon, her ears perked as she picked up the sound of hoof steps coming from down the hallway ahead. Looking around, Shade tried to find someplace to hide. However, this hall had even less cover than the ones below. After all, Elderflower had no need to decorate his servants' quarters with expensive art or decorative plants. The rooms were out of the question, given that she had no idea which ones were occupied or not and didn't have the time to check. The ceiling was too low for Shade to pull the trick she'd used to evade Elderflower and his mercenaries earlier. Her ears going back, Shade sank back away from the source of the sound. If she was spotted, she would only have seconds to act. If she killed the pony about to spot her, maybe she could hide the body and buy a little time. However, if the approaching servant managed to alert the rest of the household to Shade's presence. The servant ahead came into view, her eyes widening as she saw the dark gray Pegasus. Shade's own eyes widened as she took in the maid's features, namely her cyan mane and matching eyes, as well as her off-white coat. Shade realized she was looking at the other mare abducted from Ponyville, Coco Pommel, if she recalled the information from the file correctly. In a flash, Shade crossed the distance between them, managing to reach Coco just as she was about to open her mouth. Shade's hoof reached her first and covered Coco's mouth. Moving fluidly, like liquid shadow, Shade swept around, moving up and over behind Coco, wrapping her other foreleg around Coco's neck and pulling her back while keeping one hoof clamped against the younger mare's lips. Make a single noise and I'll snap your neck, whispered Shade harshly, her blood boiling at the sight of Coco. After all, from the look of things, Coco had been working for the Baron when Twilight was abducted. If she was a maid now, then it was likely that she'd been in the Baron's employ the entire time, a plant. The fact that she was moving around freely when Twilight Sparkle was obviously confined seemed to reinforce that fact. I'm going to ask you some questions and you are going to answer them, whispered Shade harshly, again, making any noise but answering me will get you killed. She felt Coco's throat bob against her foreleg, a clear sign of a suppressed whimper. From her angle, Shade could see the tears gathering at the corner of Coco's eyes. She should have thought about that before she threw in with the Baron, Shade thought harshly. I have a better idea. Shade felt a faint chill against her neck as the smooth, young, but undeniably masculine voice of Perlin Bluestreak interjected. You will let her go right now and I won't separate your head from your shoulders. If you think you'd be able to snap her neck before I could do that, I welcome you to try. Shade trembled as the powerful malice of the young stallion's killing intent cascaded over her like a waterfall. It wasn't as intense as Arkenstone, who'd once made her hallucinate her own death, but it did speak of a pony far more able than she was, who was more than capable of following through on his threat. Now, said Perlin, each word seeming to sharpen his killing intent until it was not unlike the blade he currently held against her neck, I will repeat myself once more and then your head will roll. Let her go, now. Shade's forelegs fell away and Coco sagged to the floor, now whimpering audibly. Coco, come around behind me, said Perlin, his voice much gentler. Moving stiffly, but quickly, Coco did as she was told. As she walked past Shade, the former guard's mare was certain that Perlin was about to kill her once Coco was behind him. However, once Coco had walked past Perlin, he actually lowered the blade against Shade's throat and stepped back. Moving slowly, aware that the killing blow could come at any second now, Shade slowly turned around, shocked by what she saw. She'd seen Perlin's wings before, having taken the chance to sneak a peek at them while he and Shining Armor were fighting in the palace. However, this was the first time she was able to see his wing up close and observe the meticulous detail in its design as he held it up like a barrier between Shade and Coco. Now then, I think you shall be answering my questions, said Perlin, his hawk-like eyes narrowing as he glared at Shade. Author's notes. Perlin's experience with the element of kindness serves as a callback of sorts to a conversation Twilight had with Sunset Shimmer a couple stories ago about the true nature of the elements. It's not a big revelation, but another indicator about what kind of pony Perlin has the potential to be underneath his callous killer outer layer. Next chapter, it's go time. Reporting in. Chapter 11, Reporting in. The tension running through the hallway was almost a tangible substance as Shade Steel stared at Perlin Bluestreak. This had to be the worst-case scenario for her. Not only had she'd been discovered by Baron Elderflower's most dangerous hired killer, a pony who had fought evenly with shining armor. If it came down to a fight, Shade doubted she'd be able to escape. While she counted herself at her most deadly in close quarters, she was currently unarmed and Perlin was likely deadlier than she was to begin with. Either she'd be killed right here or Perlin would report her to the Baron and everything Shade had spent the past 2 days working on, risking her life in the process, would come undone. Who are you and what are you doing here? Asked Perlin in a cold, no-nonsense tone. Shade could hear the barely restrained anger simmering just below the surface as he spoke. From the way he kept himself protectively between Coco and her, she wondered if Perlin had feelings for the young mare. Shade clamped her mouth shut, pressing her lips into a thin line as she pondered her options. If she doubled back, she'd only end up back at the stairwell and then it would simply be a matter or not as to whether she could flee through the manor faster than Perlin could pursue. She shifted her weight, making ready to turn and bolt. Perlin's wing flashed, moving faster than she could see. Something lanced out away from him, flashing past Shade's face in a silvery blur before whipping back into his wing. A second later, Shade felt a line of pain along her cheek and she incredulously raised a hoof. Pulling it away, she found a trickle of blood. She felt cold all of a sudden and Shade realized that running was not an option either. Now then, do I have to repeat my question or will you require another demonstration? Asked Perlin. With a sigh, Shade realized that she had no hope of escape. However, the last thing she wanted to do was start giving Elderflower's employees information. Granted, the information she had wouldn't really undermine shining armor in any way. But the last thing Shade wanted to do was give any information to the enemy. Then something occurred to her. Perlin had her at his mercy. However, what he should have done was raise the alarm, shouted, done anything that would catch the attention of somebody else. Behind the doors could be any number of servants waiting to be awoken by a loud shout. Once that was done, Elderflower and the rest of his mercenaries could take custody of Shade and interrogate her properly. Instead, Perlin was speaking softly, as though he specifically didn't want to disturb any pony or give away the fact that he'd found an intruder. In a way, it almost seemed as though he was actually helping her. My name is Shade Steel, said Shade softly, hoping that she could trust her gut on this one. I'm here on behalf of Shining Armor to find the ponies responsible for the abduction of his sister and the theft of the elements of harmony. I see, said Perlin, talking over the sound of Coco Pommel's surprised gasp. I thought it was something like that. Shade blinked and canted her head to the side. You did. Yes, said Perlin, I trust your mission was fruitful. I thought I'd noticed some pony following us down to the barracks. Shade licked her lips nervously. Yes, it was. Good, said Perlin, his expression still stony, but slightly softer now. Then I will show you out. Shade's jaw dropped as she stared at the young stallion. Behind Perlin, Coco was looking at him with a similarly shocked expression. Wah, what do you mean? Asked Shade. Exactly what I said, said Perlin, turning around and gesturing for Shade to follow him. We should hurry. I don't want this to end badly because some pony up here decided they need to use the bathroom or something. As he turned around, he leaned his head over to Coco and whispered something in her ear. Coco gave him a nervous, uncertain look, then moved to walk past both Perlin and Shade, cringing slightly as she walked past the older mare. Shade watched Coco out of the corner of her eye as Coco went to one of the rooms and went inside. She won't be reporting this, if that's what you're worried about, said Perlin. She may have more freedom to move about the mansion, but she's as much a prisoner as Twilight Sparkle is. Shade kept her mouth shut as she watched Perlin, wondering what exactly he was planning. Part of her suspected that he might still kill her, but at this point there was nothing to lose by playing along. She could only hope he was being sincere. Perlin began leading her down the hallway. Stopping at one of the doors, he pushed it open to reveal another stairway leading upwards. That one goes to the roof, he said. There are at least 2 sentries on the north and south ends during the night. I recommend descending to about the 3rd floor's level before flying out. Make for the buildings beyond the wall and drop down to the streets as soon as you can. That will give you the best chance to get away without being spotted. Thank you, said Shade, but why are you helping me escape? Perlin smirked at her. As it stands, my assignment is nearly finished and my employer has said that there is no real need to keep up appearances any longer. Your employer? Now Shade was confused. Perlin was supposed to be working for Baron Elderflower. There was no way he could be serving the Baron's interests by helping her escape the mansion, was he? It's nothing you need worry about, said Perlin with a chuckle. Suffice to say that I have no need to hinder your mission. Shade swallowed hard, hoping that she could trust the young stallion's words. After all, for all she knew, he could simply be directing her to a rooftop ambush. However, it was all or nothing. Either Perlin was being honest about helping her or he was setting her up to take a fall. It didn't change what Shade had to do. Despite that, she continued to move cautiously as she made her way up the stairs, opening the door to the roof as silently as she could, casting her eyes about for any sign of the sentries. They were exactly where Perlin had said they would be. There weren't a lot of places for ponies to hide on the rooftop, so Shade felt fairly safe when she didn't see any other ponies. Being sure to be absolutely quiet as she closed the door behind her, Shade made her way to the edge of the roof between the 2 sentries, who were busy scanning the skies for any signs of interlopers attempting to come in above. Following Perlin's advice, she stepped off the roof and allowed herself to drop 2 stories before she spread her wings and leveled out well above the gazes of the guards patrolling the grounds and below the gaze of the guards scanning the skies above. As soon as she was past the wall, she dipped down and darted down into an alleyway that ran between 2 buildings just across the road from Elderflower's estate. Touching down, Shade took one last chance to glance over her shoulder, checking to see if any pony had noticed her presence and raised the alarm. However, Elderflower's estate remained as silent and peaceful as it had been when she'd first arrived. Shade didn't allow herself to relax. She set off at a trot, wandering at random through the streets and alleys just in case some pony was actually following behind her. Only when she was absolutely certain that no pony was on her tail and that she was a safe distance away from the mansion did she take to the air and begin winging her way back to the royal palace. Coco looked up as the door opened and Perlin stepped into her room. Perlin, what? Shush, said Perlin, putting a hoof to his lips, cutting Coco off. He glanced around the room for a moment before closing his eyes and letting out a breath. For a moment, he stood there silently, seeming to listen to something. We should be safe, he said. What were you doing? Trying to see if I could sense any listening spells, said Perlin. I noticed that Elderflower had them placed in Twilight Sparkle's room. I was worried that he might have placed them in your room as well. Are you sure there aren't any? Asked Coco, beginning to sweat at the idea of Elderflower or some pony working for him, listening to everything she said and did. What about the rest of the manor? I could sense the spells in Twilight Sparkle's room easily enough, said Perlin. It's rather simple if you know what to look for. I was trained to fight unicorns, so it's something that I was thoroughly drilled in. Oh, said Coco, her ears going back at the reminder of Perlin's history. Granted, he was now using what he'd gained from that history to protect her, but that didn't make it any less unnerving. Well, what about that mare? She left, replied Perlin simply. With any luck, she will be back at the palace shortly and some pony will come to rescue the two of you. Why did you help her? Asked Coco. Because we're nearly finished here, said Perlin, the corners of his mouth turning up in a small smile. When all this is over, you won't have to worry about Elderflower ever again. I won't. Despite the fact that Perlin's words were encouraging, they filled Coco with a sense of foreboding, an ominous feeling. There was something in the finality of Perlin's tone that filled Coco's heart with dread. Perlin, what are you talking about? The less you know, the safer you will be, said Perlin. Stepping in close to her, Perlin leaned against Coco and pressed his neck up against hers, letting his chin rest over her withers. Coco was a bit hesitant at first, but she ultimately returned the gesture. I'm sorry, said Perlin, his voice almost a whisper. My selfishness ended up causing you so much trouble and pain. Please bear with it a little longer. I promise that you won't have to live in fear after this. Perlin, Coco felt a shiver go through her body. This was wrong. Something was very wrong. Perlin began pulling away from her. As he did, he gently drew his muzzle across her neck, nuzzling his way up to her cheek before ending nose to nose with her. Slowly, Perlin backed away from her, an apologetic smile on his face. Coco looked at him, her worry growing. The sense of wrongness was intensifying with each affectionate gesture. This wasn't right. Perlin's words were gentle, encouraging, and filled with care and concern for her. But for some reason, she had the ominous feeling that, in his own way, Perlin was saying goodbye to her. I need to go, said Perlin, taking another step back and turning to take his leave. Wait, Coco lunged forward and threw her arms around Perlin's shoulders, drawing him up short. Perlin froze, his wings rustling underneath his cloak at the unexpected contact. Be careful, I could have. Please, said Coco, still clinging tightly to Perlin. I don't know what it is you're going to do, but I don't want you going somewhere I can't follow. I know you mean well, but I'm afraid you need to come back. Please don't run away from me. Perlin swallowed hard. I'm not sure what it is I plan to do, but I may end up doing something that you won't be able to forgive me for. Then don't do it, said Coco, pressing her face into his neck. If you know something is wrong, then you should know better than to do it. That's something a grown pony does, Perlin. Remember, you need to be an adult now. For a moment, Perlin said nothing. He seemed to be thinking about what she said. It may not be right, but it remains something I need to do anyway, he said. He began to pull away. Before he could pull away completely, Coco pulled hard in the opposite direction, yanking Perlin back towards her and turning him around so they were face to face once again. Before Perlin could say or do anything, Coco leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was quick and chaste. They pulled away, staring at each other. Coco as astonished by her own boldness as Perlin was. Their cheeks burned as they stared at each other. Why, you still have a lot of growing up to do, said Coco, her eyes tearing up as she tried her hardest to keep the smile on her face. Think of that as a promise for when you do. Leaning in again, she moved her lips up to Perlin's ear. So come back to me. Perlin looked as though he desperately wanted to say yes, to agree to her terms. However, in a sharp, jerking movement, he pulled out of her arms and darted back out the door, shutting it behind him. Left alone in the room, Coco whimpered and pressed a hoof to her chest. Meanwhile, outside the room, Perlin walked down the hall at a hurried pace. However, before he'd reached the stairs back down, he froze. His right hoof, the one that he'd held over the elements of harmony, was beginning to throb faintly. Shining Armor was jolted awake by the sound of some pony pounding on his door. It took him a moment as he blinked groggily. Beside him in bed, he felt Cadence stir as she too was roused by the frantic pounding. Honey, what is it? Asked Cadence, rolling over. Gritting his teeth, Shining glared at the door, which was shaking from the force of the knocks. Go back to sleep, dear, he said. I'll find out and, so help me, if it isn't important, there's going to be an opening in the ranks once I finish with the court-martial. With a low growl, he forced himself out of bed and onto his hooves. It was bad enough that he was already having trouble sleeping, what with his sister full nap, the palace raided, and the elements stolen. Now ponies had to come and pound on his door at all hours of the night. Grabbing the knob with his magic, Shining yanked it open, standing back so that he didn't catch a face full of hoof when the door was out of the way. The guard on the other side immediately dropped his hoof and stood at attention, saluting sharply as he met Shining's glare with only the mildest of flinches. This had better be good, rumbled Shining. Sir, Shadesteel has returned with her report. She said to tell you that she found them. A feeling like an electric shock jolted through Shining's body, knocking all thought of sleep away. Where is she? He asked. She's waiting in your office, sir. Thank you for your prompt report, said Shining. You're dismissed. Get some rest. Yes, sir. The guard turned and set off down the hall as Shining closed the door again. What was it? Asked Cadence as he came back towards the bed. Shadesteel's back, said Shining, a small smile on his face. It seems she succeeded. Now it was Cadence's turn to jump as she jerked out from under her sheets. Really? Shining nodded. Go get Arkenstone. I'm going to head to my office and take Shade's report. Cadence nodded and untangled herself from the sheets as Shining's horn flashed, silvery armor coalescing into being around his body. You should use a comb, said Cadence, noting her husband's bad case of bedmane. That can wait, said Shining. This is no time to worry about appearances. Cotton sighed and nodded. She would have liked to spend a little time to make herself presentable too. But fetching Arkenstone and kickstarting the process of getting Twilight and the elements back came first. So, it was Elderflower, said Arkenstone, cupping his chin with one hoof as they finished listening to Shade Steele's report. It almost seems wrong, somehow. I can confirm it, said Shade. I heard the Baron with my own ears. I would have tried to follow him to get an exact fix on the element's location, but I didn't want to risk being discovered. You've done more than enough, said Shining, a smile on his face, the first one he'd worn while looking at Shade. This means the world to me. Thank you. I owe you, all of you, that much at least, said Shade, a slight smile on her own face. Still, it doesn't feel quite right, said Arkenstone. I'm amazed that a pony like Elderflower would do something so overt. Taking the trouble to come speak with Twilight in Ponyville was also outside my expectations. But I didn't peg him to be a pony to resort to something so violent. Maybe you forced his hoof already, suggested Shining. But still, from what you heard, his plans seem ludicrous, said Cadance, trying to outfit ponies of his own choosing with the elements and believing it will work simply because they are unicorns. It's ridiculous. The elements of harmony just don't work that way. Of course they don't, snorted Arkenstone, but Elderflower and those like him don't believe that. In their own way, they aren't all that different from the members of the cult Solar in that they refuse to believe that which they find to be inconvenient. He didn't seem to notice Shade's pained flinch at his words. If it weren't for the fact that this guy needs to pay for all the suffering he's caused and the ponies who've died as a consequence of his orders, I'd almost let him keep the elements just so we can see his whole plan go up in smoke when he tries to use them, muttered Shining Armor. It's gonna take some time. The rest of the Royal Guard is still a few days out and we'll have to make sure all the prisoners are secure before we move. That won't be necessary, said Arkenstone, turning around and heading for the door. I will take care of this matter tomorrow morning. Both Shining and Cotton stared at him. Under normal circumstances, they wouldn't have hesitated to simply let Arkenstone go and do his thing. As formidable as the Banehammers were and whatever ponies Elderflower might have had on his guard, Shining and Cotton pitied the ponies who might try to get between Arkenstone and Twilight. However, you're still recovering from your injuries, aren't you? Asked Shining. Are you sure you're up for this? To Shining's surprise, Arkenstone turned his head slightly, angling an ear back towards him. Fortunately, I happen to have the assistance of two rather trustworthy ponies. However, they will require a good night's sleep, which is why I'm waiting for the morning. After that, the blind stallion took his leave. Shining blinked and shot a confused look at Cadance, who lifted a hoof to her mouth and giggled coyly. You know something I don't? He asked. I think the three of them will be just fine, said Cadance. Call it a mare's intuition. What am I missing here? Asked Shade, blinking as she watched the couple. Arkenstone brought a pair of young helpers from Ponyville with him, explained Cadance. Wait, do you mean Dawn? Asked Shade. Shining shook his head. Dawn's still recovering in Ponyville. He fought another one of your fellow cultists, Tara Hart. Shade's back legs collapsed and she dropped down onto her haunches, her wings hanging limply down her sides as she gaped at Shining. The Cardinal. Dawn Lightwing fought the Cardinal, and lived. Barely, said Shining. According to Arkenstone, it was a near thing. But if he's still alive then, that must mean that the Cardinal lost. Did Dawn Lightwing win? Shining shook his head. No, Dawn ended up losing. Arkenstone was the one who defeated the Cardinal. Shade's entire body began to shake violently as she looked over her shoulder at the door the blind stallion had exited through. After she had been defeated by Dawn in Ponyville, Arkenstone had confronted her at the guard station where she'd been confined. At the time, she hadn't known the truth about his identity and had even entertained the idea of subduing him so that she could escape to go after Dawn again. However, she'd barely had time to conceive the notion before Arkenstone had hit her with a blow of pure killing intent, striking Shade down with the image of her own violent death if she tried to make her idea a reality. At that time, she'd been made aware of the vast gulf between her and the Knight of the Celestial Order. On the other hoof, Shade had never actually seen, much less met Tara Hart, the Cardinal of the Order of Celestial Light. However, as the pony second only to the Supreme Pontiff himself, Tara had been an almost mythical figure within the Order, with stories of his feats and prowess rivaling the tales of the knights that Shade had listened to as a foal. He'd been thought of as an invincible paragon of Celestia's will. Shade had never imagined such a pony being defeated. And yet, Arkenstone had beaten Tara. The realization shocked Shade to the core. Ever since her capture and punishment, she had learned the truth of the cult Solar's culture of deceit. However, she'd still believed that the Cardinal was an exceedingly powerful pony. Is the car? Tara Hart dead then? Asked Shade. No, said Shining, we have him in custody. But Arkenstone came very close to killing him. He only stopped when Celestia intervened personally. I see, said Shade, looking down at the floor. It's late, said Cadance, giving Shade a small smile. You've done an excellent job and we will speak with the princesses about commuting your sentence. Go and rest. You've earned it. Thank you, said Shade, dipping her head before taking her leave. After the door closed behind Shade, Cadance glanced at her husband. Now what? Well, I guess I should send a letter to Spike letting Twilight's friends know we've found her, said Shining, taking up paper and quill. Poor guy won't thank us for waking him up at this hour, but I think he'd like to know right away. I guess none of us are getting any sleep tonight, said Cadance, staring out the window and watching the moon as it meandered across the sky. Misery loves company, said Shining wryly, his quill already flying across the page. In the caverns below Canterlot, Perlin Bluestreak looked around at the numerous crystal formations jutting out of walls, hanging from above, and growing from below. They glittered with countless colors, reflecting and refracting any ambient light and throwing it about in a vibrant display that dazzled the eyes. Despite this, they didn't compare to the harsh strobing of the colored lights used in nightclubs across Equestria. Instead, Crystal's luminance was gentle and comforting. Perlin could understand Celestia's desire to keep the caverns intact rather than having them stripped of their natural decorations to sat the greed of various nobles and entrepreneurs. Still, even though Celestia and those who served her wished to protect the caverns, they didn't know the caverns' full extent, not yet. Mapping the crystal caverns was a tedious, lengthy process that had to be carried out with a great deal of caution. Every year, more of the caverns were discovered, from tiny passageways almost too small to admit a pony leading to massive caverns, to flooded chambers whose underwater tunnels might yet lead to other, even more spectacular sections of the cave. Finding all these places was neither easy nor safe, and a pony who was unfortunate enough to lose her way might wander the rest of her natural life and never find the way out. And all that was without the ghost stories. The caverns had only been rediscovered recently thanks to the changeling invasion. However, stories were already circulating. Archives had been searched, records scoured, and many a tome of forgotten lore pondered over, one, revealing what little historical accounts remained of the caverns, including many of the legends that surrounded them. Stories abounded about ghosts, ghouls, goblins, and other monsters of even more horrific description. Some ponies even theorized that an offshoot of the legendary Yahoos that supposedly dwelt amongst the peaks of the Himalayan mountains might be found in these caves. There were tales of caverns that changed their shape and orientation after ponies went through them so that they never had the same way in or out, theories that the caverns themselves were an extension of some alien intelligence, and the inevitable tales of the caves being inhabited by some supernatural equine of unnaturally tall and thin proportions fitted out with a rather dapper suit and a face of varying descriptions, when it had a face at all. Perlin had heard many of these stories. They certainly made for interesting reading. However, he'd never actually believed any of them. But, looking around at the natural majesty and mystery of the caves around him, he could easily imagine how such legends could come into being. The shimmering crystals and all the effects they created excited the mind and made the heart race. Perlin liked it down here. Granted, he liked the open skies better, but the crystal caverns were a very nice place to visit. I see you've made it. Up ahead, a familiar stallion stepped out from behind one of the many crystal formations. Whiteshade smiled as Perlin approached. Of course, said Perlin, I apologize for the delay. I had some business to take care of before I left the Lord Baron's manor. Oh, White raised a curious eyebrow. Perlin chuckled. Just as you said, he wasn't nearly as clever as he thought he was about covering his tracks. It would seem that the information of Twilight Sparkle and the element's whereabouts will be in the hooves of the Royal Guard, if it isn't already. I thought as much, said White, though a good bit sooner than I thought. Is that a problem? Asked Perlin as White began to lead them deeper into the network of caves. No, said White, but once again, I am reminded that ponies can be easily underestimated, even when they aren't formidable elites, like you or the knights. What comes next then? Asked Perlin. We shall simply allow things to play out as they stand, replied White. Elderflower and those who aided him have served their purpose. If by some miraculous happenstance the Royal Guard and Sir Arkenstone somehow fail to put a permanent end to the Lord Baron's ambitions, then it shall fall to us to clear the board. If that is the case, then there is something we probably should see to, said Perlin. He spoke quietly to White, who listened before nodding. Yes, perhaps we should intervene in that case. As pointless as it would be in the grand scheme of things, leaving such issues unattended would hamper my plans somewhat. He sighed. As much as I would like to see things play out, I think we might have to step in. Then how shall we proceed? Asked Perlin. It wouldn't do for us to do anything until Sir Arkenstone has made his move, said White, but I think we can act soon. The two of them proceeded further still into the caves and were soon lost amongst the glittering and glimmering lights. I see, said Celestia before yawning widely. Thank you for coming to tell me. Cadence nodded slowly. Are you sure it's all right to let Arkenstone handle this? His body isn't in the best shape right now. Slowly, the older Alicorn shook her head. I don't think that anything I might say would dissuade him from his course. Sadly, we simply do not have enough ponies in Canterlot yet to mount a proper strike. Arkenstone is right. Time is of the essence here. Then, maybe you should go as well, suggested Cadence. If Twilight Sparkle was kidnapped against her will and the same pony behind such an act brazenly attacked the royal palace and stole the elements of harmony, then you should be taking direct action. To Cadence's surprise, Celestia actually smirked at her. I could, she said, but in this case, I don't believe I need to. She held up a hoof, forestalling Cadence's response. This isn't like the situation with the cult Solar, where I was too worried about overstepping my bounds to act until things had already advanced much farther than they should have. She shook her head. That was truly a terrible case of negligence on my part. In this case, I do not need to act because I know things will go well, even if I don't intervene. What do you mean? Asked Cadence. Celestia giggled. You don't honestly believe that Twilight has been a passive captive all this time, do you? Don't you remember a gift that your husband gave her courtesy of Arkenstone? Cadence's eyes widened as she realized what Celestia was referring to. Oh, the ring. Nodding, Celestia looked out the window, her eyes roaming across Canterlot's rooftops. Baron Elderflower's plan was coming undone from the moment of its very inception, yet he foolishly believes that nothing is wrong. However, he shall fail, and the ponies that will bring an end to his ambitions will be the very ponies he sees as being beneath him. First he shall suffer the complete and utter humiliation of being bested by those he considers inferior. Then I shall descend upon him with the weight of the law and give him the punishment he truly deserves, him and those who aided him. He will rot in a cell for the rest of his natural life with the knowledge of who defeated him eating away at his mind. That shall be his real punishment. Cadence shivered, reminded that, when she wanted to be, Celestia could be viciously vindictive under the right circumstances. Besides, said Celestia, gesturing to a stack of papers resting on her desk, it's not as though I've been sitting idle here. When the rest of the Royal Guard returns, we shall be engaging in another sweep, this time of Canterlot. Is that? Cadence eyed the stack of papers nervously. Celestia nodded. Blueblood, Fancy Pants, and the ponies they've managed to sway have not stood idle either. With this information, we will be able to abolish the noble court once and for all, and their farce shall be at an end. Once this is over, my little ponies won't have to worry about the machinations of those deluded idiots who somehow believe that a coincidence of birth makes them inherently superior to others. She sighed, and that project of mine will finally be completed. Cadence nodded. She would be quite glad to know that ponies would no longer be subjected to the mysterious games and power plays of the noble court. For centuries, Celestia had worked slowly and carefully at stripping them of their power and influence without them realizing. Now, Elderflower's ambition to return the noble court to its original levels of power and influence would instead be its downfall. If that's all, then I think you can return to your husband, said Celestia. You should both get some sleep. It would seem that tomorrow is bound to be a busy day. Yes, agreed Cadence. Good night, Auntie. Good night, replied Celestia, watching as Cadence left. As the door closed behind Cadence, Celestia let the smile drop from her face, adopting a stern, worried expression as she turned to look out the window once more. And, with the nobles finally out of the way, I can focus on something much more important. Morningstar was still out there after all. His plan wasn't yet complete. Celestia felt certain that, whatever he was planning to set into motion, the final piece of Morningstar's plan would be found here in Canterlot. The time had come to set aside distractions like the noble court permanently. Morning, too, had come, and with it, Arkenstone had roused Scootaloo and Rumble into wakefulness. He told the two of them to report to the dining room for breakfast, where he would explain the situation, along with their plan of action. Apparently he and Shining Armor had learned where Twilight Sparkle and Coco Pommel were being kept. It was now time to rescue them and bring them home. In her room, Scootaloo stared down at the ribbon draped over her hooves. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and thought back to that night a couple months ago, when she'd faced down Pearl and Bluestreak. She remembered the look of fear and worry in Dawn's face and his anger over how reckless she had been. She remembered returning the strip of stolen fabric to Rarity and Coco and the look of relief on their faces. More importantly, Scootaloo remembered a vague feeling, a sense of accomplishment, something she hadn't noticed at the time. But now, she realized that, in a sense, that simple act of kindness and reassurance had been even more important than managing to hold her own briefly against Pearl and Bluestreak. That's what Mom was talking about, she thought, what Dawn's been doing all this time, fighting for others. I shouldn't be fighting for myself but for Coco, Twilight, Arkenstone, and even Dawn. Opening her eyes, she looked down at the ribbon again and smiled before taking the strip of fabric and wrapping it around her neck like a scarf so that its ends trailed up and rested over the base of her wings. Looking up at the clock, she realized that her time was nearly up. Taking a deep breath, she centered herself once more. Let's do this. Meanwhile, in the room next door, Rumble was busy winding the cord of his meteor hammer around his foreleg. Since he had received Cadence's blessing, he'd felt as though he'd grown a bit more accustomed to the presence of the real weapon. He hadn't gotten the chance to practice with it since then, but the steel weight of the weapon now felt as though it belonged by his side. All told, Rumble felt much more at ease than he had a day or so prior. His ears perked up right at the sound of some pony knocking at the door. Opening it, Rumble blinked in surprise as he found himself facing none other than Princess Cadence. Hi, she said, beaming down at the colt, may I come in? Sure, agreed Rumble, blinking as he looked up at her. Cadence levitated a small box off of her back and lowered it down to Rumble, who took it in his hooves. It was a bit of a rush order that I placed with one of the palace tailors. Fortunately, she's a friend of mine, so she managed to get it done before this morning. Take a look. Rumble pulled the lid off the box. His eyes widened as he stared unabashedly at what was contained within. It was a pale green shirt of light silk with white embroideries along the collar and at the ends of the sleeves. The color aside, it was nearly identical in appearance to the one Stormfront had worn almost constantly. It's amazing, he said. I haven't had a chance to meet your teacher, but I did see his picture from the files that Shining Armor had, explained Cadence. Luckily, the tailor was able to replicate the design in your size. Thank you so much, said Rumble. Carefully, so as not to dislodge his weapon, he slipped into the shirt and, with the aid of his feathers, tied the front closed. Taking a moment, he examined himself in the mirror. It really looks quite handsome on you, observed Cadence with an amused titter. I think that Sweetie Belle will be very impressed the next time she sees you. Rumble's cheeks turned pink, but he smiled nonetheless. Thank you, he said warmly. You're welcome, said Cadence. Bending down, she planted a kiss on Rumble's forehead. Good luck. With a nod, Rumble departed and Cadence watched him go down the hall, smiling fondly. Be safe, all of you, she whispered under her breath. Scootaloo stared at the bowl in front of her. It was filled with oatmeal that smelled of cinnamon and maple. Off to one side rested a spinach and asparagus omelet, already decorated with ketchup in a criss-crossing pattern. There was no question that breakfast looked appetizing. However, at the same time, Scootaloo's stomach was churning so badly that she wasn't sure she could keep anything down. Across the table from her, Rumble was in similar straits. You both need to eat, said Arkenstone. It's important to keep up your strength. Practicing what he preached, he was already digging into his own breakfast with a gusto. I'm not sure I can, said Scootaloo, her voice quivering with nerves. If you can't eat, then you won't be of any help to me once the fighting starts, said Arkenstone sternly, then you're probably better off here. Whipping her head around, Scootaloo glared at him. Arkenstone shrugged indifferently. There is no shame in admitting that you aren't ready to fight. I would much rather you did that than have you accompany me and get yourself hurt or killed. Harsh as always, said Shining as he and Cadence trotted into the dining room. Passing by Scootaloo, Shining leaned over and whispered into her ear. Try the tea, it should help. Scootaloo nodded and reached for the cup of tea by her plate. Using her feathers, she lifted it to her lips and took a tentative sip. To her surprise, the flavor of the tea was complemented by the sharp bite of ginger. As she swallowed down the mouthful, Scootaloo was surprised to find that her stomach was beginning to settle. Feeling a bit better, Scootaloo began to eat her own breakfast. Across from her, Rumble watched what she did before mimicking her actions and finally managing to eat his own breakfast. They ate in silence. As the time for their departure drew nearer, Scootaloo felt her nerves drawing tighter. She felt as though she might jump at the slightest provocation. Rumble looked a bit calmer, but the tremors running up and down his legs betrayed his own nerves. Without a word, Arkenstone once again led them through the palace, this time taking them out through a servants' entrance where the accumulated garbage of the ponies who lived and worked there was taken out. Both Scootaloo and Rumble wrinkled their noses as the stench hit them. Even the fact that it was technically royal garbage didn't seem to change the fact that garbage stank, no matter where it came from. Despite the fact that his acute sense of smell probably made the scent of garbage all the worse to him, Arkenstone didn't so much as twitch as the three of them carefully sidestepped mounds of trash bags and other receptacles to make their way to the streets of Canterlot. Their path took them down alleyways and past old storefronts. Then they entered into a section of Canterlot that seemed quite different. Imposing walls lined the streets. Behind the walls or through the wrought iron gates they occasionally passed, Scootaloo and Rumble could see the visages of elaborate mansions, bright green lawns, and vibrantly colored gardens. The mansions seemed to be living beings in their own right, each one looking as though it was consciously striving to outdo its neighbor in the grandiosity of its decoration. Through one gate they could see hedges trimmed into the shapes of ponies and other creatures in remarkably lifelike poses. The yard next door was decorated with statues of white marble with ivy artistically climbing and wrapping around them. The streets themselves were relatively empty. Unlike those in the more public sections of Canterlot, which were often full of all manner of ponies going about their business, hardly any pony seemed to use these streets. Scootaloo supposed that the richest and most distinguished nobles probably wanted to keep their streets free and clear of commoners, which left her a bit surprised that no pony had bothered them yet. Finally, they stopped at a particular gate which offered them a view of yet another manor and its ostentatious yard. Scootaloo blinked as she looked in, noticing that the decorations were more subdued in this particular yard. Instead of statues or pony shrubs, it sported low flower beds. Looking around, she noticed none of the guards that, according to Shade Steele's report, had been roaming about through the night. Where are all the guards? Asked Rumble, giving voice to the same question Scootaloo had in her head. During the night they need to be very thorough, said Arkenstone, but during the day, it would be suspicious to have so many ponies patrolling the grounds. It would be much too obvious to observers that Elderflower has something he doesn't want other ponies seeing. No doubt the area is still being watched, but the guards will be able to see things from the windows much more easily during the day. Oh, said Scootaloo, okay, how are we doing this then? How are we getting in there? A dangerous-looking smile spread across Arkenstone's face. Through the front door. His tail lashed through the air. Both Scootaloo and Rumble caught glimpses of tiny objects scattering around before they vanished from sight. Then, with a faint whistling noise, lines seemed to magically appear on the gate in front of them. With a clank, those lines became points of separation and the gates quickly fell to pieces with the clanging of iron against the marble driveway that led up to the front of the manor. Arkenstone strode through the entrance as naturally as though he belonged there, his first step slamming down with enough force to crack the stone beneath it and sending a rumbling tremor surging through the ground that made the manor's windows rattle audibly, even from this distance. Scootaloo and Rumble followed behind, casting their eyes about nervously, looking for the first signs of trouble. Come, said Arkenstone, it's time for us to enjoy the Baron's hospitality. Author's notes. 1. Ravens optional. 2. The time, not the pony. In the immortal words of the gamers, and now for the killing, followed by light salad. Next chapter, Elderflower experiences a minor setback. Stepping up and stepping forward. Chapter 12, Stepping Up and Stepping Forward. Twilight Sparkle could scarcely believe her ears as Coco relayed her story, the two of them once again conversing quietly behind Twilight's privacy spell in the bathroom while the listening spells were artfully drowned out by the sound of running bathwater. Coco had come bursting in first thing in the morning, clearly badly worried about something. Perlin really did that? She asked dubiously. Coco nodded. At least, that's what he said he did. He led that mare away and came back a little bit later. Frowning, Twilight stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, pondering what Coco had told her. Part of her was silently elated, though a bit annoyed. She'd been hoping and planning to take care of things herself, though now it seemed that her brother might handle things before it got to that point. She'd been amazed to hear that Shade Steele of all ponies had come at the behest of Shining Armor. As far as she knew, Shade's sentence wasn't up, but it did make sense. With the Royal Guard, including the SES, out dealing with the Cult Solar, Shade would probably be the only pony with the requisite skills for that kind of mission in Canterlot. She could only hope that Shade hadn't been lying about working for Shining Armor. Though, it might have been a moot point anyway. Perlin had said that he would help Shade escape, but then he'd led the mare away from Coco and taken her off someplace and come back alone. While that could have meant he'd stayed true to his word, it was just as possible that he'd lured Shade someplace where he could dispose of her quietly. It would probably be a simple task for a pony with Perlin's level of skill. However, the question of whether or not Shade had actually been allowed to escape did not seem to be what was bothering Coco. She was more worried by Perlin's strange behavior when he talked with her after that. Twilight wished there was something she could say, but she knew too little about what was happening and didn't really have the time to articulate her feelings about it. Once the tub had filled up again, Twilight was forced to call an end to their conversation, once again cursing the fact she hadn't studied illusion magic more thoroughly. Once again, they were forced to imitate a relatively normal conversation for the benefit of the listening spells dotting the bathroom. However, Twilight still did her best to soothe Coco's worries as the younger mare ran a brush through her mane. Are you meeting the Baron for breakfast? Asked Coco nervously as she set aside the brush. To her surprise, Twilight ushered Coco into a sitting position in front of the mirror and took up the brush in her own hooves. Twilight's movements were slightly shakier and more uncertain, thanks to a lack of practice at using her hooves rather than her horn for basic grooming. However, Coco's much shorter mane made for easier work. He hasn't issued an invitation yet, said Twilight, but I wouldn't be surprised if he asked me to brunch, seeing as you were locked out of the kitchen this morning. Coco nodded. She'd brought Twilight her breakfast the previous day, after requesting a meal from the kitchens. However, this morning, Coco found that she was being barred from the kitchen and her requests for something for Twilight to eat were being refused on the basis that it was being seen to. What will you do? Asked Coco. I'll accept, of course, said Twilight, her mouth drawn in a tight line as she met the gaze of Coco's reflection in the mirror. She would need to speak with Baron Elderflower more, however unpleasant the experience might be, if she was to find out the particulars of his plan and put a stop to it before more ponies got hurt. Of course, if the Royal Guard or Arkenstone came storming in sooner than that, it would be a pointless effort. But Twilight couldn't afford to simply rely on them. They exited the bathroom, Coco seeming much more calm after being on the receiving end of a good, or at least semi-good but well-meaning grooming. Do you want to wait with me for a bit? Asked Twilight. I'm sure no pony will mind. If you're sure, said Coco, her eyes darting in an uneasy glance towards the bedroom mirror. To her credit, the motion was so subtle that even Twilight, who'd been looking Coco right in the face, barely noticed it, so there was practically no way that whatever hidden observers were on the other side of the mirror had actually seen the gesture. They had just settled down at the table by the window when there was a crash and clang of metal, followed by a shuddering tremor that made everything in the room jump nearly an inch off the floor. Wow, what was that? Gasped Coco, glancing around frantically. Twilight sighed and suppressed the urge to groan. That was probably Arkenstone, she said. I figured he'd find us sooner or later. Darn, and I was really hoping to take care of things myself. Well, there was no use in crying over an upset trough now. She would just have to make the best of the situation. Arkenstone had probably come to rescue her. Twilight felt obligated to make sure that the Baron was taken down first. It's time for us to go, she said, giving Coco an encouraging smile. Are you ready? And not really, stammered Coco, beginning to shake in place. She knew that Twilight had some sort of plan, but hadn't expected to have to go through with it so soon. Well, I didn't really have everything planned out yet, but we'll play it by ear, said Twilight with a giggle, gently brushing a hoof against Coco's face. Just stay with me and we'll get through everything just fine. If you're sure, said Coco, her eyes darting from side to side. Twilight nodded and stepped around the bed so that she was standing right in front of the dresser and the mirror hanging above it. She smiled brightly at the mirror, probably confusing the hay out of whoever was behind it. With a flash, a band of dark gold with silvery inlays appeared beneath the black of the inhibitor ring around her horn. Silvery fire steamed out of the arcanastile ring and coalesced into an orb the size of a large apple, suspended in the air just above her horn. A second later, Twilight ducked her head to level her horn at the dresser and launched the sphere of eldritch power straight into the piece of furniture. The telekinetic bolt transformed the dresser into a battering ram, smashing it through the wall and shattering the mirror in the process. Over the sounds of crumbling wood and breaking glass, Twilight heard a pair of pained gasps as the dresser and the remains of the wall it pushed ahead of it slammed into the pair of ponies who had been watching the room from the other side of the one-way mirror. The dresser's momentum carried it and the ponies caught behind it all the way to the other side of the hidden room and slammed them hard against the back wall. Looking through the hole in the wall, Twilight could see the details of the room on the other side. It was mostly unfurnished, bare walls and an uncarpeted floor. One either side of the hole she'd just opened, Twilight could see the remains of a wall-mounted desk that ran the length of the wall, probably just underneath the disguised window into her room. The dresser, the remains of the wall and the mirror, and the ponies behind it had been shoved into a pile of debris on the opposite side of the room. Neither of the ponies pinned behind the desk were moving. Twilight had a brief flash of nerves. Had she killed them? However, she quickly forced those worries back down. One way or another, getting Coco out of the mansion and then thwarting Elderflower's plans came first. First things first, now that pretend time was over, it was now time to get rid of that annoying inhibitor. Using the power stored in the arcanastile band, Twilight forged her magic into a thin blade, which she then used to begin splitting the inhibitor ring from the outside. She had to be careful with how she managed the spell. Power was absorbed through the inhibitor ring's interior surface. However, as her spell cut through the ring's outer layers, it would begin to lose power as that power was absorbed by the ring itself. The only way to effectively cut through the ring with magic would be to focus as much power into as narrow a line as possible to exceed the material's capacity along that thin line before it could be dispersed through the rest of the ring. It took incredible precision and focus, which only got harder as the ring's material still continued to absorb her magic, even as the material itself quickly melted away, and the ring gradually grew heavier and heavier. Finally, with a loud crack, the ring split, loosening its hold on her horn. Twilight dipped her head and allowed it to slide of the end and fall to the floor. It hit just as the door to her room slammed open and a pair of Elderflower's guards came barreling into the room. One of them opened his mouth, clearly about to begin barking orders at her and Coco. However, he froze and stared in shock when he saw that Twilight was no longer wearing the inhibitor ring. Favoring the unfortunate stallion with a taunting smile, Twilight blasted him with a crackling burst of power that exploded in a flurry of arcs across his body. The stallion barely managed to let out a strangled scream before the stunning spell brought him down, leaving him twitching spasmodically on the floor. His companion, a Pegasus mare, whirled to face Twilight, her eyes flicking back and forth between Twilight and Coco as she apparently tried to figure out what to do. How? She gasped. Elderflower isn't nearly as smart as he thinks he is, said Twilight simply. I'd suggest surrendering, before I have to hurt you. As she spoke, Twilight's ring lit up, sending waves of white fire washing over her body. When the flames dissipated, Twilight now stood clad in silvery barding, plates of armor polished to a mirror-like shine with amethyst-colored decoration at the edges. Both Twilight's Champron and Petrel sported a magenta gem in the shape of the six-pointed star at the center of her cutie mark. The segmented plates of the crinier ran down the length of her neck, parting along the center to allow her mane to stream out. Both the flanchard and the croupier were relatively plain and unadorned by comparison, but practically shined beneath the room's lights. Everything was smooth and rounded, looking practically artistic in its design. In fact, Twilight imagined that if Rarity were ever to design a suit of armor for her, it would look something like this. She certainly hoped her imagination was doing her friend justice. Twilight's ears picked out the faint sound of Coco's gasp. Glancing over at Coco, Twilight could see that she was staring at Twilight in wide-eyed awe, clearly having no idea that Twilight was capable of something like this. Twilight kept her glance fleeting, wanting to keep her eye on the guard just in case she tried something. "Wah, what is this?" demanded the Pegasus mare, backing her rump into the open door, bumping it against the wall with enough force that it rebounded and smacked her back in the rear, making her jump with a yelp. "This is me and Coco getting out of here," said Twilight coldly, glaring at the guard, practically daring her to try something. "If you have any sense, you'll let us and turn yourself in." The mare swallowed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Twilight could understand, the Pegasus mare and her companion had clearly thought they were guarding a pair of helpless prisoners. Elderflower had Twilight restrained and monitored, while Coco was far too timid and helpless to be a threat. If there was going to be any trouble, it would come from the outside, not from the very ponies they were monitoring. For a moment, it looked as though the guard was going to heed Twilight's words. Her eyes darted back and forth between Twilight and Coco. Twilight made a mental note to be on guard, in case this Pegasus tried to do something to Coco. However, the nervousness in the mare's eyes betrayed her lack of confidence in her ability to deal with the situation. She hesitated before focusing all of her attention on Twilight. I have to. Her limbs began to shiver and Twilight felt a pang of sympathy for the mare. She was clearly badly worried about the consequences for failing Baron Elderflower. "Please, let us pass," pleaded Twilight. "I can't do that," said the mare, her gaze hardening. She reached around to one side of her flank and pulled out a broad-bladed knife. Lunging forward, she thrust the knife, its tip trying to locate a gap in Twilight's armor. Twilight let her. One of the benefits of having armor composed of actualized magic was that it wasn't constrained by its appearance. Just because two plates did not join seamlessly didn't mean they were an opening, unlike how things worked for mundane armor. The mare's thrust looked like it was heading straight for the center of Twilight's petrel, when it instead changed direction and darted towards the joint between two plates of her crinier. The instant the knife reached its target, a jolting bolt of violet lightning crackled from the point of contact, running back down the blade of the knife and up into the wielder's fetlock. The guard let out a cry of surprised pain, trying to pull back or let go of her knife, maybe both. However, she was unable to get away as the lightning crawled up her leg and into the rest of her body. A second later, she no longer needed to pull away as she was physically launched back with enough force to break through the door before crashing into the wall behind it. Twilight sighed. You should have let us go. Turning to look at Coco, Twilight gave her a smile. All right, let's get out of here. Swallowing hard, Coco nodded hesitantly and fell in behind Twilight as they headed out the door. As they went through the door, Twilight looked to one side, seeing what she had noted before when she'd left the room to join Elderflower for dinner. Her room was situated at the end of the hallway. A few feet beyond the door, the hallway terminated in what looked like an ordinary wall, leaving just enough room for a pony to stand next to her door on that side so that the guards could have the portal flanked from both sides. However, Twilight was willing to bet that the end of the hallway was actually a concealed door that led to the room behind her mirror. Where are we going? Asked Coco as she cringed behind Twilight, looking down the hall for any signs that the guards or Elderflower's hired mercenaries might be coming. First we're getting you out of here, said Twilight sternly. I'm guessing that tremor was Arkenstone. If we meet up, I can have you stay with him while he gets you to safety. But I need to go after the elements and get them back. Okay, said Coco. The two of them set off as another set of tremors, accompanied by loud crashes, rocked the estate. Some pony tell me what that was, yelled Elderflower as he emerged into the main entryway, looking down towards the doors. On either side of him, stairs ran down along the walls, flanking the doors that led to his manners ballroom. He'd addressed guests and assemblies of his servants on many occasions from this perch, looking down upon them with quiet confidence. None of that confidence was to be found now. There's an intruder, my lord, yelled a guard, who'd taken a moment to actually look out the front door before reporting. Is it the royal guard? Demanded Elderflower, glaring down at the unfortunate pony. The guard shook his head. The pony isn't wearing any uniform. I think it's some earth pony. Some earth pony. Elderflower had to let that sink in. Suddenly he remembered. Twilight's cold friend, the same stallion who had dispatched Earl Steel Flint, was an earth pony. Could that stallion, that Arkenstone, have somehow learned where Twilight was being kept and come for her? It seemed impossible, but Elderflower wouldn't have been surprised if that was the case. Luckily, I have the Banehammers. Earl Flint might have been a fairly formidable battle mage in one-on-one duels, but he had no experience with real combat. The Banehammers are much more dangerous. Even if this stallion managed to best Flint, there's no way he'd be able to handle so many hardened warriors. Get Greenblight and his ponies here immediately, said Elderflower. That won't be necessary, said Greenblight, actually emerging behind Elderflower to stand at the top of the stairs. Down below, Inkwell emerged from the doors to the ballroom. Behind her, Elderflower could hear the clicking of numerous hooves against the ballroom's polished floors. The Banehammers hadn't wasted time waiting for orders and had already assembled to greet the threat. You'd best leave things to us, my lord, said Greenblight, watching the front doors with a savage grin. We'll make short work of this fool. Do not underestimate him, said Elderflower. He's probably much more dangerous than he first seems. Before Greenblight could say anything in response to that, there was a whistling noise coming from the door. A beat later, the sturdy wooden constructs fell to pieces, having been sliced cleanly by some sort of set of invisible blades. They tumbled to the floor with a clatter, revealing a beige stallion, who strode through as though the house belonged to him. Stepping into the entryway, Arkenstone sniffed the air for a few seconds before his muzzle pointed in Elderflower's direction. Am I correct in assuming that you are the lord of the house? Asked Arkenstone calmly. You are, said Elderflower, trying to keep a tremor of fear from his voice. Arkenstone seemed like an ordinary earth pony, albeit a blind one. However, for a pony who had strode into the center of enemy territory, he was remarkably calm and composed, the tone of his voice betraying no sign of fear or excitement. I see, in a manner of speaking, said Arkenstone, then this is quite fortunate, seeing as it will save us both time and unnecessary bloodshed. You will release Twilight Sparkle, surrender the elements of harmony, and submit yourself to the custody of the guard to be tried for the crimes of fullnapping, unlawful imprisonment, theft, murder by proxy, high treason, and any other crimes that the princesses can think to accuse you of. If you do that, then I will not be obligated to chop you into tiny pieces, just like that door I just walked through. Elderflower's lips curled back, baring his teeth as he glared down at the earth pony below him. Filthy scum, you dare to force yourself onto my property and address me in such a manner. How dare you level such foolish accusations without one whit of proof? Perhaps I haven't made your situation clear, said Arkenstone. The fact that I am here is proof enough. I am also very interested in that stallion standing beside you, along with the mare down here. They certainly match the description of the ringleaders of that bunch of mercenaries who raided the royal palace. Are you seriously trying to pretend that you aren't responsible at this juncture? From beside him, Elderflower could hear a sharp intake of breath. He heard Greenblight beginning to breathe faster and faster, almost sounding as though he were hyperventilating. Elderflower was not unfamiliar with Greenblight's trick. He decided to stall to give the scarred stallion time. Fine, said Elderflower, returning his attention to Arkenstone. You are correct. I am indeed responsible for the attack on the palace. I have indeed taken the elements of harmony, as Princess Celestia has simply proven that she can no longer be trusted with their stewardship. I cannot, in good conscience, return them to her and allow them to be misused again. Misused? Arkenstone raised an eyebrow. Saving Equestria twice over is misusing them. She placed the fate of the nation, no, the world, in the hooves of commoners, earth ponies and Pegasi. Yelled Elderflower, his blood rising at the amused tone in Arkenstone's voice. The elements of harmony are the most powerful magical devices ever conceived, and she would dare to allow those whose trade is not magic itself to wield them. It was only blind luck that they've worked thus far. I shall not allow the elements to be sullied any further. I shall place them in the hooves of ponies who truly deserve to bear them. I will bring true order and true harmony to Equestria. I shall end our long slide into anarchy and restore things to the way they were meant to be. Elderflower was panting after his tirade. He no longer cared about buying time, unable to stand the disrespect this common earth pony was showing him. Twilight Sparkle is mine as well. Her power shall become the foundation of a new Equestria. If you have any true respect for her and her station, you will turn back and not interfere any longer. I shall not, nor do I need to, replied Arkenstone. Your ignorance is truly mind-boggling in that you fail so utterly to understand what the elements truly are. We know all about your plans for them. I must admit, we were sorely tempted to let you try to carry those plans out so that you could find out for yourself just how addle-brained your little schemes are. However, good ponies have died as a result of your actions and your decisions. It is because of them and Twilight that we are here now. Arkenstone's eyes opened, revealing orbs of featureless white that glared upwards at Elderflower. I give you one last warning. Surrender or I will kill you. Elderflower suddenly felt as though a weight of several tons had dropped down on his back. His legs quivered in fear and, despite his best efforts, he let out a strangled whimper at the intensity of the killing intent being directed at him. He now understood all too well just how Steel Flint had died at the hooves of this stallion. He could feel that intent to kill honed into the finest of blades now being leveled at him. This was a pony who truly knew how to kill other ponies. A low snarl off to Elderflower's side reminded him that he had ponies who knew how to kill too. Regardless of how competent this Arkenstone might be, in the end, Elderflower had the advantage of numbers. Besides, the Banehammers were mercenaries experienced in the ways of real war. That was exactly why Whiteshade had recommended them to him in the first place. Kill him, snapped Elderflower, turning about and striding toward the upper doors, resisting the urge to break into a gallop the moment his back was turned. Down below, Inkwell's eyes narrowed and her horn flared with ebony power. Wisps of smoke curled upwards from the cracks that ran along the length as several small spheres of energy formed in the air around her. Arkenstone's eyes closed again and he turned his muzzle towards her. He took a step forward. That was all the provocation Inkwell needed. At her will, the little black spheres darted out at Arkenstone, swarming through the air around him like bees to come from all directions. Arkenstone hid a grimace and whipped his blades into action. Had he been at his best, he would have easily been able to cut them all down with his swords. However, his reflexes were dulled and his senses still slightly muddled as a consequence of his convalescence. To complicate matters, he'd never found himself regretting walking into a place with such a dedicated cleaning staff as much as he did today. The maids had clearly been busy, as not a speck of dust lingered on any surface that he could use to build his armor. Fortunately, even homes with the most devoted of caretakers had places that no maid could hope to clean. The gaps between walls where pipes and wiring ran were spaces that no pony would ever really think to clean on a regular basis. Instead of trying to intercept Shade's incoming bolts, Arkenstone slashed at the walls to either side of him, cutting them open and releasing billowing clouds of dust, the accumulation of years, into the air around him. His power joined those tiny particles together into black, scale-like pieces that quickly merged together to form larger, smoother pieces, forming plates of armor that built themselves around his body. In a matter of a few seconds, he would be completely enclosed and protected. Sadly, Inkwell had no intention of giving him those few seconds. Her bolts surged at him in a constant barrage, pounding at him like a deluge of hailstones from nearly every conceivable angle. His armor, not fully manifested, broke apart under the onslaught, barely blocking the blasts. Arkenstone desperately tried to rebuild his armor, but Shade's bolts shattered the pieces he assembled as fast as he could replace them. In his current state, Arkenstone was forced to abandon any thought of offense in order to maintain his defense and keep rebuilding his armor quickly enough to keep Inkwell's bolts from reaching his vulnerable flesh. Though Arkenstone had a certain amount of skill at hardening his body, it was far below the level of a true practitioner of the mountain route. Inkwell's magical bolts were far too fierce in their intensity to be held back by the limited reinforcement Arkenstone could achieve. Right now, they stood at a total stalemate. A loud, bellowing roar from above signaled that the stalemate was at an end. From the balcony above, Greenblight hurtled himself into the air so that he dropped towards Arkenstone like a plummeting stone, already swinging his massive scythe about wildly. Arkenstone could sense his approach easily, but was unable to take any action, as Inkwell's barrage had him fixed solely on the defensive. From the ballroom doors behind Inkwell, Arkenstone could hear the rumbling sound of numerous hooves as the rest of the Banehammers charged forward to follow Greenblight's lead. I certainly can't fault their experience, thought Arkenstone wryly, seeing as they don't seem to have any issues with using all of their strength against me despite their numerical advantage. However, Arkenstone found himself supremely grateful that he hadn't come alone. From behind him, emerging from either side of the wall where the front doors had once stood, a pair of blurs, one orange and one gray, shot into the air. The gray blur angled up over Arkenstone's head, rushing right in front of Greenblight's face, only narrowly missing a strike from that deadly-looking scythe. Greenblight barely even noticed, his single functioning eye not even tracking the blur, instead remaining fixed on the target of his berserk ire as he continued to dive at Arkenstone, foam trailing from his mouth. However, Greenblight definitely took notice when something, a cord of some sort, wrapped around his neck. With a mighty yank, the burly, scarred Pegasus suddenly felt himself being pulled to one side. In his current state, he hadn't given a single thought to maintaining his balance, so he was taken completely off guard as the cord whipped his body around just in time for a Greenblight's own wings to launch him in the direction he was being pulled. As a consequence, Greenblight went sailing over the heads of his underlings and went flying to the ballroom that they had previously assembled in. Another yank on the cord changed the path of his flight yet again, and Greenblight slammed down into the polished stone tiles that made up the ballroom floor. Luckily, his own lack of balance saved him and he hit shoulder first instead of head first. Even as he hit the floor, Greenblight was already scrambling to get upright, not even seeming to notice the pain of his impact as he snarled savagely at his antagonist. The cord around his neck went slack and then withdrew completely as Greenblight faced the gray Pegasus colt in front of him. Rumble swallowed nervously as he faced the side-wielding Pegasus in front of him, who growled and snarled in a manner more akin to a wild animal than a trained fighter, his single eye rolling wildly as more foam began to gather at his lips. "I'm your opponent," said Rumble, hoping that his first real fight wasn't about to be his last. At the same time Rumble had managed to redirect Greenblight's dive, Scootaloo charged straight in at Inkwell, zipping just above the heads of the armored ponies surging out from behind her. Inkwell's eyes zeroed in on her immediately, and the shooter marble-sized bolts she'd been bombarding Arkenstone with all immediately changed course to converge on Scootaloo instead. Scootaloo ignored them, instead focusing all her strength and speed on her forward charge. Inkwell's reflexes and responses were quick, but she was still a bit too slow to catch up with the charging filly. As Scootaloo closed in on Inkwell, she could see the mare charging another attack spell just above her horn. Scootaloo kicked out with her hind legs. At the same moment, she executed a lunging motion and swept both of her wings forward so that the outermost primaries extended past her head. A concentrated blast of air roared out at Inkwell, whose eyes widened. She immediately changed strategies, abandoning the attack spell she'd been building in favor of spreading a shield of telekinetic energy and a curving wall between her and Scootaloo. It barely slowed down the barreling cannon blast of air resulting from the forward wing strike, as the impact smashed through Inkwell's shield and pounded into the mare, knocking her completely off her hooves and sending her flying back through the doors, across the ballroom and crashing out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows on the opposite side. Inkwell was barely able to raise another shield as she slammed into the ground outside, plowing a furrow through one of Elderflower's flower beds and scattering countless red and yellow petals into the air. As she followed her opponent out through the window, Scootaloo was struck by the notion that the scene would have looked somewhat beautiful, if a little like one of Pinkie Pie's parties, if it weren't for the blotchy-coated mare getting to her hooves in the center of it all. Inkwell's eyes narrowed dangerously as she glared at Scootaloo, who shivered as though soulless black orbs raked over her body. Inkwell's horn once again began to shimmer with ebony power, more smoke climbing out from the cracks. 4 black orbs the size of grapefruit scattered out from the tip of Inkwell's horn, each one picking its own path to come at Scootaloo from a different direction. Realizing that her first true battle had really begun, Scootaloo narrowed her eyes and set herself. This is it. As Scootaloo and Rumble managed to seize and deflect the ringleaders of the Banehammers away from Arkenstone, the blind stallion was still left with a few dozen rank-and-file members of the mercenary company. The moment Greenblight and Inkwell had been knocked back through the ballroom doors, the group's charge had ground to a halt, the armored ponies milling uncertainly in the absence of their leaders. At the rear of their formation, a group of them stepped back and turned around, prepared to follow Greenblight and Inkwell into battle against the foals that had knocked them away from Arkenstone. However, before they could take so much as a single step in the direction of the ballroom, a pair of black swords crossed through the air in front of them, moving so quickly that they were nearly invisible. The whirling blades carved a line in the floor between them and the ballroom doors, bringing the armored ponies to an abrupt halt. I won't be allowing any of you to leave, said Arkenstone coolly, having not moved an inch from where he had been standing when the battle had started. We will finish this here, one way or another. If any of you have even a fleeting attachment to your lives, you will set down your weapons now and surrender. If you do not, then you shall receive no quarter. Arkenstone's eyes opened once again, the sight of the menacing white orb sending chills down the spines of the ponies now facing him. However, none of them dropped their weapons. The Pegasi spread to the air above, flying as high as the chandeliers and the arched roof of the entryway. Down below, earth ponies moved to spread out and encircle Arkenstone. Unicorns lit their horns, ready to let fly with bolts of eldritch power at a moment's notice. The Banehammers were no mere collection of thugs. They had charged griffin armies, faced down minotaur warbands, outmaneuvered famously nimble saddle Arabian bandit clans, and even earned the respect of the most terrifying and bloodthirsty zebra tribes. They'd fought and subdued monsters and had been called monsters by their foes. These were ponies who had faced true war and conflict, something that even the Royal Guard almost never had to deal with. They were hardened and experienced fighters, each and every one of them. That collective experience warned them now that this particular stallion was even more dangerous than an entire army. They realized that, even though he was a single adversary, they could not afford to take him lightly. Arkenstone braced himself as the Banehammers came storming in. Elderflower immediately turned down the hall as he left the entryway, looking to take the nearest set of stairs up to the 3rd floor. He would need to retrieve Twilight Sparkle and take her with him. No doubt she would be resistant to the idea, particularly if she learned that her cold friend was leading the charge to get her back. However, so long as the inhibitor ring was in place, there was nothing Twilight could do to keep him from doing what was necessary. It's unfortunate to have to abandon my home like this, thought Elderflower, but it isn't the end of the world. As long as I have the support of my compatriots, we can continue the plan. He'd just reached the stairs when he nearly smacked his head against that of one of his own guards descending down from above. The guard's eyes, already looking quite panicked, went wide when he realized that he'd nearly bowled his employer over. My lord. What is going on? Snapped Elderflower, in no mood for dealing with panicking guards. Twilight Sparkle has escaped, he said. She's advancing across the 3rd floor now. We've been trying to stop her, but nobody's been able to do anything. How? Demanded Elderflower. The inhibitor ring prohibits any form of magic. Don't tell me she spontaneously became another kind of pony. I don't know how, my lord, but she managed to remove the inhibitor ring. She's wearing some sort of armor now. None of our spells or weapons can break through it. Armor. Elderflower blinked at that, trying to figure out just what was going on. This is ridiculous. Get out of my way. My lord, it isn't safe. The guard tried futilely to dissuade Elderflower, but the Baron pressed on, ignoring his guard's complaints. Twilight Sparkle escaping confinement, ludicrous. I already have enough on my plate right now. I can't afford to have my own servants losing their heads over something so obviously impossible. Elderflower continued to mutter and grumble as he climbed the stairs, emerging onto the 3rd floor just in time to see the body of one of his guards go sailing right past his face, the unfortunate Pegasus letting out a terrified scream as he smashed into another guard further down the hallway. Eyes wide with shock, Elderflower looked down the hall in the direction the poor guard had come from. Still a fair distance down was a cluster of several of his mares-at-arms, their armored forms arranged to block the hallway as best as they possibly could. With the low ceiling, the Pegasi couldn't hope to take to the air, so the earth ponies had moved to the fore, using their own bodies to barricade the hallway while, behind them, unicorns primed their horns to fire spells at the pony heading towards them. It can't be, thought Elderflower incredulously, feeling as though he were moving in slow motion coming up the stairs. The complete absurdity of the situation lent everything a strange, dreamlike quality that made Elderflower wonder if this was a passing nightmare, that he would wake up to find that everything was as it should be. Coming up behind his guards, Elderflower looked past their heads to get a look at who was coming towards them. Twilight Sparkle made her way down the hallway, her horn glowing as she unleashed a lance-blazing violet energy that crashed into the earth ponies in the front ranks. The beam exploded in a burst of concussive force that scattered the front line and the ponies behind them like tenpins. Walls crumbled as ponies went crashing through them. A Pegasus was bounced up by the force of the attack to slam into the ceiling before falling senseless to the floor. 2 of the unicorns went flying past Elderflower on either side. One of them passed close enough that her armor actually scraped against Elderflower's cheek, drawing a small amount of blood. The sensation of pain and the jolting shock as everything seemed to speed up to normal again to his eyes cemented it for Elderflower that he most certainly wasn't dreaming. Now that the view was no longer obstructed by his guards, Elderflower had a clear view of Twilight. His eyes took in the gleaming silver of her armor, as well as the glimmering band around her horn, just below where the inhibitor ring she was supposed to have been shackled with had previously rested. Following behind her was a nervous, cringing Coco Pommel, who shrank back with a terrified squeak as the younger mare's eyes met Elderflower's. Behind the two mares was a shimmering wall of violet energy, completely barricading the hallway behind them. Behind that wall, Elderflower could see more of his guards milling about as they fought to break or circumvent the barrier to get at Twilight from the rear. Twilight came to a stop when she saw Elderflower standing there, taking great satisfaction in the flabbergasted expression on his face. Lord Baron, she said cheerily, I would like to thank you for your hospitality. But I'm afraid that I have to inform you that I've decided to refuse your generous offer. So Coco and I shall be going now. Oh, and I'll be taking the elements with me as well. Elderflower's mouth opened, closed, then opened again as he fought to find the words to express himself. Rage, fear, and confusion rushed through him in equal measure, throwing his thoughts into total chaos as he tried to make sense of what was going on. Months of preparation, years of planning and scheming, all of it was coming undone right before his eyes. Twilight Sparkle had been helpless, imprisoned, and restrained. The royal guard, much less Twilight's cold friend, should have had no idea he was involved in her full-napping or the theft of the elements. Everything had been coming together perfectly. Twilight's smile was cheerful, almost giddy, but that only served to make it all the more menacing as she continued to advance sedately down the corridor. In spite of himself, Elderflower found himself taking nervous, halting steps back as he tried to keep the armored mare in front of him from closing the distance. You can't, you couldn't, your magic, it was. You really thought you had me helpless, said Twilight, raising an eyebrow, her smile fading as she continued to move forward. I admit, you did catch me off guard by using Coco to knock me out before kidnapping me. That's probably one of the cleverest tricks I've seen one of your ilk pull. Sorry to break it to you, but I could have broken out at any time. You don't know nearly enough about what I'm capable of to keep me here. You fool, snapped Elderflower, I thought you understood what Equestria needs. I do, Twilight replied, I know better than you do what Equestria needs. More importantly, I know exactly what it doesn't need, a batch of petty tyrants in positions of power to affect the lives of ponies everywhere simply because you have the blind luck to be born into the right family. I also know that the last place that the elements of harmony need to be is in the hooves of you or the ponies you've chosen. So you would have the elements be trifled with by ponies who have no business meddling in the affairs of magic, snapped Elderflower, there's no way Pegasi or Earth ponies could understand their power. That's where you're wrong, said Twilight, and I know because I'm one of the ponies who wielded the elements. All those things Princess Celestia has said over and over again, all those things you dismissed as platitudes. They're all true. I know that because I've felt the element's power. I know that what's needed isn't mastery of spellcraft or arcane power. It's something much deeper, something you dismiss and scorn because you think it's beneath your position. She smiled grimly, but the truth is those sentiments you look down on are a lot more powerful than you are. Enough, yelled Elderflower. Behind him, he could hear the pounding of hooves as more of his guards came galloping down the hallway. I thought that you could be made to see reason, Dame Sparkle. Clearly, I was wrong. Turning around, he strode back towards his guards as they came. Bring her down, he told them, alive, if you can. If you can't then, he shrugged indifferently. What about the other one? Asked the mare in the lead. Elderflower glanced over his shoulder at Coco, who was still cowering behind Twilight. Kill her. With that, he set off as the guards charged past him. As soon as he was clear of them, Elderflower broke into a gallop, heading for the stairs once again. Retrieving Twilight Sparkle was out of the question now. The only things he had left with which to salvage his plans were the elements. I'll get them out through the caverns. If I can get them to the meeting area, the remainder of our forces will be able to take care of the rest. I will save this nation if I have to burn this city to the ground. He failed to notice the tiny spark that leapt off the tip of Twilight's horn and struck his rump right at the base of his tail as he retreated. Twilight watched the Baron's departure, a warm feeling of satisfaction welling her stomach even as she turned her attention back to the guards filing into line in the Baron's wake. Author's notes. Now the fun really begins. Part of what I was looking forward to in this arc was that it gave me a chance to have some pony other than Dawn shine. Scootaloo gets a chance to show her mettle as an up-and-coming martial artist and Rumble gets his chance to, well, rumble. Next chapter, the battle rages. Dancing with the Wind. Chapter 13, Dancing with the Wind. Greenblight threw back his head and howled, reminding Rumble of the wolf pony from that movie Thunderlane had taken him to see once. Rumble had gotten nightmares from that one. However, this was no nightmare, nor was it a pony on a screen. Greenblight was very real, very dangerous, and that scythe he was swinging around was very big and looked very sharp. To the average pony, the attack would have looked shockingly fast, especially for a pony of Greenblight's bulk. However, Rumble's vision and reflexes had been honed by years of racing his brother through Whitetail Woods, slaloming between trees at breakneck speeds, picking out narrow gaps and watching for the markers that signaled turns. Compared to that, Greenblight's attack seemed rather lazy. Rumble ducked under the swing, the blade passing harmlessly above his rump, whilst he narrowly avoided being brained by the weapon's shaft. His vision was filled by a green chest covered with scars as Rumble realized that, even if Greenblight didn't hit him with the scythe, the stallion was still more than capable of simply running him over. With a yelp of surprise, Rumble threw himself to the side, barely missing being trampled by the raging stallion. Greenblight was already pivoting on the spot, spinning around and swinging the scythe in a wide arc. The blade missed Rumble completely. But, once again, the colt was forced to evade the weapon's shaft. As he jumped above the strike, Rumble took to the air, trying to get some more room to maneuver in the open air of the ballroom, falling back from Greenblight. For a moment, he thought that the stallion might lose interest and return to the fight with Arkenstone, which was still raging in the entryway. But the moment Greenblight's bloodshot eye fixed itself on Rumble, he knew he didn't have to worry about anything like that. Lucky me, he thought sardonically. With another bestial howl, Greenblight launched himself at Rumble, taking to the air, his wings beating hard to lift his bulk off the floor and send it hurtling at the colt. Rumble twisted out of the way of another swing of the scythe, deciding that he needed to do some attacking of his own. He'd been hesitating ever since he'd managed to get Greenblight away from Arkenstone. He'd never used the meteor hammer on another pony before, much less the real version of the weapon. If he wasn't careful, the steel weight could crush bones, including some pony's skull. He didn't want to kill any pony, not even some pony as terrifying as Greenblight. However, he didn't have near the level of skill Stormfront did. I guess the best way to go about it would be to avoid stuff that I know will kill him and hope that where I hit him won't kill him, thought Rumble. If Greenblight ended up dying anyway then, well, he'd simply have to cope. There were things more important at stake. Arkenstone had made that very clear to them when they left the palace that morning. I want you to listen carefully, said Arkenstone as Rumble and Scootaloo followed him down the hallway. When we reach our destination, if you truly desire to fight there is a very good chance that you will have to kill your opponent. Both Rumble and Scootaloo froze at that. Arkenstone proceeded a couple more steps before stopping himself. He didn't turn around, but his ears swiveled in place so they were oriented on the positions of the two foals. I can understand that you are uncomfortable with that fact. I would be worried if you weren't. However, neither of you are skilled enough to deal a disabling blow, much less such a blow in the middle of pitched battle. If you waste your time, energy, and awareness trying to do so, you end up putting yourself at risk and you will likely be the ones to end up dead. That outcome is unacceptable. Now he turned around, facing them directly. This is your point of no return. If you follow me and enter the battle, you must be prepared for the possibility that you will have to kill your opponent. If you truly feel that you can win without that, then you may try. However, if you don't feel ready to kill your opponent, should such a thing prove necessary, then you will need to turn back now. Rumble swallowed and looked down at his right foreleg, now concealed behind the green sleeve of his shirt. If push came to shove, could he take that final step? Closing his eyes, he thought about it for a long moment. He was a little worried that Arkenstone would lose patience and simply leave them behind, but the stallion remained in place without a word. I'm not ready, Rumble admitted, but I'll do what it takes because that's what needed. Arkenstone smiled sadly and lifted a hoof to gently brush back Rumble's mane. Very few ponies are truly ready for their first taste of battle. That much is true. I trust you. After a longer moment, Scootaloo answered as well. I'll do what I need to, she said. Our friends need us. Very well then, said Arkenstone, once again leading the way down the hall, then let us be off. The time for hesitation was past. Rumble snapped out his foreleg, launching the meteor hammer straight for Greenblight's flank. The weapon lanced out like the head of a striking snake. An instant later, it sank into Greenblight's side, just behind his ribcage with a meaty thunk. A yowl of pain filled the air and Rumble winced in sympathy. Once during a schoolyard squabble years ago, another pony had kicked him there, an experience that Rumble had found excruciatingly painful. He'd spent several minutes simply writhing on the ground. However, to Rumble's complete shock, Greenblight didn't falter. He didn't even flinch. Instead, the stallion whirled around, immediately charging at Rumble again, leading with an overhead swing of the scythe. Rumble rolled to the side, allowing Greenblight to go barreling past him. As he did, he brought the meteor hammer around in an overhead swing and brought it straight down on Greenblight's haunch, hitting him just above where his cutie mark rested. Once again, the stallion hardly reacted, save for an angry roar, before spinning around, the tip of his scythe threatening to spear Rumble through the ear. Whipping the meteor hammer through a complex pattern, Rumble brought it swinging up from below, slamming it straight into Greenblight's stomach. The air burst out of the stallion's mouth with a loud whoosh. However, Greenblight's jaws opened and he spewed out a more gasping, strangled version of his roar before coming at Rumble without the slightest hesitation, one fetlock clenched around the end of his scythe's shaft while his other hoof aimed punch after vicious punch at Rumble as the colt ducked inside the weapon's range. As he closed with Greenblight, Rumble drew back the meteor hammer, wrapping it around his barrel and up between his wings to shorten the length of the weapon in play, allowing him to use it in closer quarters. He barely managed to slip past Greenblight's punch, which was as fast as it was wild and uncoordinated. As he did, he whipped the meteor hammer up and smacked it into one side of Greenblight's ribcage. The weapon connected with the crack of breaking bone and the two of them were past each other. Coming out behind Greenblight, Rumble swung the meteor hammer up and around from overhead, allowing the portions of cord he'd wrapped around his body to slip away, giving him the length he needed to bring the arcing swing of the weapon down right on the base of Greenblight's tail, once again connecting with an echoing crack. Yet again, Greenblight whirled around, acting as though broken bones didn't even bother him. If anything, the pain seemed to drive the stallion into even greater throes of madness. He charged for Rumble, the side spinning and whirling. Geez, thought Rumble, his stomach churning, what's this guy made of? Scootaloo rolled and banked, barely managing to jerk her rear out of the way of a sphere of crackling, ebony magic that zipped past it. The orb of power merely changed direction, coming back at her yet again. Scootaloo had to kick of the air and send her body into a spin, pulling her wings in as she danced between that sphere and a second one coming in from a different angle. A third and fourth were coming in as well. Scootaloo kicked down with all four of her hooves, managing to launch herself out of the way of those ones as well. Unfortunately, all four attacks turned to come at her yet again. With a growl of anger, Scootaloo glared at Inkwell, who was glaring back with even greater intensity. With her wind sense able to follow the paths of the energy balls as they chased her through the air, Scootaloo was glad that she didn't at least have to watch them. However, it was all she could do to avoid the bolts tracking her every move. She didn't have the time to spare to try and launch some sort of counterattack. Instead, she was forced farther and farther away from her opponent with each passing second. Then Inkwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. Her horn, already smoking and glimmering with jet black magic, glowed with greater intensity. A fifth bolt, then a sixth joined the four already chasing after her. Horse apples, thought Scootaloo, jerking and juking all the harder as she fought for some way to throw them off. However, the orbs weren't simply following or tracking her. Inkwell was obviously actively controlling the paths of their flight, using them to come at the filly from different directions in an attempt to corral her and keep her from avoiding them. Scootaloo really wished that she'd mastered the rapid movement skill Dawn had taught her. Dawn could probably skip in and out of attacks like this with ease. So far, Scootaloo hadn't fully learned how to use that technique, even when simply using it to move forward. Backwards, side to side, up and down were all beyond her at the moment. Luckily, being able to use her hooves to kick off the air itself allowed her to change direction much more sharply than the average Pegasus. When one of the orbs of energy suddenly jumped in front of her, Scootaloo's right hind and forehooves kicked out, allowing her to jump sharply to the side before she collided with it. Deciding to change tactics, Scootaloo began pouring on the speed, trying her hardest to keep the orbs chasing after her. 3 of them did. The other 3 broke off and began moving in an extended arc to cut off her movement as she tried to circle around Inkwell. Scootaloo banked and found herself once again flying farther from her opponent in an effort to keep all 6 orbs behind her. Then it happened. The 6 pursuing orbs suddenly stopped homing in on her and instead went into straight flight, scattering into the air. Scootaloo pulled up short and glanced back. Inkwell was practically a dot in the distant yard now. Scootaloo estimated that she'd pulled over 100 meters away at least. Apparently this was the maximum range for Inkwell's magic. Or so Scootaloo thought. A few seconds later, she yelped and dodged, barely managing to avoid a lancing beam of jet black power the width of a broom handle that zipped past her with a faint whistling noise. What the hey? The attack had come dangerously close to spearing her through the center of the chest. Even the shift in the air caused by its approach had come too late. Instead, Scootaloo had reacted to the intense, focused killing intent that surged ahead of the attack. If she hadn't noticed that and dodged, she would have been killed right there and then. That near death hammered home the truth to Scootaloo in a way that all of Arkenstone's lectures never could. If she messed up, if she made one mistake, she would die. This was no training session. This wasn't even like the battle that Dawn had fought with Stormfront and Red River. This was real. For the very first time, it truly sank in for Scootaloo just how much danger she was in. Even her brief exchange with Perlin back in Ponyville hadn't affected her like this. She was in true battle with an opponent who intended to kill her. All this time, she wondered, was this what it was always like for Dawn? Her heart shuddered as she imagined herself in Dawn's hooves, thinking about what it would be like to spend days and weeks haunted by this feeling, the feeling that death was just around the corner, that the tiniest slip-up could cost him his life. Was this what it was truly like every time Dawn went into battle and put his life on the line? She didn't have long to ponder as another lance of magic forced her to evade yet again. Inkwell's shots were precise and deadly, targeting the wings, the heart, and other organs. Scootaloo didn't need to touch those beams to know that they would punch through her body as easily as one of Rarity's sewing needles could pierce a sheet of fabric. Inkwell's accuracy at this distance was incredible. I have to get closer, thought Scootaloo. She just barely managed to avoid those shots thanks to all her months of training with Dawn and thanks to the fact that Inkwell's intent clearly broadcasted where she was attacking ahead of the attack itself. The tiniest fraction of hesitation in Scootaloo's movements would result in her death. Inkwell's attacks were much too focused and dangerous to deal with. Besides, Scootaloo couldn't attack from this distance. If Dawn was here, she was sure that he could strike back at Inkwell even from this far away, maybe even farther. However, Scootaloo didn't have enough control to keep her attacks from dissipating over long distances. If she wanted to beat Inkwell, she would have to get in close. A beam of ebony power seared over her head, punching through part of her mane. Scootaloo winced at the pulling sensation from her hairs being broken away. Now was her chance. She had to cover as much distance as possible in order to get close before Inkwell got off another shot. Scootaloo had noticed something about Inkwell's attacks before. Unlike the remote-controlled orbs Inkwell was using before, these powerful long-distance shots couldn't be fired rapidly. It always took a few seconds for Inkwell to fire off another shot. Scootaloo realized that the time lag must have been the time it took for Inkwell to focus and condense her magic in order to fire it over a long distance. Even more importantly, unlike the orbs she was using earlier, Inkwell couldn't change the direction of her long-range shots after they were fired. In other words, this was her chance to get close before Inkwell could fire again. Scootaloo took advantage of those few seconds, charging straight in at her opponent, getting ready to throw herself to the side the instant she felt the next shot coming. The ground was a blur and the only thing Scootaloo saw clearly was the rapidly growing form of Inkwell. Then she felt that piercing spike of intent that preceded each of Inkwell's attacks. Scootaloo kicked out with her legs but failed to account for the strength of her own forward momentum. Instead, she began to skid awkwardly to the side, not moving nearly fast enough to get clear of the next shot. Oh no, she realized that this would be her fatal mistake. Even if this attack wasn't fatal, it would certainly knock Scootaloo out of the sky. Even if the subsequent crash failed to finish her off, Inkwell would probably be perfectly happy to do the job. I'm sorry every pony, she thought, the images of the ponies she loved flashing before her eyes as she braced herself for what was coming. With a loud crack, the meteor hammer slammed into Greenblight's left shoulder. The arm below that shoulder dropped limply. Now Greenblight only had his right leg with which to swing the scythe. But, as ever, the stallion seemed to hardly even notice Rumble's attack, instead howling savagely as he came in. Once again, Rumble ducked beneath the wild swing of the scythe, seeking to pass to the left where the fearsome weapon couldn't reach him. However, Rumble quickly learned his mistake when he saw what looked like an emerald green log, crisscrossed with scars, swing up in front of him. Ack! Rumble twisted and took the hit right across the flank. The force of the blow sent him flying away from Greenblight to smack hard against the wall, driving the breath from Rumble's lungs. Gravity took over from there and Rumble slid down the wall and to the floor, thankfully not hitting far enough up to hurt himself further. The act of falling actually saved his life as the point of the scythe sank into the stone right where his head had been only a second before. Greenblight grunted and growled as he fought to pull the weapon loose but was having a hard time doing so with only one good arm. Rumble gladly took advantage of the chance to get his breath back and take stock of his injuries. Fortunately, the hit from Greenblight's foreleg had been more surprising than dangerous and he hadn't hit the wall hard enough to break anything. He figured that he'd have a nasty bruise between his wings when all this was over. Greenblight had turned his body as Rumble had tried to pass him, allowing him to essentially swing the otherwise limp and useless foreleg like a large flail. Given the state of Greenblight's shoulder, such an action should have been beyond agonizing, but the stallion had done it without hesitation and showed no indication that he even cared. Every time Rumble hit him, Greenblight seemed more angered than pained by the experience. Rumble was extremely fortunate that he'd actually disabled Greenblight's arm with that last attack. If Greenblight had been able to punch properly with that limb, the attack would have probably broken Rumble's bones. It's like he doesn't care about the pain, thought Rumble incredulously. The only time a hit stops him is when it makes it impossible for him to physically move. That right arm was a perfect example. Even now, it dangled uselessly while Greenblight continued to lever the scythe out of the stonework. Using his body to whip it around like he just had was the extent of what Greenblight was capable of. But if he doesn't care about pain, then it means he'll keep going, no matter how badly his body is injured, thought Rumble. Unless he broke all four of Greenblight's legs and both his wings so that those limbs could no longer carry the scarred stallion, Greenblight would keep coming after him. Such a revelation should have frightened Rumble. It should have made him tremble with fear and made him consider running away. However, it actually had the opposite effect. Rumble felt his fear and nervousness fading, replaced by understanding. He's not thinking about anything, he thought, he just keeps attacking. Greenblight had never made any effort to avoid Rumble's return strikes, never even tried to put up any kind of defense. He hadn't tried to make any tactical use of the ballroom's layout or effectively apply his weapon. It was as though he was completely mindless. However, this was different from the thoughtless state that Dawn, Arkenstone, and even Storm had described as the pinnacle of martial mastery. This was true mindlessness, a wild flailing attack without any control or real guidance. Greenblight only pursued his target and attacked however he possibly could. Even that side that had been so intimidating before was less frightening to Rumble now. It was deadly to be sure. If it ever hit him, he'd probably end up killed by it. But now, after avoiding countless swings, Rumble saw what an awkward and unwieldy weapon it really was. The cutting edge was on the inside of the blade, which made slashing attacks rather awkward unless the weapon was pulled straight back towards the pony holding it. The tip was dangerous, of course, but narrow and easily dodged. The position of the blade simply made it difficult to swing so as to actually hit something. Rumble was in more danger from that heavy wooden shaft than the blade of the weapon. The scythe was poorly suited for combat. However, it did have a particularly intimidating quality. For millennia, the scythe had been a symbol of death, associated with figures like the Grim Reaper, who harvested the souls of the ponies who passed from the world of the living. However, that was a symbolic extension of the scythe's true purpose, namely cutting crops for harvest. Reaping, grim or otherwise, was not a particularly violent activity, namely because whether one was reaping grain or souls, the things being reaped generally weren't trying to reap you back. Though he wasn't aware of the whole picture, Rumble had succeeded in uncovering Greenblight's weaknesses. Greenblight was actually at a disadvantage when fighting against a single opponent. Furthermore, because, in his berserker rage, he abandoned all pretense of defense, he was also at a greater disadvantage without his subordinates to support him. In battle, Greenblight's primary role was to break up enemy formations. The sight of a crazed, scarred Pegasus, howling like a fiend, and brandishing a scythe like the specter of death itself was enough to strike fear into the hearts of even the staunchest opponents. He threw himself bodily into enemy ranks, striking out wildly with maniacal strength, turning his enemy's own organization against them as their formation kept them from scattering enough to effectively evade his strikes. However, if he were to continue to fight alone for any significant length of time, the flaws in his methods would become clear. The scythe was intimidating, but an awkward weapon at best. And those scars, which seemed so frightening at first, were obtained from Greenblight's lack of concern for his own well-being when he raged. In fact, he was dangerously vulnerable. If his enemies had the chance to realize this, they could turn their numbers to their advantage and surround him to quickly bring him down. Which was why Greenblight always made sure that his banehammers were never far behind him when he struck. Greenblight drove himself like a wedge into the enemy ranks, breaking up their formation. Before the enemy could realize his vulnerability, the rest of the banehammers fell upon them and finished the fight with ruthless efficiency. With Inkwell using her precise and deadly battle magic from the rear, they were a force to be feared on the battlefield. But on his own and against a single opponent with plenty of room to move and evade, Greenblight was reduced to less than a wild beast, for even monsters had more survival instinct and canniness than Greenblight now held. The longer the fight went on, the more things turned to Rumble's advantage. Greenblight could not maintain his berserk state forever. When it finally subsided, all the pain of his injuries would finally catch up to him. I can do this, thought Rumble, clenching his fetlocks around the cord of his meteor hammer. However, even as he thought that, he forced himself to remember something that Stormfront had once told him. If you completely lose your fear of your opponent, then you are at great peril. Fear alerts you to danger. If you relinquish it completely, you lose that wariness and leave yourself vulnerable. Even if an enemy seems completely incompetent, maintain some semblance of respect for her until the battle is over. Remembering those words, Rumble took a deep breath and braced himself as Greenblight finally managed to yank the scythe free of the wall. However, he failed to do it properly and the tip of the weapon snapped off and remained lodged there. Rumble took to the air again as Greenblight came at him. Whirling the meteor hammer, Rumble worked out his plan of action. Take out his other arm, then his wings. Then it won't matter if he doesn't notice pain if he can't even fly up to me. His plan in place, Rumble met Greenblight's charge with one of his own, hoping that he could finally bring an end to this battle. The expected shot never came. Instead, the killing intent vanished and Inkwell didn't fire. For a moment, Scootaloo thought the mare was toying with her. However, as she got in closer, she could see that Inkwell was blinking furiously and shaking her head. Something got in her eyes. Before Scootaloo could think too much about it, Inkwell managed to clear up whatever problem she was dealing with and focused her gaze on Scootaloo once again, those black eyes burning with malice. However, instead of firing another lance of magic, she instead unleashed a burst of several smaller bolts from her horn. They were smaller than the grapefruit-sized bolts Inkwell had unleashed earlier, about the size of large cherries. But she compensated by unleashing more than a dozen of them. Their greater numbers and higher speed made it much more difficult for Scootaloo to track. With a yelp, she spun and jumped, kicking out her legs to throw herself out of the way of all the bolts as they came at her with unrelenting ferocity. The ends of the ribbon Scootaloo wore around her neck flapped and snapped as the filly's frantic dodges whipped them through the air. Scootaloo yelped in pain as she missed a dodge. One of the bolts burst against her shoulder. It was a glancing blow that failed to actually cause any injury. But it was still painful. She couldn't keep this up for long. The bolts might not have had the penetrating power of the lancing shots Inkwell used to strike over longer distances, but Scootaloo would be pounded into a pulp by them if she allowed them to hit her. There was no time to think. Instead, Scootaloo felt her mind go blank as she was on the verge of being overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacks coming at her. It was a strangely calm and relaxing feeling. Suddenly, she was sensing all of Inkwell's bolts clearly. She could sense the gaps in their approach. Not even thinking about it, Scootaloo kicked out with one hind leg, twisting her body along with the motion, going to a rolling, acrobatic spin that sent her in between two of the bolts. She felt them immediately turn to reorient on her new position as four more came in separate vectors. Completely losing herself to the moment, Scootaloo kicked straight down with all four legs. At the same time, her months of training caused her to move her wings in cooperation with the motion. She shot upward, out from between all of the attacks. However, it didn't feel quite right to her. There was too much resistance from the air as she shot upward. Though she wasn't consciously thinking about it, Scootaloo knew she could move faster than that. Several more bolts rushed in from around her. However, Scootaloo kicked back with all four of her hooves, her wings moving in tight arcs around her sides. This was a motion that she knew well. Moving so quickly that she was no more than a blur to the eyes of a normal pony, Scootaloo zipped forward and out of the way of the incoming bolts. At that moment, she realized that, if she could simply apply the principle of moving the wings in whatever direction she was going, she could move faster, no matter what way she was going. I get it, thought Scootaloo, the battle forgotten for a moment. If I can do this, I can move even faster. The next time Inkwell's bolts swarmed around her like hornets, Scootaloo kicked straight down again. However, this time she pointed her wings up and then swept them down in tight arcs, clearing the air out of her path. Scootaloo seemed to vanish in that instant, only to reappear higher up. Even Inkwell had to take a second to find Scootaloo again with her eyes. Though she didn't realize it, Scootaloo was actually improving over the course of the fight. Every time something felt off or awkward, she adjusted her position and balance until it felt better. As a consequence, she was dodging faster, moving with greater grace and precision. Her effort to evade Inkwell's swarm of telekinetic bolts was like an elegant dance taking place at unbelievable speed. She spun and pirouetted through the air, spinning and twisting between the shots with what seemed to be contemptuous ease, though she was actually pushing her body harder than she ever had before. Sweat matted down her fur and ran through her mane and tail, but Scootaloo only felt exultation as her movements gradually grew smoother and more precise. As she finished another dodge, Scootaloo found one of Inkwell's bolts waiting for her. Without thinking about it, Scootaloo lashed out with one wing. The burst of air met the orb of black energy and knocked it away with an angry buzz. Realizing that she could use the Gale King to deflect as well as evade, Scootaloo swept one wing in a wide arc, twisting to put the strength of her entire body into the motion. A heavy blast of wind swept out around her, scattering Inkwell's swarming bolts like autumn leaves. Inkwell growled and the bolts immediately reoriented and came back at Scootaloo. However, Scootaloo swept her wings in tight arcs, this time moving them from back to front as she kicked forwards with all four of her hooves. The reverse of the exercise she'd been practicing for so many weeks now felt a bit more awkward than the original form, but she still managed to blur as she shot backwards, her flight now taking her away from Inkwell. Then the shots scattered again, flying off in random directions as Inkwell released her control of them again. Scootaloo blinked, getting her mind back together as she realized that the sudden onslaught of magical bolts had stopped. Looking in, from this distance she could barely see Inkwell shaking her head again. A few seconds later, Scootaloo again felt that spike of ferocious killing intent followed by another lance of ebony magic as Inkwell once again switched over to sniping at the filly. Scootaloo's eyes widened as she finally realized what was going on. I get it, she can either see me really close or from really far away. But she can't do both at once. When I get too close or too far away, she has to stop what she's doing and actually switch. Finally, after spending the whole battle on the defensive and simply trying to stay alive while avoiding those lethal magical blasts, Scootaloo had managed to spot a chink in her foe's armor. She was reminded of Rumble's retelling of events when he related how he'd seen Inkwell, Greenblight, and their ponies carry off Twilight Sparkle and Coco Pommel. He'd been hiding behind a rock nearby and had thought that Inkwell had spotted him for a second. But the mare had continued on like she had seen nothing. Rumble must have either been too close when she was looking for things far away, or too far away when she was looking for something in close, maybe even both. There was some sort of line or boundary where Inkwell couldn't make out her targets at that distance and had to switch one way or the other. And Scootaloo already had an idea of where that line was. Thanks to her stubborn focus on simply controlling her magic and making precise shots, as well as not having to defend herself at all, Inkwell hadn't moved a single step since the fight had begun. Because of that, Scootaloo was able to use the landmarks, the wall, the boundaries of the flower beds to get a rough idea of where Inkwell had to transition her fighting style from close range to long range. However, she couldn't afford to spend too much time or effort trying to figure out exactly where that line was. At some point, Inkwell was bound to figure out what Scootaloo was up to. After that, there was no telling what the mare might do. I have to end this quickly, thought Scootaloo. Sensing another jolt of killing intent, she barely managed to shift out of the way. Silently, she thanked Dawn for making her train with Red River occasionally to get used to the sensation. I keep hearing you talk about intent and stuff like that, said Scootaloo as she stood in front of Dawn. What's that all about? As usual, they were practicing in the quarry. In the skies above, Stormfront was putting Rumble through his paces. Not too far away, Red River lounged, his spear resting over one shoulder as he enjoyed the view of the others diligently practicing. Would you like to find out? Asked Dawn. Raising a hoof, he beckoned Red River over. The Azure Stallion, enjoying the opportunity to occupy his time with something, obliged the colt and approached. When he was close enough, Dawn told him, Scootaloo is curious about sensing intent. Could you provide her with a demonstration? Certainly, said Red with a smile before turning to Scootaloo. Are you sure you want to do this? It's a frightening experience. Scootaloo nodded. I'm not scared. You should be, said Red. I've told your colt friend many times that fear is an important aspect of mastery. A lack of fear will make you careless and could cost you your life someday. If anything, Dawn wants me to teach you how to listen to your fear. What do you mean? Asked Scootaloo, swallowing. In spite of her words, she began to feel a little nervous. Seeing her bravado fading, Red smiled a little. I'll show you. Hold still now. Sinking into a stance, he leveled the spear out to one side and focused entirely on the filly in front of him. For a few seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then Scootaloo felt it. Her senses screamed and all her honed reflexes told her that something bad was coming. Even though Red was motionless in front of her, she still felt as though his spear was already coming right at her. Half a second later, Red actually did thrust the spear, bringing it to an abrupt halt less than an inch away from Scootaloo's nose. What do you think? Asked Red. Shivering, Scootaloo backed away a little before slumping down on her haunches. Dawn came beside her and gently draped a wing over her back as he nuzzled her cheek. That was. Scootaloo blinked furiously, trying to find the words to express how she felt. A skilled opponent, one who has honed her techniques through life and death battle, can produce such an effect, explained Red. Her intent, her desire, her conviction to kill her enemy projects itself. Properly honed, intent itself can be a powerful weapon in its own right. However, it can also telegraph your attacks before you even make them if you don't learn to master it properly. I deliberately emphasized the interval so that you clearly felt my intent before I moved. If I were fighting for real, it would have been like this. Scootaloo had zero warning. Once again her senses told her she was in extreme danger, but Red's spear was already a blur, heading right for her face. She would have jumped away, but Dawn's wing held her in place. He didn't flinch even though the spear was heading for him as well. Once again, Red brought the weapon to a halt less than an inch away from the filly's face. Intent triggers an instinctual response, a sense that you were born with warning that your life is in danger. Unless you learn how to properly heed that instinct, reacting to an enemy's intent may cause you to falter and render you vulnerable. With a chuckle, Red pulled back his spear. The more skilled and experienced your opponent is, the shorter the interval between intent and action is. Furthermore, if your opponent is a true master, then she may very well be able to strike without intent at all, so that there is absolutely nothing for your instincts to react to. However, that is a skill that only the most formidable and experienced of fighters are able to cultivate. Even I can't manage that. So that's what it's like, muttered the filly. Dawn's wing gently brushed up and down her back, the feeling soothing her after experiencing so much fear. More or less, said Red, as I said before, this is all about listening to your fear. Fear is your instincts telling you that you're in danger. However, listening does not mean that you allow your fear to control you. If you did that, you'd either freeze in place or flee, either of which would render you vulnerable. Instead, you must use your fear as a guide to tell you when you need to evade or defend. Sadly, in order to be capable of that, you must experience more fear, a great deal of fear. Swallowing, Scootaloo looked up at Red. Even though she knew this would probably be the most unpleasant lesson she was ever going to experience, she still asked, could you help me with that then? Red actually grinned and glanced at Dawn, who smiled and nodded. If that is what you want, then I shall oblige you. Those lessons had been some of the most difficult and terrifying Scootaloo had ever dealt with. Red made it feel as though he was going to kill her over and over again. True to his words, the experience had not been a pleasant one. However, when he had finished, Scootaloo felt she had truly gotten a handle on how to sense the killing intent that both Red and Dawn were talking about. Those lessons were saving her life now, as they were the only thing that kept Inkwell's shots from punching holes through her body. First, she had to start getting in close again. She didn't know how much magic her opponent had, but Inkwell didn't seem to be running out anytime soon. If anything, the continuous plume of smoke now emitting from her horn seemed to indicate that her horn would burn out before her reserves did, although there was still no telling how long that would take. Scootaloo dodged the next shot and once again sprinted straight in towards her opponent, keeping all her senses focused on Inkwell. She noticed the instant where the mare suddenly blinked and began shaking her head again. Now that she had a more precise idea of where the invisible line that defined the limits between Inkwell's two different types of vision lay, it was time to put her strategy into action. Once again, Inkwell unleashed a burst of black spheres, this time a round dozen of apple-sized ones. Compared to the last round, they were much easier to dodge than the swarm of smaller spheres. However, as Scootaloo swung out a wing to deflect them with another blast of air, she noticed that the orbs were not as easily diverted from their paths. She supposed that she wasn't the only one refining her strategy throughout the match. Each time she came in close, Inkwell was apparently refining her own remote-controlled telekinetic bolts, finding a balance between speed, power, and numbers to find the ideal attack to finally bring her nimble opponent down, working as carefully and meticulously as a pony carefully fitting pieces into a puzzle. I need to end this soon, thought Scootaloo as she twisted and danced out of the way of the shots again. She remembered the sensation of the last time and continued to let her senses guide her to refine her motions to help her move faster and dodge more effectively. She would need every ounce of speed and agility she could muster to put her strategy into action as Inkwell's bolts continued to doggedly pursue her through the skies. That persistent focus was both Inkwell's greatest strength and her greatest weakness. Prior to the accident that had cracked her horn and damaged her mind, she had been a skilled battle mage with a wide repertoire of spells and a cunning mind. Had it not been for the incident where she'd overchanneled her magic during battle, Inkwell would have probably been the leader of the Banehammers rather than Greenblight. However, the same accident that had damaged her horn, limiting her only to basic telekinetic spells, had also damaged her mind. Inkwell's ability to think of things in the wider scope, to act strategically and tactically, had been lost. In its place was the ability to single-mindedly focus on the task at hoof. That intense focus had allowed her to take basic combat spells, like the telekinetic bolt that practically any unicorn could learn, and refine them into forms that rivaled even the most advanced battle magic for effectiveness. However, it had also eliminated her capacity to lead others and think beyond her own actions. As a consequence, Inkwell played a supporting role amongst the Banehammers, whether it was sniping down priority targets from a long distance or supporting the main body of troops with a precise bombardment from closer range. She existed largely as a magical projectile weapon. As such, she no longer considered the wider implications of her actions. Right now, she was focused entirely upon one task, killing the filly who was interfering with her. She switched up the basic tactics for her attacks to better obtain that end, refining her approach continuously. As she did so, Inkwell never even considered the notion that Scootaloo was doing the same. Moving carefully, even as she dodged frantically, Scootaloo edged backwards to where she figured the limit of Inkwell's close-range vision was. Once she had reached that point, she would have to act immediately. She would only have a few seconds at best before Inkwell figured out what was going on. Scootaloo had to land the decisive blow in those few seconds. When she estimated she was at the limit, Scootaloo swallowed nervously. Here we go. Beating her wings, she backed past the imaginary line she judged was the limit of Inkwell's vision. Releasing control over her guided bolts, Inkwell began to blink and shake her head, clearly shifting her vision over for long-range combat. However, the instant she began doing so, Scootaloo reversed her flight and charged straight in. For Inkwell, whose eyes had followed Scootaloo throughout the entire battle, Scootaloo had pulled back until she was little more than an orange and fuchsia blur to the mare's vision. Upon getting her eyes to shift over, an act that took quite a bit of effort and concentration, Inkwell would have been able to see and track the filly with perfect clarity even if she was over a kilometer distant. However, once the shift was complete, Inkwell couldn't make out Scootaloo as well. All she did see was an orange blur rapidly getting closer. Her eyes going wide, Inkwell had to concentrate on shifting her vision over yet again. But her panic hampered her efforts, making it take longer than it should have. Scootaloo kicked back behind her with her hooves, swinging her wings in tight arcs around the side of her body, parting the air in front of her and using it to fill in behind her, allowing her to accelerate so rapidly she seemed to vanish to normal eyes. For the first time, she felt she'd truly executed that technique perfectly. The distance between her and Inkwell vanished in the blink of an eye. As Inkwell finished shifting her vision over, she found herself looking at Scootaloo just as the filly arrived just in front of her. Inkwell's eyes widened yet again. Ideally, Scootaloo would have had some smart remark ready, something to show that she had this battle in the bag. But she didn't have time for that. There wasn't time for anything fancy. She just had to hit Inkwell as hard as she could and pray that would bring the fight to an end. In order to do so, Scootaloo fell back on the attack she knew best. Bracing her hooves against the ground, she lunged forward, pushing hard with her hind legs as she swept both her wings forward so that the tips of her primaries extended past her head, putting the full weight and power of her body into the motion. For the second time that day, Scootaloo executed the forward wing strike, this time at point-blank range. Inkwell shrieked as a roaring column of air slammed into her body with the force of a locomotive. Bones cracked and broke, muscles tore, and tendons snapped as the blast drove her all the way across Elderflower's yard, blasting a furrow through the earth and tearing apart everything in its path. Both mare and wind hit the wall that surrounded Elderflower's property, which shattered under the onslaught and continued on across the street beyond, the stone cobbles not faring any better than the dirt of the garden had. Finally, Inkwell came to a rest well beyond the boundaries of Elderflower's estate, her body limp and unmoving. Author's notes. And on that rather brutal note, this chapter comes to an end. The tricky thing about establishing Greenblight and Inkwell as credible foes was also showing that they can be extremely vulnerable under the right circumstances. They are at their strongest when they have a specific role to fulfill and are fully supported by the rest of their underlings. Outside of those circumstances, their effectiveness as fighters drops drastically. Greenblight especially has to be careful about not fighting without support for too long, as his greatest advantages are psychological. Next chapter, Elderflower experiences a not-so-minor setback. Broken Dreams. Chapter 14, Broken Dreams. For a long moment, Scootaloo stared at Inkwell's unmoving figure. She was panting, almost gasping for breath. Her body was soaked with sweat and her limbs were shaking. She had no idea she'd been working so hard. But now that the battle was over, all of that exertion was taking its toll. But the battle wasn't over yet, at least Scootaloo wasn't certain that it was over yet. She didn't want to check but, at the same time, knew she had to. She had an obligation to make sure that Inkwell was truly out of the fight and that she wouldn't come back to cause problems at a later time. However, she was terrified of what she would find. The time had come to see whether or not she had ended up killing another pony. Though she'd told Arkenstone that she was prepared for this possibility, the reality of being a killer was still something she wasn't truly ready to accept. Gulping, Scootaloo took off and flew, tracing the trench her attack had torn through the earth, following it to its ultimate end. Her path took her past the wall and across the street, where Inkwell lay up against the side of another building, its wall cracked from the force of the mare's impact and the wind driving her. Scootaloo's stomach churned as she got her first good look at the mare. There was no question that Inkwell was no longer a threat. Even if the mare managed to miraculously get back on her hooves, she wouldn't be using her magic anymore. The cracked horn was now gone. In its place was a jagged stump, slowly oozing blood as fragments of the horn littered the ground around her. One of them was even embedded in the wall like a piece of shrapnel. That wasn't the only injury Inkwell had suffered. All four of her limbs lay at awkward angles. One of the bones in a hind leg had snapped and actually broken through the skin. Its white color contrasted sharply with the blood spilling from the room, forming a crimson pool right beneath the injury. Inkwell's chest looked slightly deformed and the mare's muzzle was bent crookedly, more blood seeping out of her nose and mouth. Those soulless black eyes were no longer visible, the lids having closed. Scootaloo wanted to vomit. Her stomach was violently trying to reject its contents and send them back up and out through the filly's mouth. She forced the feeling down mercilessly and leaned in, putting an ear up against Inkwell's now offset nose, praying silently. She heard it faintly, just the barest whisper of breath. Inkwell was alive, for now. But with injuries like those, she wasn't likely to last for long. Scootaloo was torn. She had a battle to see through to the end. After all, Twilight still needed rescuing and the elements of harmony had to be recovered. But, at the same time, she didn't feel she could abandon a critically injured mare like this, even if she had done unspeakable things in the past and had been trying to kill Scootaloo only a few minutes ago. The click of hooves against the stone street caught her ears and Scootaloo looked up, her body going tense as she turned to face what might be a new threat. However, she relaxed a little when she saw a small formation of royal guards with none other than shining armor at their head. Geez, said the stallion, his eyes going wide, I was debating whether or not to go through the front gate. I guess it's a good thing I heard you fighting out back here. Yeah, said Scootaloo, looking down at the mare, can you help her? Shinning's eyes went to Inkwell and hardened as he glared at the mare. He knew for certain that she had personally killed two of his ponies. Part of him wanted to let her bleed out on the street. However, one look at Scootaloo and the worried, tortured look on her face snuffed that anger out. If Inkwell was going to die, it should be on his watch. There was no need to let a filly become a killer at such a young age if he could help it, even if she had legitimate reasons for doing so. Besides, Inkwell and the few of her cohorts who managed to survive this affair would still need to stand trial when all was said and done. We'll do what we can, he said, nodding to one of the unicorns behind him. The mare stepped forward, clearly reluctant to help a pony that had murdered her comrades. However, her horn flashed and she set a stasis spell on Inkwell to hold her body until she could be treated. Such spells were mandatory for guard unicorns so that they could aid their comrades if they were injured in the field. You've done really well, said Shining, smiling down at Scootaloo, I think Dawn would be proud of you. That brought a smile to the filly's face. She forced it back down a moment later. I've got to get back, she said, Rumble might need help. Are you sure you're going to be okay? Asked Shining. Scootaloo grinned and nodded. Yeah, after fighting her, the rest of this should be a cinch. Okay then, said Shining, feeling a little dubious. Statements like that were bad omens after all. Still, he felt he could trust in Scootaloo a little more after what he'd just seen her do. The filly flew back towards the mansion whilst the other members of the royal guard looked to Shining. He could tell that they were reluctant to leave the fate of such an important operation in the hooves of foals. But Shining felt that they would probably do better than he or his subordinates could manage in this situation. Set up a perimeter, he said, we'll make sure that none of the Baron's lackeys get away when this is all over. The authority in his voice erased all traces of doubt in his ponies and they quickly moved to obey him. They hesitated when they heard a familiar, bestial howl echoing out from the estate, a sound many of them remembered hearing during the enemy raid on the palace the other day. Be safe kids, thought Shining as he took one last glance at Scootaloo's receding form. He hoped that they would make it through this. He didn't want to face Twilight if she found that foals had been hurt attempting to help her. Greenblight's trademark roar was not what it used to be. It now sported a watery, gurgling quality. Along with that, the foam around his mouth was now flecked with streaks of red as he spat blood every time he made a sound. Rumble had delivered several solid blows to the stallion's side and stomach. He'd held back somewhat out of a reluctance to do too much damage. While he wasn't an anatomy expert, Rumble did remember the biology lessons Cheerily had taught, primarily the fact that behind the muscles of the stomach area, a pony's body was full of soft and squishy organs. Rumble didn't want to be the one to squish those organs when all was said and done. Maybe it was imprudent of him, but he wanted to do everything possible to avoid killing his opponent. Greenblight couldn't keep his berserk rage up forever, and when it passed, the stallion would collapse like a sack of potatoes. I've just got to make sure he doesn't kill me in the meantime, thought Rumble nervously as he slipped around another flailing slash from Greenblight's scythe. With only one foreleg, the stallion could barely manage to swing the heavy weapon. As a result, his attacks were all too easy to avoid. Beating his wings to gain altitude, Rumble climbed into the air above Greenblight and launched his meteor hammer straight down, aiming for the spot right between Greenblight's wings. The scarred stallion was twisting, turning around to continue his pursuit of the colt, and as a consequence, the steel weight ended up slamming into his right wing where it met his shoulder. The wing suddenly began to move erratically, and Greenblight was no longer able to keep himself in the air. As he fell, he continued to roll his body over so that he could swing the scythe at Rumble one last time. It was a futile gesture as the colt simply rose a little higher, which, along with Greenblight's own fall, carried him easily out of the reach of the weapon. Greenblight slammed down onto the floor with loud thud, sprawling out on his back. Rumble winced and averted his eyes slightly, hoping that the fall wasn't enough to kill the stallion. Looking down, he could see Greenblight's 3 intact limbs flailing in the air as though the stallion were still trying to reach up and somehow magically pull his enemy down to him. His eye patch was askew, revealing a mass of scar tissue where his other eye had once been. The sight of the ruined socket made Rumble want to retch. The scythe lay nearby on the floor, forgotten. Its blade, which had already lost its tip to the wall earlier, had snapped in half. The shaft had cracked and split partway along its length. From the twitching, shifting motion of Greenblight's body, it was clear that he was trying to get his hooves back under him and continue the battle, even if he had no way of reaching Rumble now. Rumble simply opted to continue hovering well out of reach, watching his opponent cautiously. Even if he had clearly won, there was no telling if the stallion had some other method of violence at his disposal. Gradually, Greenblight's motions began to slow. His legs lowered and the stallion's angry snarls were replaced by wet, watery coughs. Finally, he lay still, gasping and hacking. A minute later, he began to groan as the berserk rage that had possessed him only moments before completely subsided and the collective pain of his injuries and exertions set in fully. This is impossible, coughed Greenblight, pausing to spit out another gob of bloody spittle. I can't have lost to a foal. You did. Both Rumble and Greenblight looked over to see Arkenstone walking through the ballroom doors. Behind the stallion, Rumble could see the still forms of numerous ponies, or rather, what was left of numerous ponies. It seemed that the Banehammers had fought to the last and Arkenstone had dispatched them with ruthless efficiency. Rumble felt an icy chill go down his spine and he paled as he forced himself to look away from the corpses. As Arkenstone approached, Rumble finally came down to land next to him as the blind stallion reached out and gently ran a hoof through Rumble's mane. That was well done, especially for your first real battle. His smile widened and his ears twitched at the sound of an incredulous cough from Greenblight. That's right, not only did this child defeat you, this was also his first real experience with a life or death battle. Thank you for making sure it was a valuable one. I don't doubt he gained a great deal from this. Rumble looked back and forth between the two stallions, trying to take in Arkenstone's smug demeanor and Greenblight's expression of disbelief. Hey, are you guys all right in here? Asked Scootaloo as she came flying in through the windows. We're fine, said Arkenstone, his muzzle turning up towards her. How did you fare? I won, said Scootaloo, though the look on her face indicated that she wasn't very happy about that. There was another disbelieving exclamation from Greenblight. Shining armor is here with the royal guard. I think they're setting up outside. Good, said Arkenstone, sniffing in Greenblight's direction. Rumble didn't deal anything too life-threatening. This one will keep for a little while. Now it's time to find Twilight. Even as those words left Arkenstone's mouth, an explosion sounded from upstairs. One of the ballroom walls along the upstairs balcony exploded outward, sending a rain of small debris falling downwards. A quartet of armored ponies in elderflower's colors were sent sprawling along the balcony, one smashing through the railing, his hindquarters hanging off and threatening to drag him off the balcony to the unforgiving floor below. However, a violet aura surrounded his body and yanked him back onto the balcony before he could fall off. Twilight, sparkle clad in silvery armor, emerged from the newly opened hole in the wall, a cold expression on her face. However, as she looked down from the balcony and spotted Arkenstone, her eyes widened. Her stern countenance melted into an exuberant smile. Arky, she exclaimed. Turning around, she smiled and beckoned to someone behind her. You see, Coco, I told you everything would be fine. That's wonderful, said Coco, a note of skepticism in her voice as she crept out onto the balcony. However, she relaxed a little when she saw Arkenstone in the folds. Then, when she saw who was lying on the floor a short distance away, her eyes widened and she gasped. Twilight also noticed the foals. Scootaloo, Rumble, what are you doing here? She would have teleported down, but Twilight knew that there were still some of Elderflower's guards left, plus who knew how many mercenaries. The Banehammers might not have been the only mercenary force he had on his payroll. Instead, she led Coco to one of the spiral staircases leading down to the ground floor so that she could walk to Arkenstone. As she approached, she came around the edge of the ballroom doors and saw the mess her special sumpony had left in the main entryway. Her eyes widened and Twilight went pale. Looking back, she could see that Coco hadn't yet reached an angle that would allow her to see out into the entryway yet. Thinking quickly, Twilight gripped both of the ballroom doors in her magic and slammed them shut. Coco looked at Twilight in confusion as the lavender mare took a moment to collect herself. Finally, she managed to give Arkenstone a questioning look. Though he couldn't see it, Arkenstone seemed to sense her silent inquiry and shook his head slowly. They refused surrender and fought to the last, he said softly. Swallowing hard, Twilight nodded. Then, she turned to look at Rumble and Scootaloo, who were still watching the reunion nervously. Why did you bring them? She asked. They volunteered, said Arkenstone. After they agreed to my terms, I decided to put my trust in them. In all honesty, they saved my life a few minutes ago. If they hadn't separated Greenblight and Inkwell from the rest of their soldiers, they might well have been too much for me. Turning back, Twilight could see that Arkenstone was not in the best of shape. Though he hadn't been injured, he was apparently in pain, breathing a good bit harder than usual. Beneath his beige coat, his skin was also a little pale. Clearly, his injuries from Terra Heart were still bothering him. In spite of that, he had taken on several dozen heavily armed mercenaries. "Oh Arky," said Twilight softly, reaching up with a hoof to gently caress his cheek, "you shouldn't push yourself like that." "I'll be fine," said Arkenstone, "I am no stranger to fighting while injured. Admittedly, I'm in a bit worse shape this time around than usual." The Banehammers were no slouches either. Coco was silent throughout the exchange, staring incredulously at Greenblight, who was still coughing and moaning on the floor. The whole experience felt surreal to her. Here he was, the stallion who had terrified and threatened her, who'd once held the blade of that now broken scythe to her throat and demanded she follow his orders lest said blade lop her head off. But now he was helpless, only capable of twitching and groaning in pain. From the sound of things, Inkwell wasn't much better off. These ponies had made the past few weeks a living Tartarus for her. Does that mean, she wondered, does that mean it's really over? Is everything really going to be all right? "Hey," said a tentative voice from her side. Looking down, Coco stared at Scootaloo, who was looking up at her worriedly. Coco let out a tiny gasp as she saw the grayish-purple ribbon wrapped around Scootaloo's neck. "Are you okay?" asked Scootaloo. "Yes," said Coco after a moment's hesitation, "I think I am." "You said Shining and the Royal Guard were outside?" asked Arkenstone, turning his attention to the filly. "Yeah," said Scootaloo. "Then could you and Rumble escort Coco out and make sure that she is safely in their custody?" requested Arkenstone, giving Scootaloo a proud smile. "You fought well. But now it's time to complete your mission. You came here to help out Coco and Twilight, correct?" Scootaloo nodded, while Coco brought a hoof to her mouth. "They came here for me, after what I did." Her eyes began to water. The feathers of a Pegasus wing gently brushed against her side and Coco looked over to see that Rumble had come up next to her. "It's going to be okay," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let's go." "All right," said Coco. Scootaloo and Rumble began to lead her to the opposite end of the ballroom and the doors that led out to the backyard. Twilight watched them go, smiling fondly, glad to see that Coco was going to be all right. Coming up next to her, Arkenstone gently nuzzled her cheek. "I've never been so scared in all my life as I was when I found out some pony had taken you," he admitted. Twilight couldn't help but giggle as she returned the nuzzle. "And here I thought you'd been teaching me to handle myself." "That I did," agreed Arkenstone, "but, as Fluttershy can no doubt tell you, knowing how strong the pony you care about is doesn't make it any easier when they are gone." "True enough," said Twilight. Her smile dropped. "I guess it's time to end this." "Yes," said Arkenstone, "we'll need to track down Elderflower before he gets away with the elements. I'm sure I can pick up his scent somewhere." "There's no need for that," said Twilight with a smirk. "I tagged him with a tracking spell the last time I saw him. He didn't even notice. I can teleport us right to him." Arkenstone sniffed sharply and tilted his head up. A few seconds later, Twilight realized why. Hooves pounded as more armored ponies in Elderflower's colors spilled out of the hallways leading into the ballroom and the balcony above. After beating down several of the Baron's guards already, Twilight found herself wondering just how many Elderflower had on his payroll. "Perhaps you should go on ahead," said Arkenstone. "I will deal with things here." Twilight swallowed and turned to regard her cold friend. She had gotten a glimpse of the carnage Arkenstone had unleashed upon the Banehammers in the main entryway. She shuddered to think that the ballroom would end up in a similar state. If Elderflower's guards didn't back down, Arkenstone would slaughter any who dared try to fight back. She didn't want to see him paint another room with blood. Still, she decided to have faith in him, knowing that Arkenstone would never spill blood unnecessarily. "I'm off," she said, closing her eyes and concentrating. It was the work of a few seconds to get a fix on the tracking spell she'd planted on Elderflower. Her horn blazed and Twilight vanished in a burst of violet light, leaving Arkenstone alone, facing the remainder of Elderflower's forces. Grim-faced ponies began to advance on the lone stallion, but froze in place as a powerful sense of fear settled over them like a heavy, smothering blanket. The source of that feeling was Arkenstone as he once again opened his eyes. "I do not have much patience for foolishness to begin with. What little I had today has already been pushed to its limit. Before any of you so much as think to start this battle, I would advise you to take a look in the next room." With a faint hissing and whistling noise, Arkenstone's blades flashed, moving faster than the eye could see. They sliced the ballroom doors to pieces, sending chunks of wood crashing to the floor and revealing the blood-soaked tableau that lay beyond them. Many of Elderflower's guard paled as they looked through the doors. "That is going to be your fate if you insist upon seeing this through to the end," promised Arkenstone. "I am not in the mood for games, particularly not with the likes of you. If there are any among you who value your lives, you will drop your weapons and surrender. Now." Twilight reappeared, blinking away the lights of her own magic as she sought to get her bearings in her new surroundings. She was in a wide hallway with numerous doors, evenly spaced, running down either side. The way was lit by several lanterns. A short distance down was an intersection with another hallway. From her position, Twilight could see even more doors down that other hallway. Given that she knew the Baron had been below her when she first teleported, she figured that this must have been the basement and the barracks for Elderflower's guard, as well as where he had been billeting the Banehammers when they stayed here. Her ears twitched as she picked up a low scraping noise, the sound of something large and heavy being dragged across the floor. Elderflower appeared around the corner of the intersection, grunting and straining as he struggled to move something with his magic, often tossing his head and making pulling motions with his body, as though he were physically harnessed to his burden. Twilight could easily recognize the signs of a unicorn who didn't do much heavy lifting with his magic if he was still defaulting to such pointless physical gestures. But that made sense. The Baron was a pony who did everything possible to keep from getting his hooves dirty. He left the hard work to others and only made an actual effort of his own if he was left with absolutely no other option. During one of his tugs, the Baron caught sight of Twilight out of the corner of his eye, standing there with one eyebrow raised, as though she were genuinely bemused by his current predicament. Elderflower's heart leapt into his throat as the ramifications of her presence sank in. There was no sign that his guards were still pursuing her. She hadn't a scratch on her and she was regarding him as though he was no threat whatsoever. "Having trouble, Lord Baron?" asked Twilight, applying a mocking inflection to those last two words, making her verbal acknowledgement of his rank into an insult. Elderflower wanted to say something, anything. But instead, he simply stood there and stared at Twilight. He'd had her at his mercy. She had been in his home, under his authority. He'd been in control the entire time. And yet, in less than an hour, everything had come crashing down. Now Elderflower was reduced to fleeing through the basement of his own manor, forced to take on the burden of carrying the elements himself, as though he were some lowly beast of burden. How had everything fallen apart so completely? It's over, Elderflower, said Twilight, it's time to give up. In spite of his current situation, Elderflower's lips twitched up in a smile. It's over, my dear Dame Sparkle, I'm afraid I've only just begun. Twilight's petrol clanked loudly as she smacked it in lieu of her own face. For Celestia's sake. You did not just say that. What in the world did you take for your electives at school? Cliché villainy 101. Silently, she did acknowledge that it was partially her fault for hoofing him a straight line like that. Elderflower seemed a little nonplussed that Twilight was not taking his words seriously. It took a moment for it to sink in that she truly didn't regard him as a threat any longer. You arrogant brat, I have given you every opportunity to be a part of something great, something noble. I gave you the chance to assume a role befitting your current rank and the opportunity to rise beyond the meager station of your birth. Despite that, you've spurned me, thrown away everything that would be yours. And for what commoner sentiment? How could a pony like you possibly be entrusted with the elements of harmony? Maybe because I understand them better than you ever will, replied Twilight. I know how the elements work. The things you dismissed as sentiments and platitudes are actually the core of the element's power. They don't draw their strength from magic in the unicorn sense. It comes from something deeper, something greater. Ridiculous, snapped Elderflower. The sixth element's name is magic. There is nothing else it could possibly be. If that was true, then we probably wouldn't have needed the elements to beat Discord, said Twilight, but the truth is we could throw our unicorn magic at him all we wanted and it would do nothing. More of the same wouldn't accomplish anything. That's why the elements worked, because they weren't simply an extension of what we unicorns can already do. They're a power that exists beyond the boundaries of tribe and class. Her eyes narrowed, but that's beside the point. Give up the elements. I'm taking them back where they belong. Elderflower let out a wordless snarl and used his magic to flip the lid of the chest up, revealing the elements in their resting places. Then, he wrenched out the tiara decorated with the six-pointed star of Twilight's cutie mark and held it over the floor. I will give up nothing, said Elderflower. Even if I cannot escape with the elements, there is no way that I would allow them to fall back into your hooves. I would sooner smash them than give them up. With an angry groan, Twilight rolled her eyes in exasperation. Oh, for Celestia's sake, I'm getting sick of this. If you want to smash the elements, be my guest. Elderflower blinked in confusion for a second before his anger returned. Don't you dare underestimate me. I will do it. Let me help you with that then, said Twilight, her aura taking hold of the element of magic. Carelessly wrenching it free from Elderflower's magical grip, Twilight hurled it down to the floor. The star-shaped gem shattered like glass, the golden metal of the tiara warped from the impact. The element of magic now seemed to be nothing more than a mass of twisted gold wire surrounded by fragments of shattered gemstones. What have you done? Cried Elderflower, backpedaling away from the mess. He'd never expected Twilight to call his bluff, much less carry it out for him. Are you insane? How could you destroy something so important? Snorting derisively, Twilight strode forward, her approach causing Elderflower to fall back further. Weren't you the one threatening to destroy the elements? I just saved you some work. Now quit yelling and just watch. Closing her eyes, Twilight filled her mind with thoughts of her friends, the ponies she cared about most. She thought of the princesses Celestia, Luna, and Cadence. She thought of her family, her parents and shining armor. She thought of Coco Pommel, who'd endured so much at the hooves of Elderflower and his cronies. She thought of Blue Blood and Fancy Pants, who'd worked so hard behind the scenes to help her and her friends. She thought of Arkenstone, the stallion she loved. More and more ponies flashed through Twilight's mind and she felt a sense of tremendous warmth flow through her. Smiling, Twilight basked in that warmth, letting it fill her. As Elderflower watched, Twilight Sparkle's body began to glow. Where it lay on the floor, the remains of the element of magic began to glow as well. First the tiny gemstone fragments began to twitch, then rattle against the floor. The bent and dented form of the tiara slowly lifted off the ground. Yet not so much as a spark issued from Twilight's horn. The tiara seemed to dissolve into a stream of molten gold that began to swirl around Twilight's head, while the shining shards of gemstone orbited it like glittering stars. Twilight opened her eyes, which blazed white like twin suns, their luminance almost blinding Elderflower as he was forced to avert his gaze. His legs were trembling so much that it was all he could do to remain standing upright. The stallion was certain that the harsh light from Twilight's eyes was going to scour him from the world. The hallway was growing uncomfortably hot and Elderflower felt as though he was on the verge of bursting into flame. Finally, the light faded and Twilight stood there. Her armor was gone. Instead, she now wore the tiara of the element of magic, whole once more. Impossible, gasped Elderflower. Twilight couldn't quite keep the smug smile from her face. You wouldn't know, she said, when my friends and I found the elements, they were just a bunch of rocks. Nightmare Moon shattered them right before my eyes. It wasn't until I realized what the elements were and why my friends were there that they took on the form that they have now. The elements aren't a bunch of cheap amulets. You can't break them or smash them. You can't simply hoof them over to some pony and expect them to work just because that pony might be good with magic. There's so much more than that. That's why your plan has no hope of succeeding. Unless the ponies you gave them to could truly embrace the virtues of harmony, honesty, kindness, laughter, generosity, and loyalty, they wouldn't be able to do a thing with the elements. In your hooves, they're useless. No, yelled Elderflower, stamping his hoof down, I am the one who will bring true harmony to Equestria. I will put things in their proper order and put every pony in their place. I will never accept this mockery of harmony that you and Princess Celestia preach. I was born to guide this nation to greatness. That is my right, the right of all of noble birth. You're not bringing order, said Twilight, you're throwing a fit because things aren't going the way you think they should. Ponies have died and you've sown nothing but misery and pain with your schemes. If that's your idea of order, I'd rather see discord break out again before I support that. Elderflower's eyes narrowed dangerously. So be it. The tip of his horn lit up, the aura brown at first. Then it turned white, becoming a blinding flash that forced Twilight to cover her eyes with a yell. She heard the drum of Elderflower's hooves as he rushed past her. Galloping down the hallway, Elderflower pulled open a door, rushed inside and slammed it shut behind him. There was a click as a bolt slid into place and Twilight was left alone with the elements. When she opened her eyes again, it took Twilight a moment to get her vision back to normal and stop the random lights from blinking across her eyes. Her first impulse was to go after Elderflower, but she could still sense her tracking spell on him. She could find him easily enough. But first, she had to get the elements out. Elderflower spit out curses as he tripped over a rock and went sprawling. As he did, he scraped past a crystal formation, its sharp, jagged edges drawing lines of red across his coat. With a grimace, Elderflower forced his hooves back under him. He was glad that he'd excavated a passage into the crystal caverns. The magical properties of the crystals would interfere with any attempts to trace him using magic. He assumed that Twilight had used some sort of tracking spell on him, which would explain how she teleported down to him so easily. However, she wouldn't be able to do that down here. On top of that, these caverns were probably completely foreign to her. A pony who was unfamiliar with the caverns could wander for weeks and not enter the same chamber twice. Elderflower, on the other hoof, had invested a great deal of time and money in making sure that the caverns beneath his estate had been carefully investigated and mapped, complete with routes leading to the estates of his allies. Not that he was heading to any of his fellow nobles for help. Instead, Elderflower was making his way to the massive chamber that had been dubbed the Grand Hall of the Crystal Caverns. It was a large, high-ceilinged cabin with a surprisingly clear floor, free from the abundance of crystal stalagmites found in other chambers. It was large enough that well over 100 ponies could assemble there. When they had discovered it, Elderflower and his allies had decided to use it as a rallying point for the mercenaries they gathered as they planned for their assault on the palace. The raid had been implemented much earlier than planned and hadn't required such a massive force. But the other nobles had not disbanded their forces yet. After all, they were still useful in other capacities. The plan had been to use the mercenaries to stage further attacks on the city of Canterlot and stir unrest and fear within the city for Elderflower and the others to quell once it reached fever pitch. Doing so would be simple once Elderflower debuted the elements of harmony in their new wielders. However, that plan had now been shot to the moon. Still, Elderflower had no intention of giving up so easily. I'll show the princesses and Twilight Sparkle just who should be running this nation. I will use our gathered forces to bring about such an eruption of chaos that, even with the elements on her side, the princesses won't be able to quell it. I will plunge this city into anarchy and wash the streets with the blood of all those commoners. Then Celestia will have no choice but to concede the necessity of the noble court. It would be an easy task to carry out. All Elderflower had to do was reach the chamber and give the orders, and the assembled mercenaries would launch an all-out attack on Canterlot. He'd already sent the order for them to assemble a while ago in preparation for the original plan. They would already be there, waiting for him, when he arrived. With a final sprint, Elderflower burst into the grand hall, his mouth open, ready to start barking orders. However, he came skidding to a halt at the sight before him, his voice dying before it left his lips and his jaw going slack with shock and horror. The grand hall had become a mausoleum. The cabin floor was covered with blood and entrails beneath the hacked and dismembered bodies of dozens of ponies. One of the few crystal formations jutting out of the floor was decorated by the forms of Pegasi impaled on the spears of crystal shards. The walls were scorched and pitted from bolts of unicorn magic that had either missed their target or been deflected. The floor, where it was visible through the gore, was cracked by the hooves of fighting earth ponies. Only a dozen or so ponies remained alive, and they were presently engaged in the process of dying horribly. As Elderflower watched, the remaining mass of armed and armored ponies undulated as they surrounded and converged on something, earth ponies surging forward to crush their enemy beneath the weight of their armored bodies, whilst Pegasi rose up to strike from the air. From behind, unicorns launched bolts of eldritch power past their comrades, trying to strike down whoever was inside the center of their encirclement. The light thrown off by the crystals flashed off something silver. A pair of wings flashed out, slicing cleanly through armor of the finest steel as though it were paper. Feathers attached to thin wires lanced out, slicing off limbs and piercing skulls. A cream-colored colt danced amongst the hardened mercenaries, leaving naught but death and blood in his wake as he whirled through the mercenary formations like a dervish. As Elderflower watched, Pearl and Bluestreak cut down 6 of the remaining mercenaries with a single, elegant-looking spin before flaring out one wing and spearing most of the rest on wire-bound feathers. The very last of the surviving mercenaries survived no longer as Perlin's wing parted his head from his body. Only as the last of the assembled mercenaries slumped to the ground in pieces did Perlin finally notice Elderflower's arrival. Smiling jovially, the young stallion folded his wings, secreting them beneath his black cloak once again as he came at a trot towards Elderflower. "Ah, Lord Baron, I figured I'd be seeing you one last time." "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Elderflower. "How dare you betray me?" Perlin canted his head at Elderflower. "Betray you? I think I've done a pretty good job serving you so far. All I've done now is honor my contract with my employer." "Honor your contract? You've slaughtered my ponies and did nothing to defend my estate when it was attacked. What in the world are you babbling about? How is this honoring your contract with me?" "It isn't," said another voice. Looking over, Elderflower almost felt as though his eyes would leave their sockets as he saw who else was in the caverns. Whiteshade's crimson eyes glittered with amusement as he approached. The light of the crystals refracted off of the strange transparent substance that sheathed his off-white horn, becoming even stranger colors that swirled around him as he approached. "Perlin's contract with you was at my behest," explained White. "I was the one who recommended and introduced him to you, if you'll remember. However, at the time, I neglected to mention that I had already hired Perlin to work for me." "Doing what?" demanded Elderflower. "To work for you," replied White. "That is to say, I asked Perlin to serve as your pony until such a time that I no longer had any use for you, Lord Baron." "Use? What use?" asked Elderflower, shaking with rage as he glared at White. "Various things," said White with a shrug. "In all honesty, I mostly needed you to continue stirring things up here in Canterlot so that Celestia's attention wouldn't wander too far abroad. That ended up working quite well for me. By the way, I would like to thank you for returning the elements to Twilight Sparkle. I am quite grateful that you went to such lengths to acquire them. But now, it is best that they are returned to their proper place." "You were the one who suggested I go forward with the plan to steal them in the first place," Elderflower pointed out, still trying to figure out just what was going on. "Yes," admitted White with another shrug. "I was taking a bit of a gamble at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't pay off as much as I was hoping, though I suppose your efforts did end up helping me in the end." You scum, snarled Elderflower, after everything, you have the audacity to say that you were the one using me. You are just a simpering court official that Princess Luna took in on a whim, out of sympathy. You cannot even use magic, so you don't even deserve to be called a real unicorn. That actually got a chuckle out of White. Well, I was lying a bit about not being able to use magic. You see, due to the circumstances that left me with this. He gestured up to the off-white horn jutting up out of his forehead. It is true that I have been rendered unable to use my magic in its original state. However, rather than being reduced to not having magic at all, I actually ended up creating a new form of magic, one uniquely my own. Spare me your lies, growled Elderflower, stalking forward. Perlin moved to intercept him, but White halted the young stallion with a raised hoof. Turning his attention back to Elderflower, White smiled politely. The next instant, a sound like that of a large balloon bursting filled the cabin. Elderflower was blown off his hooves and sent slamming into a nearby wall with a cry of pain as he felt his ribs on one side crack under the force of impact. There had been no flash of light from White's horn, no shimmering aura. There was no visual evidence to indicate that a spell of any kind had been cast. But the results were undeniable. With a groan, Elderflower forced himself back onto his hooves. Looking up at White, he shuddered with fear as White continued to smile politely down on him. As I said before, explained White, I am most grateful for your assistance, Lord Baron, however unwilling and unwitting it may have been. You will pay for this, snarled Elderflower, I will make you pay. No, replied White in a careless tone, you won't. Now then, I have promised Perlin that he would not have to worry about any pony going after Miss Pommel again when all is said and done. I believe you are the last pony who currently poses any threat to her. Perlin took another step forward, but paused as White raised a hoof again. Seeing as I was the orchestrator of this situation, I believe I should take some responsibility towards cleaning it up. Besides, I recently came up with a new spell of sorts and have been looking for a test subject. You will probably be as good as any, Lord Baron. A shimmering ripple ran up the length of White Shade's horn. To Elderflower's speechless horror, it began to change. The seam that formed the horn's spiral slowly began to widen as the horn began to uncoil, as though it had been made from a strip of some clay-like substance that had been wound together, unwinding from a spiral into a loose helix. At where the horn met White's forehead, a strange, unearthly light began to build, spreading slowly up through the center of the helix. A strange buzz began to fill Elderflower's ears, making his teeth rattle and his organs squirm. At first, he simply thought it was the spell itself. However, as the light built, the buzz faded away, replaced by a lack of any auditory sensation so profound that Elderflower wondered if he had spontaneously gone deaf. The light continued to grow, swallowing all of Elderflower's other senses. His sense of smell went first, leaving Elderflower feeling as though his nose had vanished from his face. After that went the sense of taste, turning Elderflower's tongue into nothing more than a lump of flesh within his mouth. Finally, his sense of touch went as well. The Baron felt as though his body had faded away from around him. Even his sense of space and time were gone and the stallion found himself trapped within an endless moment that seemed to drag on forever. The light built, swallowing everything until it was the only thing that Elderflower knew. Perlin watched as the light faded and White Shade's horn began to draw back, once again winding up into the familiar spiral of its usual approximation of a normal unicorn horn. Blinking, Perlin reached up with a hoof to rub his eyes. As he did so, he felt another dull throb through his right hoof. But the young stallion ignored it for the time being. He had no words for what he had seen. White's magic, if it could truly be called that, was so alien that even its effects were hard to describe. It was as though the light had been absorbed into Elderflower. Perlin had seen what could only be described as shadows being washed away until Elderflower himself became a shadow that was still there, now standing starkly against the wall, illuminated with the lights cast by the nearby crystal formations. Hardened fighter and seasoned killer that he was, Perlin couldn't stop himself from shuddering as he looked at that shadow and realized it was all that remained of the pony he had once worked for. The fact that Elderflower had threatened Coco, used her as a tool to maintain Perlin's obedience, did little to alleviate the feeling of wrongness that Perlin felt at that moment. His hoof throbbed a little harder. Well, that was an interesting result, observed White, tilting his head and examining the shadow on the wall. It's a pity that I don't have time to analyze the residual effects, but we must be going. He smiled politely at Perlin, the stallion's mannerisms giving no indication that he had thought anything about how completely he had eliminated another living pony. Let's be off. We still have work to do after all. Of course, said Perlin. Now that you no longer have to worry about Miss Pommel's safety or your contract with the Baron, we can also begin work on your new wings, said White. The sooner we get started the better. I am sure you will be eager to master your new assets. Yes, said Perlin, glancing back at his cloak and the mithril feathered wings hidden beneath it. I'm sure. Author's notes. Next chapter, Scootaloo and Rumble get the short end of the stick. Heroes welcome. Chapter 15, Heroes welcome. This way, said Arkenstone, nodding towards a gap in the crystal formations that had been nearly invisible to Twilight's eyes. Two outgrowths of pink and cyan shards seemed to mesh together in a solid wall of jagged edges and pointed tips. In fact, the pink crystals were slightly larger in size than their blue-green cousins, but set a little farther back, creating a perspective trick that made it seem as though they were the same distance away. However, as Twilight got closer, she was able to see that by stepping around the cyan formation, she could see an opening in the cabin wall just beyond the pink one. Perspective tricks had no effect on a blind pony after all. Sniffing like a bloodhound, Arkenstone stepped past Twilight, following Elderflower's scent as it led deeper into the caverns. Silently, Twilight cursed herself for forgetting that the crystal cavern's namesake crystals generated all sorts of ambient magical energies that completely baffled the effects of her tracking spell. As a consequence, Twilight had been forced to go back and get Arkenstone's help after her cold friend finished making sure that the last of Elderflower's guards were taken into custody. The crystal's magic had done nothing to hide Elderflower's scent, it seemed. Thus, Arkenstone was easily able to follow the Baron's trail as it wound through glittering caves and twisting passageways. The two of them had been seeking Elderflower for the better part of an hour now. Arkenstone paused, raising a forehoof to stop Twilight as she stepped up next to him. Looking around nervously, Twilight asked, "What is it?" "I think we aren't far now," said Arkenstone, but what? "I smell blood," said the blind stallion, his nose wrinkling, "a lot of it, even more than what I spilled up in the mansion. A large number of ponies have been killed up ahead. Slaughtered is probably a more appropriate word for it. That's. Twilight looked ahead, wondering just what they would find as they proceeded forward. Are you sure that's where Elderflower went? I am, replied Arkenstone, clearly not liking his answer any more than Twilight did. He tilted his head towards her. You need not go any farther than this. Perhaps you should let me take it from here. Whatever is up ahead, I doubt it will be pleasant. Twilight was sorely tempted. It wasn't often that she saw her cold friend troubled or disturbed like this. The fact that she knew full well that Arkenstone was no stranger to bloodshed, even on a massive scale, only made it all the worse. However, closing her eyes, she thought about all that had happened, all that she had been through. No, she said finally, I need to see this through to the end. So be it, said Arkenstone, if you're sure, then let's proceed. They emerged into a massive cabin. Twilight gaped as she stared at the walls and ceiling, utterly astounded by the sheer size of the space. She'd seen some impressive scenery in the caverns while escaping with Cadence during Queen Chrysali's attempted invasion of Canterlot. However, the scale of this place was awe-inspiring in its own right. The mass of corpses on the cabin floor detracted from the grandeur of the spectacle a good bit though. The bodies in the state that they'd been left in made Twilight want to retch. There were easily over 100 ponies in here and they'd been butchered without mercy. It put the spectacle of the aftermath of Arkenstone's fight against the Banehammers to shame. Forcing the contents of her stomach back down where they belonged, Twilight noted a certain similarity the victims of this event shared with Arkenstone's victims. Though their bodies were often in pieces or covered with their own blood, she could see a great deal of armor and a large number of various weapons scattered about. The air carried the faint traces of ozone and a low hum that accompanied a large number of unicorns casting powerful spells in a confined space, attack spells if the scorch marks and craters in the wall were any indication. These ponies were fighters and they had apparently died fighting something, or someone. Who do you think they are? Asked Twilight. You mentioned that Elderflower and his allies had been recruiting muscle for an assault on the palace, observed Arkenstone. I think these were the ponies they recruited. But who could have done this? Arkenstone sniffed the air. I think I have a good idea. I smell some pony familiar. Perlin Bluestreak. Huh. Twilight once again looked to take in the spectacle of death before them. But Perlin was working for Baron Elderflower. Why would he turn around and kill all of Elderflower's soldiers? According to Ms. Pommel's story, the Baron was holding her as leverage to ensure Perlin's good behavior, said Arkenstone. He even went so far as to allow Shadesteel to escape with the knowledge that Elderflower had both you and the elements in his custody. It would seem that Perlin has terminated their contract, or he wasn't working for Elderflower to begin with. What makes you say that? Asked Twilight. I can smell another pony here. There is something familiar about his scent, but I just can't seem to place it. Arkenstone continued to sniff around. Elderflower came in and stopped here. He paused at a particular point. He was attacked, not by Perlin, but something else, something I can't place. He frowned and shook his head. I can't even begin to tell what happened here, what this other pony did. Well, said Twilight, feeling faint as she stepped past Arkenstone, I don't think Elderflower is going to be a problem anymore. She desperately wished saying those words would actually make her feel better than she did now. However, what she saw made that an impossibility. What makes you say that? Asked Arkenstone. This is the point where Elderflower's scent ends, isn't it? Asked Twilight. How do you know? Inquired Arkenstone. Because I think this is all that's left of him, said Twilight, raising a hoof to touch the wall, resting it on the darkened shadow that formed a faint silhouette of a unicorn that had apparently been burned into the stone. Dealing with the aftermath of Elderflower's scheme went surprisingly quickly for Twilight and her friends. Shining Armor had quickly taken charge of the situation, the Royal Guard taking custody of the Baron's captured guards, as well as both Greenblight and Inkwell, now the only surviving members of the Banehammers. Though Elderflower himself was clearly not present for questioning, the guards, now that they had unrestricted access to the Baron's mansion, successfully harvested a veritable treasure trove of information in the forms of files and ledgers Elderflower had kept on his activities, including his numerous associates. Shining was pleased to announce that, once the rest of the Royal Guard returned to Canterlot, a large number of other nobles would be subjected to equestrian justice for their part in Elderflower's act of treason. By his own reckoning, they now had enough evidence and reason for Celestia and Luna to declare an end to the noble court itself when all was said and done. Twilight was certainly hopeful in that respect, as it meant that the second of the two biggest thorns in her and her friends' sides would finally be nothing more than a passing memory. Though Twilight did want to see everything through to the end, Shining, Cadence, and even Celestia and Luna all pressed her to return home to Ponyville. I can understand that your desire for closure, but you've done your part, said Celestia with a smile as she shared dinner with Twilight the very evening after she'd successfully been rescued from captivity, but you have friends in Ponyville who need the reassurance of your presence. You sent a letter to them, didn't you? Twilight pointed out. Celestia chuckled. I did, by courier. I'm afraid that I will be recommending that Spike not send or receive letters for the next 3 weeks at least. She sighed. The poor boy worked himself ragged coordinating with my guards during the raid on the cult Solar. Because of that, we were immensely successful in securing a large number of prisoners. That's my Spike, said Twilight fondly. I'll definitely make sure he takes it easy when I get back to Ponyville. I'm glad to hear that your raid was a success. I'm sure that'll be good news for Fluttershy, Dawn, and Flaxseed. Celestia nodded. I doubt we are even remotely close to capturing every pony belonging to the cult. However, I believe that this will hopefully send a definitive message to the remainder of the organization regarding my view of them. I can dare to hope that those who remain will see sense and either give up their allegiance or turn themselves into a tone. I doubt that I will have worry about their leader twisting recent events to suit his chosen narrative. From the reports I received from my guards who raided the temple outside Trottingham, he apparently vanished into thin air, abandoning all his loyal underlings to their fate without so much as a word. But that's not really the end of it, said Twilight, frowning. No, it isn't, said Celestia with a shake of her head. What I saw in Appaloosa and the reports from the other temples made things clear. Never, not even in my worst nightmares, did I dare imagine that two of my problems were, in fact, one and the same. Morning Star, he's still out there, isn't he? He most certainly is, said Celestia, staring out the dining room window. He disappeared because the cult Solar has apparently served its purpose to him. That much is clear. Nothing I or any of my guards have tried has been able to even scratch the devices found in each of the temples. To make matters worse, I fear that this is only beginning. The somber mood was interrupted by the sound of Twilight's hoof smacking into her own face, prompting a start from Celestia, who looked in confusion at her student. Sorry, said Twilight, grimacing, you just reminded me of something really stupid that Elderflower said earlier today. Oh, said Celestia, I think I get the drift of what he must have said. My apologies. In any case, I am sure that the final part of Morningstar's plan will take place here in Canterlot. Then shouldn't I stay? Asked Twilight. Depending on what Morningstar might be up to, we might need the elements of harmony to stop him. I've considered that, said Celestia, but there is no telling how long this may take. Morningstar has been exceedingly patient. He spent 10 years using the cult solar as a front to disguise the construction of his array. The next phase of his plan, whatever it may be, may take 10 more. I have no desire to confine you and your friends to Canterlot for what might be an unknown period of time. I will have my guards and whatever knights are available look into it and keep you abreast of the situation. So please return to your friends. I think they have waited long enough for you to come back. Okay, said Twilight a little reluctantly, if you're going to be using the knights, does that mean Arkenstone? Arkenstone will be returning to Ponyville with you, said Celestia, besides the fact that I want him to stay close to you in case the remaining nobles try something before we round the rest of them up. He is also the Siege Perilous. It is best to keep him in reserve unless it is absolutely necessary. Twilight nodded. All right then. Secretly, she felt quite relieved that Arkenstone would be coming back with her. After everything that had happened, she was looking forward to just spending some time with him. There was one other topic that Twilight wanted to bring up. What about Coco Pommel? Can she come back with us? Right now, Cadence is taking Coco's statement, said Celestia. At first, we were considering Coco Pommel as a possible accomplice to Elderflower's crimes. However, from what you and Arkenstone have told us, I believe that she can be pardoned for her part in all this if Cadence approves. I certainly hope so, said Twilight, glancing down the table at Scootaloo and Rumble, who were eating quietly, trying not to look as though they were listening, and Cocos suffered enough at the hooves of two separate nobles. I'm sure that Rarity will be happy to have her back. Yes, said Celestia, flicking an ear, I'm sure she will. Her expression grew a bit more serious. Now, we move to the most important matter. The elements, asked Twilight. Celestia nodded. I have kept the elements in their vault, here in Canterlot for their safety, to prevent them from being stolen, which is exactly what just happened. She sighed. Of course, there was the incident with Discord as well. And let's not forget how keeping them there forced you to fight through a swarm of changelings in an effort to get to them during the royal wedding, an effort that ultimately failed. Because of this, I am forced to re-evaluate how we can keep the elements secure from now on. Twilight nodded. What will you do? A sad smile crossed Celestia's face as she envisioned all the hardship that could have been averted. What I should have done from the very beginning. When you return to Ponyville, you will be bringing the elements with you. I want you to keep them safe. Me, gasped Twilight, pointing to herself, but I'm a librarian. I may have some decent security measures, but for something that important. It isn't physical security that is the issue, said Celestia. Here, in Canterlot, with all the measures I had taken, my efforts to ensure that were foiled rather easily, it would seem. I've realized now that the elements would be no safer in a bank vault or any other secure space I could envision. It is not that you need to secure the elements. You will keep them safe because they are with you and your friends, the ponies who use them and understand them best. When you destroyed and restored the element of magic in front of Elderflower, it demonstrated that your bond with the elements transcends mere physical concerns. To be honest, the elements belong with you and your friends, and I should have left them with you the very day you rescued Luna. I see, said Twilight. When she put it like that, Celestia had a point. Ultimately, the greatest obstacle to using the elements against whatever crisis came up was the need to go to Canterlot to fetch them, which had worked against Twilight and her friends in 2 out of 3 cases. However, if the elements could be kept on hoof, then it would be easier for her and her friends to deal with whatever threats arose in the future. Assuming no pony stole the elements from them. That being said, I believe I shall omit the specifics of where the elements are, said Celestia, a twinkle of mirth glimmering in her eye. It will probably work to our advantage should some pony get the brilliant idea of trying to steal them again. That made Twilight smirk. It might, she agreed. The train ride back was uneventful, and Twilight spent it leaning up against Arkenstone, watching quietly as Scootaloo and Rumble tried their best to comfort and reassure Coco Pommel, who was sitting across from them. The poor girl was gradually growing more and more anxious as their train approached Ponyville, absolutely certain that there was no way that Rarity would allow her back after everything that had happened. It's going to be fine, said Scootaloo insistently. Rarity was just as scared for you as she was for Twilight. Rumble nodded his agreement. I know she won't hold it against you. Why yes but, stammered Coco, how can she? I took her trust in. I betrayed her. She let out a low sob. I could have told every pony. But I was too scared. Then why are you coming back at all? Asked Scootaloo. Because, after everything Ms. Rarity has done for me, I owe it to her to apologize, even if she doesn't forgive me. Sniffing, Coco ducked her head. Scootaloo and Rumble exchanged a resigned look as they gently brushed their wings against Coco's back in an attempt to reassure her. For all that they were sure that Rarity didn't bear any ill will towards Coco, there was very little they could do if Coco refused to believe that. About the only option they had was to simply wait until they got to Ponyville so that Coco could see for herself. A couple hours later, the train pulled into Ponyville Station. As she stepped off the train, Twilight was half expecting to see her friends already waiting for her there. However, none of them were present. She supposed it made sense. Celestia's letter had simply told every pony that Twilight had been rescued and that everything had been taken care of. But Celestia had neglected to say when they might expect Twilight back. Given that Spike was taking a leave from his work sending and receiving letters, there had been no way to let them know when Twilight was on her way back, short of another courier. However, Twilight hadn't wanted to strain Celestia's resources any more than they already were. She figured her friends would know soon enough now that she was back. Hey, where is every pony? Demanded Scootaloo, looking around the platform. They probably didn't know when we were getting back, said Rumble. Maybe we should just head home and let our families know first. Twilight's head perked up and she got an idea. Actually, why don't we head to the library first? I think I have an idea of where every pony is. The foals blinked in confusion. Okay then, said Scootaloo. Twilight set off for the library, Arkenstone falling in next to her. Trailing reluctantly behind them was Coco, who had Scootaloo and Rumble on either side of her, both of the foals working to urge her along. During the trip to the library, Twilight looked around, trying to see if anything looked out of the ordinary. However, Ponyville seemed perfectly fine. Every pony was going quietly about their business. A few of them even called out greetings to Twilight and her group as they made their way along the streets. According to Arkenstone, news of Twilight and Coco's abduction had not been spread to the town at large to avoid causing too much unrest. Still, Twilight had expected her arrival to cause more of a stir. As the library came into view, Twilight's eyes narrowed. She noticed that the windows were suspiciously dark. The building and everything in its immediate vicinity seemed unusually quiet, as though it was holding its collective breath. Yep, thought Twilight, I knew it. From the way his ears were twitching, she could tell that Arkenstone knew that something was up as well. When they reached the front door, Twilight held up a hoof. Let me go in first. That earned confused glances from Rumble, Scootaloo, and Coco. The former two probably should have known what to expect after living in Ponyville their whole lives. Still, they'd probably been too distracted trying to keep Coco's spirits up. Taking a deep breath, Twilight stepped forward and pushed the door open. Just as she'd expected, the library had been plunged into darkness and she couldn't see a thing. Might as well get this over with, she thought with an amused smile. Stepping in, she looked around. Whenever you're ready, Pinkie. Surprise! The combined shout of Twilight's friends, led by Pinkie Pie, made Twilight press her ears up against her head. Still, she couldn't quite restrain her smile as the lights came on, revealing every pony there waiting for her. Rarity, Applejack, Fluttershy, and Pinkie Pie were all a given, especially Pinkie, seeing as the party was undoubtedly her idea. Mayweather was standing next to Pinkie, chuckling at the pink mare's exuberance as she resumed setting out plates of various treats. From the kitchen, Twilight could see Flaxseed's head poking out, the stallion having apparently hidden himself there to avoid having that surprise part of the surprise party trigger another of his panic attacks. The Crusaders were there as well, Dawn looking rather silly and out of place with such a composed expression while standing between Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom, who were both sporting ear-to-ear grins. Behind the three of them stood Melon Cream, who was smiling warmly at Twilight over the heads of the foals. Rumble's family was there too. Flitter, Cloud Chaser, and Thunderlane all sported excited grins, clearly eager to welcome Rumble back, though Twilight could see the faint twitches to their eyelids that betokened a reckoning over Rumble's sudden and unexpected departure. Besides Applejack and Apple Bloom, the rest of Ponyville's Apple family were present as well. Little Dinky was practically hopping in place, perfectly happy to be part of a Pinkie Pie party, but probably not really understanding exactly why every pony was celebrating. Standing slightly behind her were Big Macintosh and Ditzy, who both gave Twilight relieved smiles when they saw her. On the couch, set off to one side of the library, Stormfront and Red River lounged, both of them looking better than Twilight remembered, but still only partway along the road to recovery. Stormfront in particular seemed especially happy to see them again, which was understandable, given that it was his student had snuck off on a dangerous mission to Canterlot. Her eyes were drawn to a flash of purple emerging from between Rarity and Applejack. Twilight braced herself to catch Spike as he tackled her. Twilight, you're back, he shouted as Twilight wrapped him in an affectionate hug and nuzzled the top of his head. She noticed that Spike was less concerned about his image as tears flowed freely down his face. She could also hear the faint rasp in his voice, the consequence of his throat being worn down through the sending and receiving of so many letters. Oh Spike, she said, her voice nearly a whisper, it's good to be back. Thank you for working so hard for all of us. I'll find a good reward for you. Spike sniffed and pulled away so that he could beam up at her. I'm just glad to have you back, he said, that's reward enough for now. Laughing, Twilight nuzzled her assistant once again before letting go. Spike stepped back, giving Twilight's other friends room to greet her. Oh Twilight, squealed Pinkie, throwing herself at the mare in question, we were all so super worried about you. Are you okay? I'm fine, Pinkie, said Twilight, returning the hug, everything's okay. I'm glad, said Fluttershy as she hovered over to nuzzle Twilight's cheek, even as Pinkie refused to let go. Ya sure gave us a mighty good scare, Sugar Cube, Applejack weighed in as she approached Twilight's other side and began to pat her back. Indeed, we were afraid that you might have been suffering all sorts of things while in the custody of that brute, said Rarity, snarling out those last two words. Using her magic, she began to carefully pry Pinkie off of Twilight. I didn't suffer, said Twilight, well, not that much. The worst thing that happened was that I was bored for the most part. It was like staying in a 4-star hotel and getting room service every day, but not being allowed to go anywhere or do anything. As it turned out, my presence was apparently quite unnecessary, commented Arkenstone wryly as he stepped in to stand next to Twilight while her friends pulled back to give her more space. Twilight was actually doing quite a good job of rescuing herself when I found her. I'm glad you came anyway, said Twilight, nuzzling her cold friend fondly. Me too, agreed Arkenstone. As she pulled away from their display of affection, Twilight grinned at Rarity. I managed to bring some pony else back with me as well. An awkward silence fell over the assembled ponies as Coco nervously crept through the library door, cringing as though she were about to be attacked. Both Rumble and Scootaloo were behind her, gently urging the young mare on. Shivering, Coco slowly looked up but not all the way, not daring to meet Rarity's eyes as Coco faced her. Ms. Rarity, I'm Sasib. Coco's voice cut out with a surprised squeak as Rarity surged forward and wrapped her arms around her apprentice, pulling Coco into a tight hug. Oh Coco, wailed Rarity, I was so worried about you. We all thought that you might have been. Her voice trailed off and Rarity instead simply leaned in to press her neck up against Coco's. Like a dam breaking, Coco's emotional restraint crumbled away and she began to sob up against Rarity, who held her and rocked back and forth whispering soothing noises. Coco wasn't the only one experiencing an emotional reunion. A short distance away, Scootaloo was facing down her mother and Dawn, both of whom looked none too happy with her. Fluttershy hovered awkwardly in the background, clearly not wanting to add to Scootaloo's discomfort but not able to do anything to diffuse the situation either. The warm smile Melon had been wearing when Twilight had come in was nowhere to be found. Instead, she fixed her daughter with a stern glare that made Scootaloo wish she could fight Inkwell 3 times over, rather than face her mother's glare for any length of time. Mom, Do you have any idea how much you terrified me, young lady, admonished Melon, her harsh tone cutting Scootaloo off sharply. You disappeared without a word, leaving all of us to worry about what might have happened to you. You could have died out there and we would have never even had the chance to say goodbye. I'm sorry, said Scootaloo, her ears drooping and a faint whimper finding its way into her voice. Melon continued to glare at her until something finally snapped. She reached out and pulled Scootaloo up against her, enveloping the orange filly in a crushing hug that squeezed the air out of Scootaloo's lungs. Don't ever scare me like that again. Scootaloo tried to say something, but found herself unable to speak as the combination of her own emotions and the vice-like grip her mother had on her served to keep her voice from emerging. Finally, after Scootaloo was fairly certain that her orange coat was beginning to turn blue, Melon released her. Looking down at Scootaloo, Melon's expression was still stern, but softer as well. Ever since you started learning martial arts from Dawn, I figured that you would be going out to fight someday, she said, but please don't do that again. Don't disappear without a word to me or Dawn. Oh okay, said Scootaloo, unable to stop a few tears from leaking out of her eyes. She turned to Dawn, who was still frowning as he watched her. Dawn, I'm sorry for not telling you either. Dawn sighed. It's just as well, he said, I don't really have anything to add. I, at least, can consider it a taste of my own medicine. Now I know what it was like for you every time I went off somewhere to fight. Stepping up to her, Dawn pulled Scootaloo to him and captured her lips in a kiss. Scootaloo let out a surprised hum as her wings buzzed excitedly on her back. After a moment, she relaxed and lost herself to the kiss, wrapping her forelegs around Dawn's shoulders so that she could pull him closer. It was the longest, most intense kiss they'd shared yet. When they finally pulled away, Scootaloo and Dawn were both panting slightly. Dawn spread his wings and wrapped them around the back of Scootaloo's head, pulling her forehead up against his as his feathers closed out the outside world. I'm glad you're all right, said Dawn in a soft voice, and I'm proud of you. You are. Scootaloo blinked, a bit shocked to hear that from her cold friend after finding out just how worried he had been. I'm proud because I think, this time, you entered the battle for the right reasons, said Dawn. Pulling back out of his embrace and away from his wings, Scootaloo glanced over at the sight of Coco, still crying like a foal in Rarity's embrace. She smiled and sniffed, a tear coming to her eye. Yeah, I guess I did. I also hear that you did quite well for yourself, said Dawn, raising an eyebrow as he smirked at her. I would like to know the details. Scootaloo felt her cheeks heating up. Oh, that's right, said Melon, her smile coming back. The letter we got mentioned that you even saved Arkenstone. I have to hear about this. I'd like to hear it as well, interjected Fluttershy, if that's all right with you. For once, Scootaloo was feeling a bit uncomfortable being the center of attention. On the other side of the room, Rumble was cowering under the stern glares of his brother, Cloud Chaser, and Flitter. You've got a lot of explaining to do, bro, said Thunderlane, crossing his arms. You just up and vanished without a word. Flitter and Cloud Chaser went out of their minds worrying over you. I mean, I was okay, cuz IOOPH. Quit trying to act tough, scolded Cloud Chaser as she jammed her elbow into Thunderlane's ribs. You were pacing up a storm in the living room. I was sure you were going to wear a hole in the floor. It's just Cloud, protested Thunderlane. I could have patched it easily, Realizing he was admitting that he was worried, Thunderlane let out a resigned sigh. Look, he said, turning back to Rumble, I was scared. You're the best little brother a pony could ask for. I can't imagine what I'd do without you. Besides, imagine what it would be like for me to have to tell Mom and Dad that you went and got yourself killed. His ears lying flat against his head, Rumble shrank back from the three ponies' collective glare. Sorry, he said. Isn't there some pony else you owe an apology? Prodded Flitter, stepping aside so that Rumble could see where Stormfront was still resting on the couch watching the exchange with a carefully neutral expression. Why yeah, said Rumble, feeling even more nervous now. Not only had he snuck away with Scootaloo to Canterlot and gotten involved in a very dangerous battle, but he'd also stolen his teacher's weapon to do so. Even now, the meteor hammer Rumble had borrowed from Stormfront was still coiled about his right foreleg beneath the sleeve of his silk shirt. Trembling, Rumble approached his teacher, who continued to watch Storm's expression giving absolutely nothing away. SS Storm, I'm sorry, Why? Asked Storm. There was no accusation in the tone, only simple curiosity. The stutters died on Rumble's lips. Why did you go to Canterlot? Asked Storm. I imagined that it was Scootaloo's idea, but what prompted you to go along with it? Rumble looked down at the floor thinking very hard about the answer. Storm waited patiently, watching the colt with an unblinking gaze as he waited for Rumble to formulate an answer. Ever since I started learning how to use the meteor hammer, I've been wondering about why, said Rumble, seemingly talking to himself as much as he was to his teacher. I mean, at first it was something really cool. I thought it was amazing when I watched you practice and I thought it would be awesome if I could do that myself. But the more I practiced, the better I got. I started wondering what I was going to do with it. I don't really think I'm cut out to be a mercenary like you. What was I going to do, once I learned how to use it? Storm remained silent, merely waiting for Rumble to continue his explanation. At first, I thought the two of us going to Canterlot with Arkenstone was a really bad idea. I mean, I've never actually used the meteor hammer in a fight before. But I could see it myself. Arkenstone was having a hard time. He was doing a good job of hiding it, but I think he was still hurt pretty bad from his fight with Terra. I remembered watching those ponies take Miss Twilight and Miss Coco away and I thought about how scared Miss Coco looked. I put all those things together and I thought I couldn't just do nothing when there was something I might be able to do to make a difference. Storm seemed to be examining Rumble very closely. Let me see it, he said, fixing his gaze on Rumble's right foreleg. Rumble nodded and pulled back his sleeve so that he could uncoil the weapon. After Cadence's blessing and using it in a real battle, his very first one no less, Rumble was more than a little reluctant to part with it. However, Stormfront was its rightful owner. Rumble had only borrowed it after all. Despite his desire to keep it, it wasn't his. Storm carefully lifted the weapon, allowing the coils of the cord to drape over the fetlock of his good foreleg and lifted it up to inspect it. Interesting. What is it? Asked Flitter, coming up behind Rumble. She'd been expecting Storm to be more strict with his student. She was surprised by Storm's inquisitive but reserved attitude. What did you do? Asked Storm, glancing away from his weapon at Rumble. Cadence, help me with it, said Rumble. Cadence, Princess Cadence. Flitter stared down at the colt, trying to figure out just where the Princess of Love, of all ponies, fit into all of this. I see, that makes sense, said Storm, a slight upward stretch of the corners of his mouth forming the beginnings of a smile. That explains a lot. It does, asked Flitter, feeling completely in the dark. This is not my weapon anymore, said Storm, his smile growing as he hoofed it back to Rumble. It belongs to you now. What? Exclaimed Flitter, he stole that from you and rushed off on harebrained scheme to get himself killed and you're actually giving it back to him. Well, Storm leaned away from Flitter's wrath as Rumble quivered in front of her. I could scold him about such things, but I'm not a fan of hypocrisy when all is said and done. What do you mean? Asked Flitter. I am no stranger to the adage about it being easier to ask forgiveness rather than permission, he admitted. I have done similar things in the past as well, some of them much more ill-advised than what Rumble has done. Granted, I was a bit older at the time than he is now, but I understand his position. Besides, he didn't do this out of some reckless desire to prove himself or a chance to try out the real weapon as it were. He did it because he genuinely felt it was something he should do, something he believed was right to do. I can't fault a pony for following his convictions, even if that puts him at risk. He gently brushed his hoof through Rumble's mane and gave the colt a much sterner look. However, you do have to make amends for the worry you put your family through. No amount of my approval or acceptance of your actions is going to change that. Why yeah, said Rumble, cringing as he felt the weight of Flitter's gaze bear down on him. I'm glad to hear that, said Flitter, because you are grounded for the next month, young man. Right, said Rumble with a sigh. Besides, there's some pony else you owe an apology, said Flitter. Rumble heard the sound of hooves clicking against the wooden floor and turned just in time to be slammed by Sweetie Belle in a tackle. Rumble, yelled Sweetie, don't you dare do something that stupid ever again. I don't think I can promise that, said Rumble, now lying on his back with Sweetie on top of him. But, he said, leaning up so that he could plant a quick kiss on her lips. I'm sorry for scaring you. With the benefit of hindsight, knowing the possible consequences of your actions, would you still have done the same thing? Asked Storm, smiling as he watched Sweetie continue to hug Rumble. For a moment, Rumble thought about it. Then he smiled up at his mentor. Yeah, I probably would. A faint flash caught the eye of every pony in the vicinity and their eyes were drawn down to Rumble, who looked about in confusion when he saw that every pony was staring at him, this time with a different expression on their faces. What is it? Bro, check out your flank, said Thunderlane, barely hiding a grin. Huh, craning his neck, Rumble was able to get a view of his flank dot and the brand new cutie mark that rested on it. Now visible was the image of his cutie mark, a pair of hooves, one gray, just a little darker than the shade of his coat, which was curled around a white hoof so that their fetlocks were linked together. You did it, squealed Sweetie, her shrill tone actually causing nearby windows to rattle alarmingly. You got your cutie mark. Say what now? Apple Bloom and Spike both came over, with Scootaloo and Dawn not far behind. Rumble just got his cutie mark, said Sweetie Belle, finally getting off her cold friend and letting him get to his hooves, her previous distress all but forgotten. Rumble appeared dazed by the revelation as he gazed in stunned awe at his own flank, marveling at the mark that had not been there before. But what does it mean? He asked. I think, in this case, the answer is obvious, said Storm. Your personal drive is to reach out to others who are in need and provide them with help. You felt you weren't ready for that battle, but you went along anyway because you felt there were ponies who needed your assistance regardless. It's a cutie mark to be proud of. Wow, breathed Rumble. Flitter nuzzled his cheek. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. But you're still grounded, she added, her stern frown returning for a second after your cutesanera. From a short distance away, Dawn and Scootaloo watched as every pony fawned over Rumble's new cutie mark. So, I guess that means you're the last one, she said, with a sidelong glance at Dawn. The ebony colt merely shrugged. Hey. Scootaloo couldn't quite keep a giggle down at Dawn's unconcerned response. He would be totally casual about being the last one of us to get his cutie mark. I wonder what it'll be though. Out of the way, declared Pinky as she began to work her way through the ponies around Rumble. Let me at him. I've got a party to plan. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home, commented Scootaloo Riley as both Melon and Fluttershy giggled behind her. How is she? Asked Shining as the chief surgeon employed by the guard made his way out of the operating room. Stable, replied the doctor calmly. I estimate that she will retain use of 2 of her legs. She won't be walking again. Her horn was completely shattered by the impact. Repairing it is impossible, I'm afraid. Combined with the damage stemming from what I can only assume was an incident involving severe overchanneling followed by either rough or non-existent treatment, I very much doubt that she will be growing it back. The damage to her alicorn is systemic, which means its growth has been severely stunted. Grunted Shining with a sympathetic wince. Even if the mare behind those doors was one of the worst kind of criminals, he wasn't sure any unicorn should have to suffer like that. The doctor shuffled some pages on the clipboard in front of him and continued. She also sustained severe injuries to her upper and lower jaw, losing several teeth. We tried reconstructive surgery, but were only partially successful. We managed to realign her jaw and muzzle, but were unable to restore total function. Unfortunately, she won't be able to consume solid food for the remainder of her natural life. Furthermore, her brain suffered damage as a result of the mentioned overchanneling incident. It would appear that the damage has been aggravated as a consequence of her injuries. The vast majority of her higher brain functions appear to have shut down. Only time will tell if she will be able to regain any cognitive ability. So she's a vegetable? Asked Shining. A very angry vegetable, said the doctor. From what we've been able to determine, Inkwell seems to be locked in a perpetual state of anger and hatred, possibly directed at the one who did this to her. At the same time, she doesn't seem to be mentally capable of acting on that hatred, even if the pony it was directed at were right in front of her. Couldn't have happened to a nicer mare, said Shining. She's probably not going to be fit to stand trial, I guess. Probably not, agreed the doctor. She will probably be institutionalized. Oh well, said Shining with a shrug. What about the other one? He is showing much more promise, said the doctor in a chipper tone. Greenblight took a pretty severe beating. But when all is said and done, his worst injuries were self-inflicted. How? Asked Shining. He took several blows from a small, blunt object, explained the doctor. In particular, he broke his left shoulder, his right wing at the base of his tail, and 2 ribs. On top of that, he took several more hits from the same object along the barrel and stomach. All of these were substantial on their own, but the stallion aggravated them severely by virtue of heavy exertion after receiving them. Oh right, said Shining, thinking back to what he'd heard from Rumble, he's some kind of berserker. I'd scoffed at the idea at first, but it is a sound explanation, said the doctor. The broken ribs were the worst injury thanks to the fact that they'd come dangerously close to puncturing his lung. That was a consequence of continued activity after their breaking. We were able to repair the joint in his shoulder, but the muscles and tendons around it will take longer to heal due to their damage. I'd almost think he was trying to use his disabled limb as some sort of flail. That's exactly what he did, said Shining. The doctor blinked before continuing. Then, of course, there are torn muscles, strained and snapped tendons, all manner of injuries consistent with exertion to ridiculous extremes. This berserker state of his apparently allowed him to exert hysterical strength. What's that? Asked Shining. Under the proper conditions, a pony can, either consciously or unconsciously, override their physical limiters to exert their body's full strength. Our bodies limit themselves in order to keep from causing too much damage to our muscles and connective tissues. In this case, the stallion apparently used some form of self-hypnosis or similar procedure to induce a fit of maniacal rage. As a result, he was able to completely exert his body's whole strength for a temporary period of time. On top of that, adrenaline and various other hormones released during the process also reduced his response to pain so that he could continue fighting, despite what would normally be debilitating injuries. Sounds pretty convenient, said Shining. Also dangerous, retorted the doctor. Those built-in limiters exist for a reason. Overriding them is supposed to be an emergency response, normally triggered as a response to life-threatening danger. If used repeatedly and for extended periods of time, it would ultimately result in permanent damage to the user's muscles and tendons. Greenblight was gradually pushing his body to self-destruction. The injuries he received earlier merely hastened this process. I find it unlikely that he'll be able to fight again, if he should ever find himself outside of a cell after this. Which isn't likely, considering his laundry list of crimes, said Shining, but he'll be able to stand trial. He will, said the doctor. Good, said Shining, thanks for your time. I'm glad to help, said the doctor with a smile. Please say hello to your wife for me. How did it go, said Cadence, looking up as her husband entered their room. As well as can be expected, said Shining with a tired smile. The doctor says, hi, by the way. Cadence giggled and turned back to her own work. She'd been tasked with interrogating Elderflower's captured guards, probably the only witnesses to his misdeeds, aside from the two ponies in the hospital. They had been reluctant to talk, apparently believing that their employer was still capable of some form of reprisal, even from beyond the grave, which a few didn't quite believe he was in yet. It was tedious work building up their trust and developing a rapport she could work with to get useful information. Such activities left her drained at the end of the day. Laying down on the bed beside her, Shining nuzzled his wife. So what about Greenblight and Inkwell? Asked Cadence as she returned the gesture. Inkwell isn't going to be doing anything, possibly ever, said Shining. Like the doctor said, she's a really angry vegetable now. She's probably going to spend the remainder of her life hating the pony who put her in that state without any means, physically or mentally, of acting on it. Frankly, it's no less than what she deserves. I wish I could believe that, said Cadence, but she's the way she was because her brain was damaged when she overchanneled. If she hadn't had that accident, she would have been the leader of the Banehammers. She might have even led them in a better direction. I doubt it, said Shining. The damage to her brain altered her ability to think in broad terms and caused her to focus on immediate things. But it didn't alter her concepts of right or wrong in any way. In that sense, she's very much the same mare she was before the accident. Trust me, she deserves this. Cadence shuddered, not liking the idea all the same. Part of being the princess of love was believing in Pony's better nature after all. What about Greenblight? She asked. Physically, he got off pretty light, said Shining. Some of his injuries may be permanent, but he'll be able to look after himself. A faint smirk crossed Shining's face. He just has to live with the fact that he was beaten by a foal who was participating in a real battle for the very first time, a fact that's going to get around to all the ponies he's had dealings with. Greenblight's going to become a laughingstock in mercenary circles and he knows it. Now there's a fate I feel is well deserved, said Cadence with a small smile of her own. I couldn't agree more, said Shining. Let's get some sleep. The rest of the Royal Guard are going to be back in a couple of days and then things are going to get really hectic. Author's notes. It gets hard writing certain scenes from this chapter because there are so damn freaking many characters to keep track of. Seriously, when I wrote Twilight's welcome scene, I almost completely forgot about putting Spike in it. That aside, it would appear that most everyone is happy with the fates that have been dealt to certain villains. I'm glad I could deliver in that regard. Next chapter, Celestia's done playing around. Progression. Chapter 16, Progression. True to Shining Armor's words, the Royal Guard squads that had been deployed to the far reaches of Equestria returned a day and a half later with several hundred prisoners in tow. It was the largest mass arrest in the history of Equestria, which wasn't all that surprising, given the nation's relative lack of a history of mass arrests. Simply arranging for the space to hold all the arrested cultists had been a logistical nightmare, as Canterlot's sole prison, an extension of the palace dungeons, was not meant to hold that many ponies. Celestia had anticipated that particular issue and had been making arrangements. Unfortunately, due to the haste with which the operation had been launched, many of those arrangements weren't yet complete. And all that came just before the bureaucratic nightmare of arranging trials for them. All this meant that Celestia's planned reckoning with the noble court would have to wait. Guard investigators went over every inch of Elderflower's mansion, seeking evidence to convict his co-conspirators. As evidence emerged, those ponies were placed on house arrest in their Canterlot estates, not permitted to leave while squads of the Royal Guard patrolled outside constantly. The air was filled with tension, as many of the detained nobles still had their cadres of mares-at-arms with which they could potentially try to use in order to force the issue. At least 2 members of the noble court had fled Canterlot for what remained of their properties in other parts of Equestria, the guard following swiftly on their hooves. Despite the tension, nothing had happened so far. But still, Canterlot, and the rest of Equestria along with it, held its breath as its inhabitants awaited the first spark that might set the city ablaze. In contrast, Ponyville remained quietly pleasant as its inhabitants continued to rebuild their lives in the wake of Terra Heart's visit. Despite the fact that Canterlot was visible to the naked eye from the town, hardly any pony seemed to pay the city on the mountain any mind. Fortunately, there was no longer any danger of any pony needing to cover damages to their homes and businesses. Shortly after Twilight Sparkle's return, Mayor Mare received a notice and a substantial deposit into the town's relief budget. If any pony had noticed that the amount of the deposit was equal to some total of Baron Elderflower's monetary assets, they held their tongues. The deposit had come with a promise that more would be available if Ponyville needed it. In the wake of their jaunt to Canterlot, both Rumble and Scootaloo had been grounded for a month by their respective families. Melon Cream hadn't originally intended to punish her daughter in such a way, but felt it wouldn't be fair to Rumble if he was the only one who was grounded, especially since Scootaloo had confessed to being the instigator of their departure. Needless to say, Cheerilee was not enthusiastic about the idea of two of her students cutting class and playing hooky by way of playing heroes, particularly without so much as a note. As a consequence, Rumble and Scootaloo found themselves lumped with detention on top of their grounding, and a few days of make-up homework to boot. Despite the fact that the two of them were proud of what they'd accomplished, neither of them was feeling particularly happy with the outcome. Despite all that, life in Ponyville was well on its way to returning to normal. The events of Twilight's abduction seemed to have occurred in the background for most ponies who were not within her immediate circle of friends. While a few had noticed her absence, no pony had commented on it, which actually made it easier for Twilight, as the last thing she wanted was to be hounded by ponies desperate to know what her experience in Baron Elderflower's custody had been like. All in all, things were proceeding quite naturally, with the exception of one minor hiccup. "So, I was kidnapped," said Twilight matter-of-factly. "Yeah," said Spike as he slid another book into its place on the shelf. His voice was still faintly gravelly from the strain his throat had been under the past couple of weeks. "I was taken right out from under every pony's noses in Ponyville and spirited all the way to Canterlot for a few days," continued Twilight. "That's right. You were all panicking because you had no idea where I was." Princess Celestia actually considered postponing the operation against the cult Solar when she heard about it. "Yep. Arkenstone, Scootaloo, and Rumble came up to Canterlot and actually had to force their way into Elderflower's mansion so that they could rescue me. Yep. Quote. And all throughout this whole ordeal, through everything that was going on, no pony bothered to tell Rainbow Dash about it." Yeah," said Spike, grinning sheepishly at Twilight, who looked more confused than angry about that fact. "Not that I wanted to drag Rainbow away from her Wonderbolt's training to help me." "But why?" asked Twilight, tilting her head. A second later, she was forced to swat at her ear to dislodge a buzzing fly. The little pests had been oddly persistent ever since she'd gotten back from Canterlot. Behind her on the table was a letter from the mayor in question, which had been delivered through Spike's flames, Rainbow having been left out of the loop regarding the current moratorium on Dragonfire letters via a set of specially made candles Twilight had given Rainbow before she'd left to join the Wonderbolts. Twilight and Spike had worked Spike's Dragonfire into the candle wax, giving the flames the properties of Spike's own fire, allowing Rainbow to send letters back through Spike, even if she wasn't a unicorn. If no pony had ridden her and Spike hadn't sent any letters to her, Twilight wasn't entirely sure how Rainbow had learned about the whole ordeal. However, the one thing that was certain was that Rainbow was not happy to have been left out of the affair. Spike shrugged. "I sent a letter to Spitfire through one of Arano's feathers, since I figured this was the kind of emergency that she gave us those feathers for. She wrote back, saying that she was leaving it to us. I figured she'd tell Rainbow and that they were just all busy helping bust up the cult Solar." Spitfire's reply had come through Spike's fire, lending credence to the idea that Rainbow was aware of the situation, as Spike presumed that Spitfire was using one of Rainbow's candles for that purpose. However, it was possible that a unicorn from the guard unit she and the Wonderbolts were assisting had sent it instead. Mused Twilight, tapping her chin. "I don't think we should worry too much about it," said Spike. "There wasn't much Rainbow could have done in any case. Besides, we can tell her that everything is just fine now." "That much is true," agreed Twilight. "Still, I hope Rainbow isn't too upset over all of this." "I can't believe you," yelled Rainbow Dash, glaring across the desk at Spitfire, who didn't flinch beneath the angry gaze of those cerise eyes. Rainbow's multicolored tail lashed angrily as she flared her wings, spreading cerulean feathers to either side of her in a classic gesture of Pegasus agitation. "How could you find out that Twilight was in danger and not at least tell me about it?" Spitfire's eyes narrowed. She'd been prepared for this outburst since the day she learned about Twilight Sparkle's abduction. Naturally, a mare as loyal and devoted as Rainbow wouldn't be happy to learn that one of her closest friends had been full-napped. "I made a decision as the leader of the Wonderbolts and as a knight," said Spitfire simply. "I believed that the last thing you needed was to be distracted during such a crucial time." "Distracted?" Rainbow exclaimed. Spitfire's orange eyes narrowed as she returned Rainbow's glare with a steady gaze. "That's right. If I'd told you, what would you have done?" "I'd have gone to Canterlot to do something about it," declared Rainbow. "What?" "I would have found Twilight." "How?" Spitfire sighed and raised a yellow hoof, running it through her yellow and orange mane. "You would have bolted off to Canterlot and thrown yourself into the middle of a Royal Guard investigation, only making things even more difficult. On top of that, you would have been offering Elderflower and his cronies an additional target." "Yeah," admitted Rainbow, her wings sagging and her ears drooping. "Look, I understand that this hurt you," said Spitfire. "I may have been wrong to keep it from you. I certainly hope that you'd be able to listen to me if I told you not to go herring off after your friend. Perhaps I should have more faith in you. But what's done is done." "You're probably right," Rainbow admitted. "I wouldn't have been thinking clearly. I obviously wasn't a minute ago." "That happens sometimes," said Spitfire. "You don't always have time to think things through and will just have to go with your gut sometimes. One of the most difficult things to learn is when to differentiate between those times and the times when you have the opportunity to think about what you're doing. You have to factor in the wider context of the situation. You're participating in important training and you're a target for a rogue stallion with exceptionally dangerous armaments. Rushing off would only expose you to danger you're not ready to face. On top of that, you have to consider your future position. You're going to be facing decisions like this occasionally as a Wonderbolt. If you're on the job with me, you can't afford to abandon your position and go rushing off the instant you hear one of your friends is in trouble." Now Rainbow was the one standing cowed as Spitfire stared sternly across the desk at her. "I think you've grilled my student enough," said the mayor standing behind Rainbow. "It's true that she's impetuous and still occasionally reckless, but you really should have been honest with her from the start." Spitfire's ears went flat and she nodded hesitantly. The pink mare smiled as she moved to stand next to Rainbow, gently extending a wing and draping it over Rainbow's back. Though she was considerably older than either of the other ponies in the room, Firefly scarcely looked it. The most apparent signs of her age were the light wrinkles at the corners of her eyes and lips, the hallmark of a mare who'd spent most of her life smiling. Her light blue mane and tail showed no signs of graying and her blue eyes were as clear as ever, sparkling with life. Firefly was the eldest knight of the Celestial Order currently serving, a pony who had perfected the pinnacle of Pegasus magic and who was now teaching that secret art to Rainbow Dash. Most ponies would have never even dreamed of talking to Spitfire as Firefly had. As a fellow knight, Spitfire was technically Firefly's equal, but Spitfire had too much respect for the pony who had once mentored her to take offense at Firefly's tone. I suppose that's true, admitted Spitfire. There, said Firefly, now smiling brightly, now that everything's settled, we can get back to work. Rainbow here still has a long way to go, so I can't afford to let too many things get in the way. Right, said Spitfire distractedly as she met Rainbow's gaze one last time, I'm sorry for deceiving you like that. And I'm sorry for bursting in here and yelling at you, Captain, said Rainbow, I'll try to think things through more carefully next time. The two of them exchanged nods and Firefly guided Rainbow out. Spitfire sank back with a relieved sigh. I just wish I could use some sort of time travel spell to go back and smack myself on the back of my head when I had that brilliant idea. Oh, I can't stand this, groaned Scootaloo irritably as she and Dawn made their way back towards Ponyville. Though he certainly wasn't obligated to, Dawn felt as though he were at least partially responsible for Scootaloo's actions and had made it a point to wait through detention with her and Rumble. Fortunately, between the three of them, Scootaloo and Rumble were able to get caught up on the work they had missed relatively quickly. Also, for all that it was a pain, detention was also an ideal time to get homework done so that they didn't have any waiting when they returned home for the day. Scootaloo really wished she could enjoy that more, as the only thing she had to look forward to after school was heading straight home, where she would remain under the watchful eye of her mother. Don tried to provide her with as much company as he could, under the auspice that he was her teacher as well. Scootaloo was grateful that her mother hadn't grounded her from training as well, something Melon Cream wouldn't even actually consider unless Scootaloo had done something truly deplorable. However, for the time being, that was to be the extent of Scootaloo's social life. Apple Bloom, Sweetie Belle, and Rumble were unable to interact with her outside of school, as Scootaloo was forbidden from leaving the house or her mother's supervision when they went out together. Treats from Sugar Cube Corner were scarce and only available after being earned through several extra chores beyond the ones usually expected of the filly. You're doing quite well, said Dawn, it won't last forever. I think you'll be able to manage. Despite her frustration, Scootaloo couldn't quite keep a smile from her face as she listened to her cold friend's words. After all, Dawn was also grounded, in a different sort of way. According to Dr. Stable, his magic was recovering, but for the time being, Dawn remained ground-bound. Given how much that experience had frustrated him, Scootaloo figured she could soldier her way through what was ultimately a much lighter sentence. I'm just glad I didn't get back a few days later, she said, another week and I would have been grounded during my birthday. Birthday? That's right, said Scootaloo, grinning at her cold friend, it's coming up next month. Come to think of it, I think Bloom's isn't too much later. Sweetie too, all of us were born pretty close together. As she spoke, Scootaloo noticed that Dawn's confusion was replaced by calm acknowledgement. I see. Scootaloo shrugged off his bland response. Instead, something else occurred to her. Hey Dawn, when's your birthday? I don't know, said Dawn. Oh cool, it actually took Scootaloo a few seconds to register what Dawn had just said. His tone had been so casual and unconcerned that the actual substance of what he had said had flown completely under her radar. Wait, what do you mean you don't know? I don't know, repeated Dawn, my master and I never learned the day I was born, so I've never really had a birthday to speak of. Scootaloo froze in place, blinking as she processed this new revelation. Dawn was an orphan. Though his memories of that time were fuzzy, due to him being so young, Dawn did know that he had been thrown out of the cloud home that he'd been living in by the pony he'd identified as his mother. By lucky chance, the pony that would become his master, teacher, and father figure for the next few years had been passing beneath and had managed to catch Dawn as he'd fallen towards the ground. When Darkwing, the pony who'd caught Dawn, returned the colt to the cloud mansion that he'd fallen from, the owners of said mansion had denied ever having a foal. The prevailing theory was that Dawn had been rejected by his parents due to being born with the eyes of Nightmare. Given that his presumed parents belonged to the Pegasi upper class, they had likely perceived his condition as being a threat to their status and prestige and had attempted to cover it up by removing Dawn from the equation. Taking that into consideration, Scootaloo supposed that she shouldn't have been surprised that Dawn didn't know the date of his own birth. However, something else concerned her more. Even if you don't know when you were born, you must celebrate your birthday sometime, right? She asked, already having a worrying premonition of what the answer would be. Dawn shook his head. No, actually, back then, I didn't even realize that ponies celebrated the day they were born. I'd seen parties from a distance when we'd tried settling in one town or another, but never knew what they were for. The subject never came up between us. What about when you got to Ponyville? Asked Scootaloo, her eyes growing wider. You've seen birthday parties around here. There had been plenty of birthdays in the intervening time since Dawn had arrived. Some had been for Fluttershy's friends or ponies in their class. Now that she thought about it, Scootaloo vaguely remembered Dawn watching those exchanges from a distance, as though he were in some foreign place, observing some strange cultural ritual that was unknown to him. He hadn't actually participated in them, though he did bring an obligatory present for most of them. That was when I figured out what birthday parties were, said Dawn with a shrug, but I don't know when my birthday is, so I've never had one myself. It doesn't seem all that important to me. Scootaloo's jaw went slack as she stared at her cold friend. The idea of not knowing when you were born might not have seemed all that daunting in and of itself. However, the thought of never having that special day where you and your friends celebrated your becoming a year older, that thought made her heart shudder. Once again, she shouldn't have been surprised. Birthdays were just another entry in the long list of things that Dawn's master had apparently never bothered to teach him about. Before he had come to Ponyville, Dawn had no idea what Nightmare Night was about. Nor had he ever celebrated Heartswarming. His life with his master had been one of constant instruction, focusing on developing Dawn's skills and abilities. However, the consequence was that Dawn had missed out on several important experiences that Scootaloo and those around her had always taken for granted. Is it bad? Asked Dawn, a little unnerved by the sight of Scootaloo gaping at him. It took a moment for Scootaloo to regain her composure. After working her mouth back shut, she struggled to find the words to say. Well, it's kinda important. I guess you'd have to actually have a birthday party to get the feeling. You might want to think about it. If you say so, said Dawn. Their walk continued in awkward silence as they resumed their journey to Scootaloo's home. Remarkable, mused Whiteshade as he studied the object in front of him. Given that the material was so reflective, it had been tricky finding the proper lighting to examine it with. But White and Kombu had eventually settled upon a light in the red spectrum. The object he was currently examining was a wing, Perlin Bluestreak's wing to be precise. You actually succeeded in bonding Mithril to a living organism without impairing the function of the altered limb. I'd given up on that. I know that it's nothing close to what you achieved, said Dr. Kombu, staring across Perlin's back at White. Nonsense, said White with a chuckle, you've completely exceeded my achievements in this field. The entire reason I took my research the way I did was because I came to the conclusion that there was no way to do exactly what you have done. That you have succeeded where I failed is completely to your merit. You're not upset, asked Kombu. Why should I be? You've uncovered a new dimension of study in the bonding of organic and inorganic materials. By all rights, Perlin's wings should shred themselves to pieces if he even tried to flap them. Yet he can fly and wield them as though they were little more than ordinary feathers. This is a revelation. How did you achieve it? White's eyes shone with curiosity as he looked up at Kombu, betraying a childlike eagerness to learn everything about Perlin's wings now that he had the chance to examine them in earnest. It wasn't easy, admitted Kombu, using his magic to carefully manipulate Perlin's wing as the colt lay limply on the operating table in front of them. Perlin wasn't unconscious or anesthetized, merely in a self-induced trance as he lay still and allowed the two unicorns on either side of him to manipulate his wings as they pleased. It was a position that Perlin was used to. It allowed Kombu to examine his wings whenever he was due for another adjustment or when the wings needed, rarely, to be repaired. Neither Perlin nor Kombu were overly fond of drugs or anesthetics and avoided relying on them unless it was absolutely necessary. Kombu continued his explanation. The outer layers are pure mithril, but the core of each feather contains a trace quantity of silver, almost like marrow in a bone. Given that mithril is magically and electrically resistant, it stands to reason that it would have to be paired with another metal that is more cooperative to magic in order for the wings to function like normal Pegasus wings. The silver core acts as a conduit for Perlin's magic, which allows him to fly despite the fact that the wing's weight exceeds that of ordinary Pegasus wings. I also spent years working how to marry the metal to his musculature so that his wings wouldn't simply tear themselves apart at the point of contact. Truly magnificent, said White with a chuckle. I'm impressed. It almost seems a shame to replace them. But it's the boys' will, said Kombu with a shrug. I've recorded all the information on the procedure and have the records sealed in a safe at the estate in Trottingham. I am confident that I could perform the procedure again if I had the materials. He sighed, but therein lies the difficulty. Duke Torchlight spent over half of his fortune on acquiring the mithril just to make the boy's original pair of wings. I have had to use those resources to purchase additional amounts of the metal for his repairs and adjustments as he grew. Mithril was not an easy material to obtain by any stretch of the imagination. Its value and the scarcity of the metal were but the tip of the financial iceberg. Mithril mostly came from the territory of the Griffonaries, many of which were still intensely hostile towards Equestria and its ponies. As a consequence, mithril often first had to be acquired by a more friendly Aerie that would then trade it with ponies. This, combined with the ever-shifting allegiances of the various Aeries, as they fell in and out of conflict with one another, led to the rise of an ever-changing network of roads through which the precious metal had to travel in order to reach equestrian hooves. On top of that, the vast majority of the mithril supply in Equestria was controlled by the government, especially the princesses and the royal guard. As such, others, even the members of the noble court, had to go to great lengths simply to acquire mithril, even in moderate amounts. The sheer expense that Duke Torchlight, one of the highest-ranking members of the noble court, had gone to in order to obtain what he had highlighted this truth. It's worth looking into, mused White, doing some might open new avenues of research, even for the materials I work with. Fortunately, all that information is also up here, said Kombu, tapping his forehead. I am happy to provide you with any information you require. It is a privilege to work with you once again. Excellent, said White with a chuckle. For the time being, let us focus on making our customer happy. He grinned as he looked down at his customer, who waited patiently on the table for the operation to begin. Pinkie Pie opened her mouth and inhaled in a loud gasp that gave every pony in the room the impression of being pulled towards her. What? Dawn's never had a birthday party. She very nearly shrieked before she was lightly cuffed by the yellow mare with the striped mane sitting next to her. Slumping down slightly, Pinkie grinned apologetically at Mayweather, who let out a resigned sigh before smiling and nuzzling Pinkie's cheek. Try to relax a little more, suggested Mayweather softly before reaching up to scratch behind Pinkie's ear, causing the party pony to purr almost like a cat. That's what Melon Cream told me earlier, said Rarity. She heard it from Scootaloo, who had it from Don himself. Oh my, whispered Fluttershy, her hooves going to her mouth as her eyes widened. I had no idea. Their little group had assembled in the most unusual of meeting places, the employee bunkhouse on Sweet Apple Acres. Sugarcube Corner, like nearly every other establishment in Ponyville, was still going through the process of reconstruction. The Cakes were currently supervising the acquisition of new ovens, bakeware, and other equipment, taking the opportunity to upgrade to newer models of nearly everything after having spent the last 20 years using the old sets. The library would have ordinarily been the venue of choice for a meeting like this. However, Dawn was helping Arkenstone prepare for the reopening of the tea house. The two of them, along with Spike and Caramel, had taken over the library's kitchen to experiment with new blends and even snacks that could be served along with the tea. Fortunately, such experiments promised to keep the boys occupied for several hours. You never asked, inquired Twilight, glancing at Fluttershy, who sank back behind her mane a little. I wasn't sure if Dawn was ever going to bring it up. I thought it might be an uncomfortable topic for him. Fluttershy sighed. I never even considered that. He didn't even know when it was or that he'd never celebrated it. He never even said anything during any of the birthday parties we went to. I suppose it just never occurred to him, said Rarity, gently tapping a hoof against her lips. I'm sure that he's probably noticed ponies celebrating birthday parties before, but he never thought to bring it up himself. He probably didn't want to be a bother. He is that sort of colt after all. Well, I'm wondering if we need to do anything about it, said Applejack, drawing shocked gasps from the other ponies in the room. Don't get in a tizzy. Hear me out, she said, holding up her hooves. I'm just pointing out that Don don't seem to think it's a big deal. Y'all know how that colt is. He ain't one fair big shindigs or hullabaloos. He might not have brought it up 'cause he don't want any pony making a big fuss about it like we are now. She has a point, Rarity conceded, pursing her lips. That is very much like the Don we know. In that case, we might just want to wait, said Twilight. Maybe Don might like the idea after he goes to the Scootaloo's birthday party. Odds are good she might talk him around. That sounds reasonable, said Rarity. No, shouted Pinkie Pie, pounding her hooves on the table loud enough to make everyone else in the room jump. No. No, 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 no. Don absolutely has to have a birthday, and a party. With a sigh, Mayweather lightly cuffed Pinkie once again. Settle down. Pinkie, I understand you're enthusiastic about throwing parties and that it's really important to you, said Twilight, but if Don isn't interested in having a birthday party, I don't think that's something we should force on him. That's not the point, protested Pinkie. A birthday is a time for us to celebrate, to tell a pony how happy we are that he was born. Don's never had that. He's never had a day for all his friends and family to get together and share just how happy they are to know him. She sagged down. We've celebrated things he's done, but Don needs a day for ponies to celebrate that he's simply there. That's what a birthday's for. Pinkie's friends stared at her, a little taken aback by her vehemence. But, at the same time, I think you're right, said Fluttershy. I tell Don I love him every day. But he's spent his entire life with ponies saying that he shouldn't have even been born, telling him that he was a monster, a demon. He deserves a day for ponies to say that they're happy he was born. I want a day to tell him that. Are you sure? Asked Twilight. Would Don actually care for a party? Oh, he wouldn't like a big one, said Fluttershy with a smile and a giggle, and he'd never ask for a party himself. He'd rather not be a bother. But I'm sure he wouldn't mind a small party, something like the welcome party Pinkie did for him last year, but smaller. Twilight and the others exchanged glances. Pinkie Pie seemed mollified by the prospect of throwing any kind of party, even if it was just a small one. While Twilight, Rarity, and Applejack had their doubts, they defaulted to Fluttershy's expertise. She was Don's mother after all. I guess that's fine, said Twilight after a moment, but when should it be? We don't have a birth date for Don, so we need to decide what day to have his birthday on. Ooh, squealed Pinkie, grinning as she bounced in her seat. Let's make it soon. I want to throw that party as soon as possible. Hush, scolded Mayweather with a roll of her eyes. If any pony gets to decide what day is Don's birthday, it should be the one who's raising him. All eyes turned to Fluttershy, who smiled warmly. Actually, I know exactly what day Don's birthday should be. Princess Celestia stared out over Canterlot. She could see the gold-clad figures of her royal guard moving along the streets below, many of them having returned to their former patrols. However, it was the bare minimum that they could afford at the moment, most of the guard being tied up in enforcing the house arrest of several members of the noble court. Though the number of guards on the street were light, their presence alone was a balm to the worry and discontent of Canterlot's citizens, a sign that things were slowly returning to normal. It's getting late, you should retire for the day, said Luna as she came out to stand beside her sister. I will, said Celestia, I just wanted to make sure that everything was going well. The city shall see to itself for the night, said Luna. You've been very busy lately. Celestia nodded. The trials had begun. With so many ponies affiliated with the cult Solar having been arrested, the magistrates had been forced to try them in groups according to their places of origin. The troublesome part had been separating out the well-meaning ponies who had simply been duped into joining the organization from the ponies who considered themselves true believers who presented an active threat to Luna or ponies like Don. Fortunately, there was a fairly simple procedure for that. Very often, all they had to do was bring Luna into the courtroom and watch the sparks fly. The ponies who genuinely believed in the cult's doctrine against Luna often outed themselves very quickly, especially when they didn't realize that Celestia was watching. Still, even though the majority of the cult's leadership and the ponies staffing their temples had been arrested, the fact remained that its members were still a very real threat. Though the royal guard had rounded up as many of them as they could, there were likely plenty of cultists who had slipped through the cracks. Hopefully, most of them had realized the error of their allegiance and would return to their normal lives without causing trouble. However, Celestia was sure that there had been a few who would refuse to accept the truth and would continue to pose a threat to ponies like Don and Luna in the future. Whether those few malcontents could actually succeed in rebuilding the cult was a question that Celestia hoped she didn't need to find the answer to. Still, she knew she couldn't afford to rest on her laurels. She'd made the mistake of not stamping out the cult Solar in its entirety once. She would be damned if she made it possible for some other malcontent to start the whole thing over a few hundred years down the road. She would tear the cult Solar up by its roots and make it absolutely clear that she would no longer tolerate their violent idiocy. However, that would come after the noble court was dealt with. With a sigh, Celestia lowered her head. She suspected that Morning Star was somehow behind their actions as well. While she supposed that having the royal guard in Canterlot completely understaffed was issuing an open invitation of some kind to the nobles, there was no accounting for the speed with which they had taken advantage of the situation, almost as though some pony had prepared and primed them for it. Had Morning Star actually arranged the whole affair with the cult Solar to draw the royal guard away from Canterlot for some unexplained purpose, which was carried out under the cover of Elderflower's actions? Had Morning Star accomplished his goal, whatever it was? Whatever the case, at least we have the elements of harmony back, she thought. Feeling the gentle brush of Luna's feathers against her own prompted Celestia to look over at her sister, who met her gaze with a warm and gentle smile. Go on, said Luna, I shall watch over the night. Do as you will then, said Celestia. Stepping away from the balcony, she set off for her room, looking forward to a good night's sleep. However, she paused as she heard some commotion coming from the hallway that led to the throne room. There was the sound of raised voices and agitated tones that indicated an argument of some kind, accompanied by the sound of several sets of hooves as a decent-sized group of ponies headed her way. Straining her ears, Celestia tried to pick up the conversation and find out if it was something that she needed to weigh in on. Your Grace, again, I ask you to stop this. This is highly inappropriate. That was the voice of her majordomo, a rather stiff and stubborn stallion by the name of Habitus, who, despite his tendency to worry needlessly over formalities, was an able steward, managing to make palace affairs run like clockwork. Get out of my way, you simpering wretch, snarled a second voice in an outraged, imperious tone that made Celestia's eyelid twitch. She knew that voice all too well. Duke Periwinkle, one of the highest members of the noble court, on a level equal to Prince Blueblood, was a common fixture of day court sessions. At least once a month, he brought forward some sort of petition against some pony or business that he believed had slighted him in some obscure or imagined fashion, demanding that Celestia imprison, banish, or imprison and banish those he held responsible or some other ridiculous punishment. Your Grace, you must stop immediately. Petitions must be brought during regular court hours. You are out of line. Habitus' protestations were slowly getting louder as the group got closer. You are the one out of line, you trumped-up hoofservant. Roared Periwinkle, clearly in one of his moods. If Celestia was any judge of them, I am not some dirt-grubbling commoner to be turned away on technicalities. I will not stand by and ignore the insult that has been paid to my peers. Celestia sighed and turned in the direction of the conversation. If Habitus was actually giving ground, even to a pompous blowhard like Periwinkle, it was probably because Periwinkle had brought suitable intimidation with him, probably in the form of several of his guards if the number of hoofs she was hearing was any indication. Periwinkle would probably not be turned away, short of Celestia summoning a guard platoon to dissuade him, something she, unfortunately, did not have on hoof at the moment. Instead, she opted to give her majordomo some relief and take over the conversation. Following the sound of voices, she strolled down the hallway and turned a corner, affecting an expression of surprise as she saw Habitus and Periwinkle, giving the impression that she'd stumbled across the commotion by accident. My, said Celestia as she looked over at the group of ponies, what is going on here? True to her suspicions, Periwinkle had brought a group of his guards with him. The pastel blue unicorn had 10 ponies in blue-rimmed armor standing behind him, arrayed in ranks of 2. Half of them were unicorns, while the other half were earth ponies. The guards affected expressions of cold indifference as they stood behind the outraged Duke. However, Celestia could spot faint twitches of nervousness as they followed in their master's wake. Bringing an armed force that wasn't part of the guard in some fashion into the palace was very illegal. That extended even to members of the noble court, who often thought themselves above the laws meant to control the common ponies. Your Highness, exclaimed Habitus, notes of relief and pleading in his voice as he addressed her, this ruffian has ignored all decorum and barged in here, unannounced and with an unauthorized. Silence, roared Periwinkle, cutting Habitus off, I'll have your hide for daring to refer to me in such a fashion. You will do no such thing, said Celestia, pretending to hold back a titter of amusement, I value Habitus' skills very highly and I would not like you to deprive me of them. Then you should remind the fool not to forget his place and insult his betters, snarled Periwinkle, both his tone and words actually causing the front row of his guards to step back in surprise as they stared at their master like he had gone mad. Celestia actually giggled for real at that. I suppose I should, she said, however, that would require that one of his betters actually be present for him to insult. Reeling as though he had been struck, Periwinkle worked his mouth furiously as he stared at Celestia with wide eyes. Habitus was also staring at her with a similar expression of amazement. Favoring her steward with a smile, Celestia said, you can go now. I will take care of things here. Are you sure, Your Highness? I am, said Celestia, you are dismissed for the evening. Go get some rest. We have a busy day tomorrow and many affairs to attend to. And do any of these affairs pertain to redressing the insult paid to my peers by the captain of your guard? Asked Periwinkle as Habitus trotted past Celestia to escape down the hall behind her, only barely managing to keep from breaking into a full-blown gallop. That affair shall be attended to, said Celestia with a smile, I am sure that it is on the docket somewhere. This is the highest priority, insisted Periwinkle, the ponies your captain has placed under house arrest are the leaders and ruling powers of Equestria. How dare he treat them like a batch of common criminals? Celestia found herself laughing for real, much to the discomfort of Periwinkle's guards, who shifted nervously and began stepping back slightly. Indeed, they are not common criminals, said Celestia, they are criminals of the most uncommon sort. Periwinkle's eyes bulged in their sockets, his jaw going slack at Celestia's words. Almost grinning, Celestia continued. Shall I list out the crimes they stand accused of? They include conspiracy and accessory to abduction, murder, and high treason. If it weren't for the fact that our court system is currently quite busy, they would already be rotting in prison, quite possibly for the remainder of their pitiful lives. Periwinkle opened his mouth to protest, but Celestia cut him off. And now you show up here with armed guards daring to make demands of me and insisting that I bow to your will. You violate the law and bring armed ponies in my presence, forcing your way past and threatening my staff, who are infinitely more worthy of consideration than your ilk. You speak of the affronts to your peers, yet your behavior here and now is an affront to me. Celestia's tone grew harsher and darker with each sentence as her body began to shine, white light spilling out of her form. The hallway slowly began to heat up, the Duke and his escort all breaking out into sweats as the temperature continued to climb. Why you can't, stammered Periwinkle, the noble court will not allow. The noble court cannot allow or disallow anything anymore, said Celestia, her voice booming down the hallway, making the windows rattle and the doors shudder, it is officially disbanded. You and yours are hereby stripped of the tattered remainders of your authority, your titles are no more than meaningless words. You stand before me, commoners one and all, just like the ponies use a scorn. We will not stand for this, protested Periwinkle, you will regret trifling with us. He turned and glared at his guards. You serve me, subdue the princess, we shall take back what is rightfully ours. The guards exchanged nervous looks before slowly backing away from Periwinkle. Then, haltingly at first, one of the ponies in the first rank reached up with a hoof and began to undo the buckles that held her armor together. The steel plates dropped to the floor with a loud clang. One by one, the others began to follow suit. You traitorous dogs, howled Periwinkle. His horn began to blaze but abruptly dimmed when the horn, along with the Duke's entire body, was washed with a golden aura. Celestia's magic yanked Periwinkle off his hooves before slamming him bodily in the wall. Enough of this, said Celestia, her voice a dangerous rumble. Already, the sound of hooves echoed down the hallway as even more ponies arrived. This time, it was members of the royal guard who rounded the corners both in front of and behind Celestia. Celestia levitated the limp form of Periwinkle over to them. Take him and throw him in the dungeon, whatever cell is available. Turning to regard the Duke's former guards, Celestia smiled as she saw them kneel. Thank you, my little ponies. For the time being, I ask that you return to Periwinkle's estate. Look after things there. I will not leave you abandoned. Moving in almost perfect unison, the ranks of ponies bowed deeply to Celestia before making a hasty exit, a few royal guards shadowing them down the halls to make sure they did as they were told. After they had gone, Celestia was left standing alone in the hallway, looking over a few piles of abandoned armor. She let out a sigh, hoping that she hadn't just made things even harder for herself. Author's notes. So, yeah, when it came to writing this story arc, I largely forgot to mention Rainbow Dash at all, so I addressed it here. I'm a bit surprised nobody really brought it up, or maybe I haven't been reading the comments in enough detail. I suppose you could call it a good thing that a government has difficulty coordinating mass arrests due to a lack of experience in coordinating mass arrests. That means someone's doing something right. Next chapter, guess who's back? Here's a hint.